Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D and WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku Became a Healer. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Starting today, Recovery Girl will have a student intern working under her. When Aizawa had told Class 2 that he had an announcement to give before their training session at the PE grounds that day, the notice of a new intern was unexpected. The fact that it was about an intern for a hero mostly unrelated to them was even more unexpected. Sure, Recovery Girl had been responsible for healing just about all of them at some point, but her work and any supposed interns she instructed didn't exactly seem like things that would affect the young heroes in training. Aizawa seemed to sense the confusion in his students, so he elaborated further. The intern also has a healing quirk, so you'll likely be treated by them at some point, which is why I'd like you all to be formally introduced, the teacher explained, glancing down at the watch on his wrist. He had been told by Principal Nezu that Recovery Girl and her intern would be meeting them at the PE grounds once they were done touring the campus. It almost sounds like you think we get hurt a lot, Kirishima pointed out, pretending to be offended by the assumption. Ada raised his hand, ever the proper student, and waited for Aizawa to look his way in acknowledgement. I don't believe Yue has a student with a healing quirk, so where are they coming from? Ada asked. His classmates around him began to murmur in agreement as they realized the same thing. I actually don't know much about them, Aizawa admitted, looking around the area to see if he could spot their approach. But I think they're a second year like all of you, so I expect you to get along with them. Izuku. Aizawa had only Bakugo's chaotic shout as a warning before he felt the blast from the young student's quirk, a residual heat from his explosions as they propelled him forward. He turned and looked over in time to see Bakugo tackling someone to the ground and rolling through the grass for a few feet from the momentum. Standing nearby was Recovery Girl, looking at the pair of students rolling on the ground with thinly veiled concern. Bakugo, what are you doing? Aizawa shouted, baffled by how insane the behavior was even for someone like him who was volatile as a baseline. So, this is what it's come to, Shinsu drawled, watching as Aizawa began to unravel his capture weapon in anticipation of needing to pull Bakugo back. He just fights people on sight now. Wait, are they? Laughing, Hagakure questioned. The class fell silent, and sure enough the muffled sounds of laughter could be heard coming from the two on the ground. Bakugo had propped himself up and was now crouched over the other individual, practically straddling him. They could see glimpses of freckled skin, a smiling face, and forest green curls that matched the grass stains now covering the lab coat he was wearing. Holy shit, I think Bakugo is smiling, Siro pointed out, taking note of the toothy grin etched into his classmate's face. And it's not even a sadistic smile. What the hell are you fucking doing here? They heard Bakugo shout, a childish glee clear in his voice. The figure pinned beneath him merely laughed, the same delight evident in their response. Bakugo, would you get off of my new intern? Recovery Girl demanded, tapping her cane on the ground for emphasis. Bakugo glanced at her before looking back at the boy beneath him, eyes growing wider. You're the new intern, he repeated, rocking back on his heels and standing so the other boy could sit up. Why didn't you tell me? I wanted it to be a surprise, the boy finally answered, taking the hands Bakugo offered him so he could be pulled to his feet. I'm guessing you two know each other, Aizawa guessed, relaxing his hold on his capture weapon when he realized no one was in distress. The green-haired boy turned and, as if suddenly realizing they weren't alone, blushed and rubbed the back of his neck. I've known Kaken since we were little kids, the boy sheepishly informed them. Kaken, Kaminari quietly repeated, voice cracking in disbelief. Everybody. This is Izuku Midoriya, Recovery Girl announced, gesturing towards the boy. He will be interning with me for the remainder of his second year and potentially even his third year. I expect he'll be healing quite a few of you while he's here, so be nice to him. She pointedly looked at Bakugo, who still had a strong grip on the shorter boy's arm, seemingly refusing to separate from him. It's an honor to meet all of you, Midoriya greeted with a bright smile and an awkward bow as he tried to dust the dirt and grass off of himself. Is your mom here too? Bakugo asked, finally letting go to help dust off the mess. Yeah, she should be surprising your parents with a visit right about now, Midoriya answered. She won't be staying long though. She'll be flying back to Ai Island in a few days once I'm settled. Ai Island, Asui repeated with a finger pressed to her chin. Is that where you're from? How do you know Bakugo then? Ida questioned. Well, I was born here in Musutafu in Kaken and I lived in the same neighborhood, Midoriya explained. When my quirk manifested, many of the researchers on Ai Island reached out and requested I move there so they could study it and help me control it. They were especially interested because it was a mutation and didn't match the quirks of my parents. You fucking left me like an asshole when we were 5, Bakugo muttered, resulting in a sympathetic smile from Midoriya. Healing quirks are incredibly helpful and highly sought after, Recovery Girl added as explanation. Having a properly trained healer in the field could mean the difference between life and death for a pro hero or a citizen. I'm technically a second-year student at Island Academy, but because my quirk is going to be used in the field, they wanted me to intern with an established healing hero. Midoriya turned towards Bakugo as he spoke, once again acting as if they were the only ones there. I'll be finishing up my remaining coursework remotely, but I may need to occasionally travel back to help with support gear projects. His instructors also informed us that Midoriya has an exceptional eye when it comes to quirk analysis and strategy. Recovery Girl shared the information directed mostly at Aizawa. Principal Nezu is recommending that teachers allow him to observe training sessions whenever he has free time. That should be fine, the teacher replied, carefully observing his student interact with the new intern. We're actually about to hold some informal sparring matches if you'd like to stick around for that. Can I? Midoriya asked Recovery Girl, expression hopeful. Fine by me, but only for a little while, she told him, smiling at the excitement in his eyes. We still need to introduce you to people in the support department, and something tells me Hatsum is going to turn that into a very long meeting. Thank you so much. He grinned at both his mentor and Aizawa. Bakugo's brow furrowed and he tugged at Midoriya's sleeve. Do you have your snacks with you? He asked, concern lacing his words. Midoriya smiled back at him before reaching into one of the pockets of his lab coat to pull out what looked to be a bag of sweets. Always. Why does he need snacks? Sato questioned, intrigued by the sight of another individual with something he'd carry on his own person for his quirk. Ah yes, we never explained your quirk, Recovery Girl mused, turning to address the class. It's quite similar to my own, actually, save for one important difference. While my healing process is fueled by the energy of the patient, Midoriya uses his own energy to heal. She lifted her cane and tapped it against the bag of treats in his hand. Because of this, he often needs to be eating to maintain the use of his quirk. We're pretty similar then, Yaoyorozu pieced together excitedly. Midoriya chuckled as he pocketed the bag of sweets. Oh please, your creation quirk is way more complex than what I do, he argued, waving his hands in the air. I mean, you have to have such a deep understanding of the things you create. Not to mention being able to figure out the best materials to use for a given situation. The amount of thinking you have to do in such a short amount of time during what's likely a high-stress situation is absolutely incredible. You already know about my quirk? Yaoyorozu asked, a light blush dusting her cheeks in response to the sudden praise for her intellect. Midoriya froze, only moving to lightly elbow Bakugo, who was poorly concealing his laughter beside him. Well, I record and watch the sports festivals every year, Midoriya admitted. And Kaken's told me some stuff about you guys too. Bakugo talks about us, Kirishima asked as he grinned at a now scowling Bakugo. Complain, Bakugo corrected. I complain about you, there's a difference. Midoriya glanced between the two of them before a small smile grew on his face. This expression was different from the previous ones as it held a whisper of mischief, something that seemed strangely out of place on the boy's soft face. Bakugo seemed to notice the difference, suddenly appearing almost fearful as Midoriya took a step closer to Kirishima. You're Kirishima, right? He leaned in with a hand next to his mouth as if he were sharing a secret. Kaken thinks your hardening quirk is really amazing. I'll kill you, Bakugo growled, though Midoriya only laughed in response. The rest of the students watched the exchange, absolutely baffled. It was like they were watching a Bakugo from another dimension, one who smiled genuinely and shamelessly at this boy and spoke fondly when addressing him. In return, Midoriya seemed like a rarity, unafraid of Bakugo's violence and even bold enough to tease the explosive boy. Questions and comments sat on the tips of everyone's tongues, ready to fire at the inexplicable pair of students before a sudden greeting silenced them all. Is that young Midoriya I see? Midoriya's laughter stopped and he spun around to face the man now walking towards their group. He took off sprinting and practically threw himself at the gaunt hero studies teacher, pulling him into a bone-crushing embrace. Uncle Toshi. Did this kid just call All Might Uncle Toshi? Jiru questioned, glancing around as if to check that her classmates were seeing what she was seeing. It's so good to see you, my boy, Toshinori said, returning the hug with equal excitement. How is your mother? Well, I hope. She's good, Midoriya answered, shrugging his shoulders a bit. A little anxious about leaving me here, but it helps that she knows I'll be staying with you. Good, good. Hopefully I'll see her before she leaves, All Might replied. And I just got a call from the moving company. All of your belongings have been brought to my place. You knew he would be here too. Bakugo snapped as he crossed his arms, irritation clear in his demeanor. It was meant to be a surprise. Young Bakugo, All Might softly reasoned, hands held in the air in a pacifying gesture. He turned back to address Midoriya. Lemillion is here. I'd like to introduce you to him before his afternoon patrol. Oh yeah, Midoriya spoke before quickly deflating and turning with a frown towards the other students. Oh, I guess I can't stick around for the sparring. There will be plenty more opportunities, Aizawa assured him, a rare smile beginning to tug at the corners of his mouth. Midoriya's excitement seemed to renew at the promise, and he nodded his head. I'll talk to you later, yeah, Bakugo said, voice oddly soft as he tugged at Midoriya's sleeve again. Midoriya grinned and pulled Bakugo into a hug which the other boy returned, even swinging Midoriya off his feet a few inches into the air. Yeah, and I'm sure your parents will want to do dinner or something with us before Mom leaves, he predicted, pulling away from the explosive student before turning to address his classmates with another bow. It was wonderful meeting you all. I hope we can all become friends during my time here. With one final dazzling smile, the intern left, trailing after All Might and Recovery Girl as they made their way back inside the school. Class 2 watched them leave, left with more questions than answers regarding the newest addition to UA's community. Damn, is it just me or is anyone else having a hard time believing that guy was childhood friends with Bakugo? Kaminari spoke, breaking the silence that had settled. Small explosions sparked in Bakugo's palm as he spun to face the other boy. The fuck's that supposed to mean, Pikachu? He yelled, falling into a fighting stance which prompted Kaminari to slip behind Aizawa for protection. He's just so nice, Zero argued, more willing to face Bakugo's potential wrath than Kaminari was. Maybe he's got a hidden violent side, Takoyami wondered. Many of the students murmured similar sentiments. Do you think we'd see it if he fought someone? Ajiro mused, thinking of how Uraraka and Kirishima often appeared much fiercer than their normally cheerful personas while sparring. He's bound to have some combat skills if he plans to work in the field. I wish he had stuck around, Yaoyorozu lamented. I wanted to ask him more about his quirk. Yeah, or how he's so close with All Might, Uraraka noted. At the mention of the retired symbol of peace, a new round of side conversations broke out amongst the group. All right, everybody focus, Aizawa ordered, briefly activating his quirk to silence his students. This is still class time. You'll have plenty of opportunities to talk with Midoriya later. Hey Bakugo, you're friends with him. How does he actually use his quirk? Kirishima asked, ignoring Aizawa's demand for the conversations to end. Is it the same as Recovery Girl? Oh, I hope so, Ashido said with a giggle. I wouldn't mind getting a smooch from someone like him. Shut it, raccoon eyes, Bakugo warned. He just has to touch you, preferably close to the target area. Oh, do I hear a hint of jealousy in Bakugo's voice? Jiru teased, smiling wider at the glare Bakugo sent her way. Don't worry, dude. I'm sure you'll still get plenty of attention from the ladies even with your cute friend hanging around here. I don't know about that, Shinsu spoke, voice light and provocative as he settled his heavy-lidded gaze on Bakugo. Midoriya seems to have the advantage of being cute and nice. I'm not sure how Kaken can compete with that. That's it. I'm fucking done with you, baggy eyes. Bakugo turned towards his teacher who seemed like he'd much rather be taking a nap than trying to control his students. Hey Mr. Aizawa, are we allowed to pick our sparring partners, or what? Considering the only 2 healers we have on this campus are occupied with meetings, I'm going to say no to that. Aizawa raised his hand and pointed. Takoyami and Kirishima, you 2 are up first. I want everyone else observing and looking for strengths and weaknesses. All right. Kirishima raised each of his hands to high-five both Takoyami and Dark Shadow before they ran out into the field to fall into fighting stances. Aizawa signaled the match to begin, half listening as his students began critiquing and complimenting their classmates' fighting styles. After a while he felt someone purposely walk up beside him, and a quick glance down told him it was Bakugo. So, was that him? Aizawa asked, voice quieter so no one else would hear. Bakugo was silent for a moment. Yeah, interesting, Aizawa murmured, a genuine smile gracing his lips now. Are you going to tell them? Not yet. Walking Izuku Midoriya through UA High School's campus was like walking a kid through a candy shop and expecting them to keep moving forward. He already had a natural curiosity that had been with him since birth, but being raised on an island amongst aspiring researchers and scientists had only further cemented that desire for new information. Recovery Girl practically had to drag him from the development studio and its enticing sounds of machinery, only managing to tear him away with the promise that they'd be back to see it later so he could be introduced to Power Loader and his students. By the time they reached the principal's office, he had already filled multiple pages in the notebook he kept on him with questions he wanted to ask when they looped back around. Midoriya, Principal Nezu greeted as the trio entered the office. I hope your first impressions of UA have continued to be positive since I met with you this morning. Yes, thank you. Izuku slipped the notebook back into one of the pockets of his lab coat. Your students and staff have all been very welcoming. One of them tackled you to the ground, Recovery Girl reminded him, still wary about her intern being attacked so suddenly. She raised her cane and prodded at the grass stains on his lab coat, causing Izuku to blush. That was just Kaken. He was excited to see me, he assured his mentor. Though at seeing Nezu's concerned expression, he explained the situation fully. I'm childhood friends with one of your students, Bakugo Katsuki. Ah yes, the one with the explosion quirk, Nezu said as the name sparked familiarity. He frowned, recalling more and more information about the student in question. Are you sure you're all right? Absolutely. We haven't seen each other in person for a while. Izuku shrugged. Honestly, I would have been concerned if he didn't tackle me like that. Well, if you're sure you're fine, then I suppose we can move forward with the reason why you're here. Nezu gestured towards one of the other people in the room. I believe you're already acquainted with Mr. Sasaki. A tall, lean figure dressed for business straightened in his seat on one of the office's couches. Izuku hadn't seen the man in years, and while their first meeting had been filled with shouting and distrust, he couldn't deny how happy he was to see Sir Night-Eye again. The pro-hero often put forth an intimidating front, but Izuku had learned to read past the calculating glares. It's good to see you again, sir. Izuku spoke sincerely, earning himself a rare smile from the older man. You as well, Midoriya. Sir Night-Eye returned the sentiment before waving a hand towards the uniformed figure standing behind him. Allow me to introduce the newest member of my agency, Mirio Tagada. It's an honor to meet you, Lemillion. Oh please, call me Tagada. The hero told him with a grin, reaching out for a handshake. Izuku found himself smiling in response, fond of the way Tagada's smile shined as bright as All Might's. So, you're the student from my island with a healing quirk? Huh, I've heard a lot about you from All Might and Sir. All good things, I assure you, Toshinori promised as he took a seat on one of the other couches in the room. Everyone else followed suit, finding seats as Nezu began preparing tea. It's a shame you didn't attend school here, Tagada pointed out. We could have met so much sooner. I actually used to want to attend UA. When I was younger, Katsuki and I both dreamed of attending the same school as All Might. Izuku told him, nodding in thanks as he accepted the cup of tea Nezu offered him. But when my quirk manifested, the doctor who evaluated me put me in contact with Island. Apparently, they're always searching for quirks like mine to research. They offered scholarships and stipends that I really couldn't turn down. While the choice had been practical and obviously benefited Izuku greatly in the long run, it still hadn't been easy. It was difficult separating from Katsuki, and it didn't help that the other boy threw the biggest tantrum when it was time for Izuku to leave. If that wasn't enough, Katsuki began to act out at school without Izuku there as a buffer and moral compass. It was hard on both of them, but the decision had ultimately been a good one. That's how you met All Might, isn't it? Tagada asked. You worked under his friend David Shield. That's right, Izuku confirmed, glancing over at Toshinori. Melissa and Uncle David send their love. By the way, I'm sure he's quietly sulking that we stole one of his most promising pupils, Toshinori mused with a chuckle and a shake of his head. David was especially interested in Midoriya and his quirk, admittedly for fairly selfish reasons in the beginning. He had hoped I'd be able to heal All Might's injuries, Izuku explained, catching Tagada up to speed on a story everyone else in the room already knew. But Recovery Girl already tried, Tagada acknowledged, his brow furrowing. I thought the extent of the damage was too much. The drawback to my quirk is that it's limited by the life energy that the patient is able to give to fuel the accelerated healing process, Recovery Girl clarified. If I tried to heal a large enough injury, it could easily kill the patient. With mine, the energy comes from me, Izuku supplied. So, it's limited by you, Tagada pieced together, slowly nodding his head. Then do you think that if you tried to heal him that it might end up killing you? Oh, I already tried, Izuku corrected him, lifting up the bottom edge of his shirt to reveal his torso. And it did nearly kill me. Tagada sucked in a breath, words catching in his throat as Izuku revealed a large scar covering the majority of the left side of his chest. The surface tissue seemed relatively healthy and there was a slight deficiency in muscle mass compared to his right side. But Tagada could not determine what sort of injury could have caused such a scar pattern. All he knew was that it looked strangely familiar to him. He attempted it when he was only 13, Toshinori lamented, sunken eyes filled with regret. Scarred like that, at such a young age. It's not your fault. It was my decision to try. Izuku softly snapped, tugging his shirt back down. He turned back to Tagada to give further clarification. When I heal someone, the energy doesn't just drain equally from every part of my body. It tends to drain the most from the same area as the injury on the patient. If I heal someone's broken arm, then mine will feel weak and sore afterwards. So, when you tried to heal All Might's injuries, Tagada trailed off, piecing together why Izuku's scarring pattern looked so familiar. It was like a less caved-in version of All Might's injuries. I couldn't even fix it partially. There's just too much. Izuku shook his head, eyes growing distant as he thought back to the day of the attempt. It's like trying to fix the top of a tower that's crumbling at its base. You try to patch the damage as best you can, but if the foundation isn't fixed, then all your work just gets undone. Thinking back, he had experienced a whirlwind of emotions that day. First, there had been excitement when David Shield introduced him to the hero whom he had admired for so many years. Then came the shock and worry when All Might revealed his true form and he saw the extensive injuries plaguing the symbol of peace. They had explained the situation and Shield had explained his plan for Izuku to use his quirk. Toshinori had been adamantly against it, but was shut down by Izuku's new emotion, determination. After that came the excitement when he began to use his quirk and it looked as though the plan could work. Then came the excruciating pain and agony as All Might's injuries became his own. Then there had been only darkness. Midoriya was desperate to try again. Even after what it did to him the first time, Toshinori recalled. He had been so fearful that the boy's determination would be the death of him that he did something he never thought he'd do. He had called his former sidekick. At first Sir Night-Eye had been all in favor of Izuku trying again. All he had been told was that on Eye Island, one of David Shield's apprentices had a healing quirk and they believed it could be their solution to All Might's injuries. He quickly changed his tune once he arrived and got one look at the desperate, wounded child who had only just awoken after being unconscious for days because of the first attempt. I looked ahead and saw that trying again would not only certainly kill him, it also still wouldn't be enough to heal the injuries. Sir Night-Eye jumped in to share his part of the story. He raised a brow as he looked at Izuku, who now seemed to be sulking in his seat. At the time you yelled at me for looking at your future. I was honestly a bit impressed. It's not every day you get chewed out by such an articulate child. After you told people what you saw, I was put in lockdown to make sure I wouldn't try to do it in secret. Izuku spoke in his defense. I always believed that the futures you saw could be changed. At that remark, Tagada and Sir Night-Eye shared a glance between them. It was subtle and those with less of a perceptive eye would have missed it. However, Izuku was nothing if not perceptive and he sent Sir Night-Eye an unimpressed look over the rim of his cup as he took a sip of tea. Sir Night-Eye sighed, fully aware that not much could get past the young healer. As it turns out, I managed to prove you right, Sir Night-Eye confessed. Izuku's eyes widened and he choked slightly on his tea. What do you mean? He asked, anxiety building. What happened? As you know, during last year's raid on the Shai Hasekai, I was hit by Overhaul's quirk-destroying drug and subsequently lost my quirk entirely, Sir Night-Eye began. Right. Izuku had been devastated by the news, and was made even more upset by the look of rare vulnerability on Sir Night-Eye's face when the hero had relayed the news over a video message. He had maintained a confident appearance for the media and news outlets, but in that private video he seemed almost scared. His foresight had been such a crucial tool for the hero industry, so its loss left him in a state he had never really faced before, one where he had no way of knowing what was going to happen. The bullet that hit me had been meant for Tagada, who was protecting that young girl, Eri. Izuku took note of the slight flinch from Tagada as Sir Night-Eye continued. I had looked ahead and seen the bullet hitting him, but I still desperately jumped in front of it. Why didn't you tell me about this? Izuku questioned, mind racing with the new piece of information. Your predictions have always been 100% correct, even when you try to intervene. They had been, Sir Night-Eye agreed, just as baffled. I'm not sure why this one instance was different from the rest, but here we are. The room fell silent and contemplative. Izuku slowly put down his tea and pulled out his notebook, murmuring under his breath as he flipped to a new page and began writing. His gaze was distant, mind reeling with theories and speculations. He was only brought back to the present by the sound of Tagada speaking with a broken, tired voice. You should never have. Don't start, Mirio, Sir Night-Eye cut him off. What would we have done if you'd lost one for all? Losing my quirk after years in the field is a small price to pay to protect the future symbol of peace. Izuku sympathized with Tagada. It must have been hard to see his mentor lose his quirk, and there was no doubt that Tagada felt some level of guilt over it happening. However, Sir Night-Eye was right. Izuku remembered reading the news reports and watching the out-of-focus videos uploaded to the internet by bystanders who had witnessed the fight. Lemillion had taken on Overhaul alone, and without his nearly 3 years of training with One for All, he would have lost that fight. That girl you told me about, Eri. Izuku marked a new line in his notes. I assume you've considered trying to use her rewind quirk to restore your own. We have considered it, Sir Night-Eye conceded. However, her quirk is incredibly volatile and if used improperly, could rewind a person to a point before they existed. She needs training, which is difficult considering her quirk can only be used on people and not objects. Understood. Izuku softly snapped his notebook shut and nodded. Would it be possible for me to meet her at some point? I believe that could be arranged. It was Principal Nezu who answered this time. One of our teachers, Shota Aizawa, currently has custody of her. His erasure quirk is useful for stopping hers if she were to ever lose control of it. Izuku slipped the notebook back into his coat before reaching into the other pocket for his bag of sweets. He hadn't been using his quirk, but an unfortunate side effect of simply possessing it was an abnormally fast metabolism, almost like he was stockpiling healing energy while on standby. He raised a candy to his mouth, stopping when he realized Tagada was looking at him. His previous look of guilt had shifted to one of contemplation. Izuku lowered the candy. Tagada, sorry, Tagada started a bit, likely not realizing he had been staring in the first place. I don't mean to offend, but why was Midoriya told about One for All? It's not something you would have needed to reveal for him to try and heal All Might's injuries. I may be called the youthful heroine, but I won't be around forever, Recovery Girl answered. Someone needs to look after Yaga's idiot successor and potentially even whoever Tagada decides to pass the quirk along to. I only hurt myself with one for all in the beginning, Tagada argued, holding his arm in the air and flexing as if it helped to prove his point. I'm used to it now. You're used to the quirk or you're used to the pain, Izuku chided knowingly, finally popping the candy into his mouth as he watched Tagada's eyes widen. You're clever and your original permeation quirk is helpful for mitigating the destruction caused by using one for all. But from what I've heard, the damage you've already done to your arms is stupidly extensive and not something we can ignore. Oh, he'll do just fine, Principal Nezu murmured as he watched the exchange with increasing amusement. It's good to have a few people on your side who know the full story, Toshinori offered, sending Tagada a sympathetic look. Once Izuku had gotten over his initial awe from meeting his idol, his praises had quickly turned to valid criticisms of Toshinori's life choices and habits. He knew what it was like to be on the receiving end of Izuku's shrewd scrutiny. Think of me as a resource, Izuku offered, tossing a candy at Tagada, who snatched it from the air with a curious smile. One you can certainly trust. It's been hard keeping this secret from the people I love, but I understand the importance of it. I even would have kept All Might's injuries a secret if they hadn't left me bedridden for a while. Your mother was not a fan of me for a while after that, Toshinori recalled, wincing a bit as he thought of Inko Midoriya's maternal wrath. However, something I wasn't expecting was how much young Bakugo seemed to both admire and despise me when he began attending UA. Toshinori had a complicated relationship with Bakugo. He had saved the boy from a sludge villain a few years prior, throwing all he had left before hitting his limit into freeing the suffocating student, only to later learn that the middle schooler he had saved was Izuku's dear childhood friend. However, being a fan and even being saved from a villain by him wasn't enough for Bakugo to completely forgive the man for nearly indirectly killing Izuku. What can I say? Izuku popped another candy into his mouth, a sly grin creeping in at the corners. He's protective. Izuku. Katsuki watched as his mother squealed and squeezed Izuku's cheeks, briefly pondering if he should step in before his boyfriend's face became disfigured. My baby has returned. True to Izuku's prediction, Katsuki had received word from his father earlier in the school day that they'd be having dinner with the Midoriyas that night. He easily obtained permission to leave campus, and he and Izuku met by the school gates at the end of the day to travel to Katsuki's house together. The moment they walked through the door, his mother had pounced on Izuku with crushing hugs and affectionate coos. Stop acting like he's your fucking long-lost son, Katsuki griped, sidestepping the two of them so he could walk over towards his father and Izuku's mother, who were setting the table for dinner. Especially when you already have a son. He's basically my future son-in-law so long as you don't manage to fuck things up, Mitsuki warned. I honestly don't understand how a brat like you managed to snag Inko's little angel in the first place, Mitsuki, Inko called out, simple yet firm with implications clear to everyone in the room. Katsuki forced back the smirk that threatened to appear from hearing Auntie scold his mother in his defense. He and his mother had always butt heads, it was just how they were, and his father would really only step in if the spats became too loud or violent. Inko Midoriya, on the other hand, was the epitome of familial love and support. If she witnessed Mitsuki speaking or acting too harshly towards Katsuki or heard Katsuki being unreasonably disrespectful towards Mitsuki, then she immediately intervened. Mitsuki sighed and released Izuku to turn and face her son. He raised a brow and saw her eye twitch ever so slightly in response, but nevertheless she continued, "You're a wonderful son and I'm lucky to have you." To anyone else the words may have sounded too rehearsed or insincere, but Katsuki knew she meant it. His mother shared the same discomfort with expressing complex emotions that he did, so that was the best they could manage sometimes. Thanks, Katsuki replied, voice a touch less than genuine, though he was secretly happy for the apology. He turned towards Izuku's mother with a soft smile, head tilting forward in a respectful nod. It's good to see you again, Auntie. Oh Katsuki, I've missed you so much, Inko cried, pulling Katsuki in for a bone-crushing hug. It's so good to see you boys together again. Izuku just looks much happier when he gets to see you beyond a phone or video call. They really are always better together, Masaru agreed. Like a balance is restored. That's why you need to marry him. He mellows you out, Mitsuki reiterated, pinching Katsuki's cheek as she passed him on her way to the table. Just like how your father mellows me out. Please stop fucking talking about this, Katsuki begged, swatting her hand away. When he and Izuku had first started dating, parental approval hadn't been the hardest thing to acquire. Auntie Inko was fairly protective of Izuku, and she held no tolerance for Katsuki's occasionally ill-mannered behavior. But it was clear to her that they'd be a good pair. Katsuki softened around Izuku, and his assertive attitude led to Izuku developing a better sense of self-confidence. Mitsuki, on the other hand, was ready to start planning the wedding as soon as they announced their relationship. She had been friends with Inko for years and had always considered Izuku to be a delightful child. Katsuki could argue that Izuku actually had his own bratty side that many people never saw, but instead he chose to keep quiet and accept his mother's easily earned approval. Masaru was a simple man. As long as his son was happy and loved, he approved. How was your first day at UA? Izuku, Masaru asked in an attempt to change the subject as everyone sat down for dinner. It was incredible, Izuku exclaimed. The school has so many great resources and the students and faculty were all very welcoming. You clearly didn't meet all the students then, Katsuki muttered, thinking of how many obnoxious extras he'd encountered during his time there. And you? Mitsuki directed the attention towards Katsuki and he tensed, knowing what question was coming. How did it feel to finally introduce your boyfriend to everyone? There it was. Katsuki could already feel their eyes studying him, judging him. We didn't mention the dating part. The looks of shock bordering on disappointment he received from his parents and auntie and co made Katsuki want to blow a hole in the hall and escape into the night. Katsuki Bakugo didn't run away, so for him to want to run away really stressed how uncomfortable this conversation was about to be for him. What? Mitsuki questioned. Her tone wasn't harsh, but Katsuki still flinched ever so slightly. I figured with Izuku here you'd want to finally tell everyone. Katsuki Bakugo was not ashamed of who he was dating, far from it. Katsuki was proud as fuck to be Izuku's boyfriend. He couldn't care less what any extras had to say about two guys being in a relationship. That was never the problem. No, the problem was that Katsuki was protective and possessive as hell. He wanted to keep Izuku to himself. What would be the point in letting people know about him? His group of idiots would probably want to meet him and talk to him and know everything about him, which is fine. Izuku is amazing. But with Izuku on an island, it would fall to Katsuki to share all that information, and he's not the best at communicating. Izuku knows this, and bless his heart, he works around it to figure out how to translate Katsuki's body language and words. He's just barely grown comfortable enough to share his emotions with his boyfriend, let alone talk about them with people he's only known for less than 2 years. Not to mention if they ever broke up, then Katsuki would have to stomach the pitying looks and useless speeches from his classmates in their attempts to comfort him. Well, me coming here was a surprise, Izuku cut in, though even he sounded a bit upset about the whole thing. Honestly, Katsuki didn't deserve the fact that Izuku was trying to defend him. Kaken barely had a chance to react, let alone figure out how he'd like to tell everybody. About that, Katsuki corrected. And God no, Izuku's expression just twisted into something sadder and Katsuki felt like a knife had been jammed in between his ribs. I think we should hold off on telling people we're dating. Why would you do that? Inko questioned with a soft voice so Katsuki wouldn't feel so cornered. Katsuki grimaced and turned to look at Izuku, whose normally cheerful expression was tainted with discomfort and dread. Believe me, I was all in favor of it once I learned you'd be staying here for a while. He had made the promise to himself that if he and Izuku were ever to be reunited in the same place for a substantial length of time, then he'd finally introduce him. The time had come and the circumstances were right, but Izuku was patiently waiting for the explanation despite his obvious anxieties. He always waited for explanations. He always gave Katsuki a chance to collect his thoughts or back away from saying something stupid. My classmates are idiots, Katsuki began. After you left, they started wondering if you were secretly violent because you seemed too nice to be friends with someone like me. That's terrible, Masaru murmured, his wife and Inko nodding in agreement. Like I said, they're idiots. They don't always think about what they say before they say it. Katsuki stressed to them. I'm used to their bullshit and honestly I usually deserve the comments. But you. He looked at Izuku again. They barely know you. Well, they'll get to know me eventually, Izuku tried to argue. My plan is to make friends here. Exactly. You want to make friends and I want you to have that chance, Katsuki explained. They already associate you too much with me. If people learn you're dating the kid with the villain quirk, they'll start assuming even more than they already are. Katsuki, Masaru gently chided. His parents had always been concerned with society labeling quirks as leaning towards good or evil and how it affected their son. Your quirk doesn't define. I know. Look, Katsuki took Izuku's hand in his. Humor me, at least for a little while. I want people to get to know you as an individual. He squeezed the hand, hoping his boyfriend would recognize his worries. Please. Okay, Izuku agreed, an understanding smile on his face as he squeezed Katsuki's hand in return. And that's the only reason you don't want to tell them? Yeah, Katsuki answered, confused as to why there were still hints of fear in Izuku's expression until it dawned on him. You fucking idiot. Did you think I was about to break up with you? Listen, are you kidding me? You have to admit that's what it was starting to sound like. Okay, alright. The two of you calm down, Inko called for order. You'll need to make sure Yagi knows you're keeping it a secret. Thanks for the reminder, Izuku acknowledged. I don't think anyone aside from him knows yet. Well, except my teacher knows too, Katsuki informed him. Your teacher, Izuku repeated, his brow raising in disbelief. Why does Eraserhead know that we're dating? Oh, that'd be my fault, Mitsuki answered. So, she admits it, Katsuki said with a scowl, his mother scoffing in response. I apologized right after it happened, Katsuki. she reasoned. I was still a bit emotional over getting you back safely and it just slipped out. Can someone please explain? Izuku trailed off, looking between Katsuki and his mother. Remember last year when I was captured during the summer training camp? Let me think. Do I remember when I went nearly catatonic with grief because my boyfriend had been kidnapped by villains? Izuku questioned, tone dripping with sarcasm. You know, I think I might remember something like that happening. After I was rescued was when they decided to implement the dorm system at UA. And they sent All Might and Mr. Aizawa around to all the parents to get their approval. I was all for it, Mitsuki stated. Ever since Katsuki was young he'd been given nothing but shallow praise for having an amazing quirk and it gave him an attitude problem. We contributed to that attitude problem, Masaru reminded her, getting a grimace and slight nod from his wife in response. I like Katsuki's teacher, she continued. He sees potential in Katsuki to be a hero and keeps him in check. I believed the best place my son could be was in the care of UA, and I told them just that. And, Katsuki prompted, what else did you tell him? And, I may or may not have made a comment about how Katsuki needed someone who could put him in his place since his boyfriend wasn't able to be around to do it. Oh dear, Inko murmured, though she was clearly a bit amused by the slip. To his credit, he didn't react to the mentioning of a boyfriend, Masaru recalled in defense of the teacher. He did, just slightly, but he did, Katsuki corrected. I saw it in his face. Did he seem judgmental? Not really, more like he was curious but knew it wouldn't be professional to ask questions in that moment, Katsuki assured. He approached me about it one day after class. Now this I didn't know about, Mitsuki acknowledged, concern creeping into her expression as she wondered what her son's teacher had said. At first I thought I was going to get a don't ask don't tell speech about working as a hero, he told them. He thought back to that day, of when Aizawa had asked him to stay after for a few minutes so they could discuss something. The reason he had given in front of rest of the class was that it was regarding Katsuki's request to use one of the private training rooms on campus. As soon as they were alone, Aizawa's expression had shifted to that same curious look and Katsuki had immediately known the conversation was about something else. What did he say then? He said that if anyone gave me shit for having a boyfriend then I should let him know, Katsuki recalled, watching as relieved smiles settled onto everyone's faces. He said he knew what it was like to be in that sort of relationship in the hero industry. At that reveal, Izuku nearly choked on the piece of food he had been eating and turned to face Katsuki with wide eyes. Katsuki chuckled at the look on his boyfriend's face. It was the same starry-eyed, information-hungry look of analysis that appeared whenever he was learning something new about a hero. Who? Present Mike, Katsuki answered, knowing the information was safe to share with the people around him. They've been married for years apparently. They don't keep it a secret, but they don't go around telling everybody either. No kidding, Izuku muttered. I need to update my notebooks. He also offered to be someone who would reach out to you if something were to happen to me, Katsuki added, nodding to himself, which was pretty cool of him. Well, I'm certainly feeling better and better about you being at UA, Inko declared. Though I still trust you'll look after him, Katsuki. Mom, please, Izuku groaned. Of course I will, Auntie, Katsuki promised, always proud to be trusted by Inko as someone who would protect and take care of her son. He had been one hell of a brat when he was younger, like most kids were, and engaged in his fair share of teasing even when it came to Izuku. However, he had also always been strangely protective of the other boy in his own way. Even as the two of them grew older and Izuku enrolled in martial arts courses offered on an island and his baby fat gradually turned to define muscle, Katsuki still tended to treat him like the delicate, clumsy kid who would scrape his knee on the playground and cry about it. Old habits died hard and Inko always saw Izuku as her little boy, so she was all in favor of Katsuki's protectiveness. Are you too sure you'll be able to keep the relationship a secret? Katsuki is very similar to his mother, Masaru noted, prompting his wife and son to send him looks of offended confusion. Masaru gathered some of the empty dishes on the table and stood, ready to make his exit before explaining himself further, which is to say they're incredibly territorial. Masaru laughed and nimbly dodged his wife's attempt to weakly swat his arm as Katsuki grumbled about not wanting to be compared to his mother. Inko merely smiled, quite familiar with the family's dynamic as Izuku laughed at Katsuki's small tantrum. I guess he'll just have to learn how to behave, Izuku mused. He grinned wider as Katsuki began to frown, realizing the level of restraint he was going to have to exercise around Izuku at school. His father was unfortunately right. He was territorial as shit. Won't you, Kaken? Fuck. When morning classes ended and Class 2A's lunch period began, Shouto Todoroki made his way not to the cafeteria but to the infirmary. When he arrived, two other students were in the midst of leaving. One was in the process of unwrapping a string of bandages that had been enveloping her hand while the other remarked with amazement at how nicely his friend's fingers had healed. He quietly brushed past them and entered the room. A quick glance around showed him all the beds were empty and Recovery Girl was absent, which only left her green-haired intern in the room. Said intern currently had his back to Shadow as he removed and replaced bottles and jars from the cabinets, likely organizing or doing an inventory of the supplies. His lab coat was clean and free of the grass stains that had covered it the day before after Bakugo had tackled him. Shadow intentionally cleared his throat to announce his presence in the room. "I'll be right with you," the healer called out over his shoulder, still not turning to face Shadow. "Only day 2 and he's already too busy to attend to a patient," Shadow noted, shaking his head with mock disappointment. "Frankly, I am appalled. I should file a complaint." At the sound of his voice, the intern finally turned around, nearly dropping the jar of pills in his hand as he stared at Shadow with wide eyes. A beat passed before suddenly the widest grin overtook the other boy's face and he ran towards Shadow, this time intentionally dropping the jar on a nearby bed along the way. "Shadow," he shouted, tackling the other boy and nearly pulling both of them down to the ground with the force of his hug. Shadow laughed and raised his arms to return the embrace. "Hello, Midoriya. I've told you to call me Izuku," Midoriya reminded him as he pulled away to properly face his friend. "I'm fairly certain if I called you Izuku, Bakugo would actually kill me instead of just threatening to do it," Shadow told him, Midoriya rolling his eyes in response. He stepped away and returned to the cabinets he had been taking inventory of, swiping up the jar he had dropped along the way. "I'm sorry I didn't greet you properly yesterday." "It's fine, I understand," Shadow assured as he walked further into the room and took a seat on the end of one of the infirmary beds. "You had an excuse for already knowing Bakugo, but you didn't really have one for already knowing me without." "I wish I could just explain why I already knew you," Midoriya complained, shutting the cabinet door with slightly more force than was necessary. "Then why didn't you?" Shadow questioned, brows furrowing. "I just assumed both of you didn't wish to share quite yet. It's really only Kaken that wants us to keep the relationship a secret for now," Midoriya explained. When he turned and saw Shadow's look of alarm, he quickly shook his head. "It's not what you think. He isn't hiding me. He just wants people to get to know me for me before they know about that. He believes if people know that you're dating, then they'll associate you too heavily with him," Shadow surmised. He thought back to the comments his fellow classmates had made after meeting Midoriya, and nodded his head slightly. "I'll admit, the concern isn't unfounded." Midoriya pouted as if he had been hoping Shadow would disagree on the matter. He didn't blame him, considering disagreeing with Bakugo was one of his favorite things to do. "Yeah, and I guess it makes sense, but it still sucks," Midoriya whined as he moved to sit next to Shadow on the bed. "Anyway, how have you been? How are your mom and your siblings?" "They're all doing well. Thank you for thinking of them." "And?" Midoriya prompted, nudging Shadow with his elbow. "How's the quirk?" "Both icy and hot," Shadow replied, smiling in response to the way Midoriya's nose scrunched as he grinned at Shadow with delight in his eyes. "Just as you and Bakugo demanded it to be. Just as it should be." "UA, Sports Festival, first year stage." Shadow glanced down at the silver medal dangling around his neck as he walked through the halls of the stadium. It bounced against his chest with every step and pulled at his neck with an unfamiliar weight. The area was fairly empty as nearly everyone else had left and gone home following the closing ceremony. Shadow had immediately gone to Recovery Girls Branch Infirmary, partially for a final health assessment and mostly to avoid his father. Thankfully, he hadn't run into him since he left the infirmary, and he prayed it would stay that way. Shadow wasn't in the mood for a discussion about why his medal was silver and not gold. He would have left immediately, but he had left a few of his belongings in the waiting room and he still needed to check in with Mr. Aizawa before heading home. He turned the corner and spotted the door to the waiting room. He noted that the door was cracked open, light filtering out through the opening, and stopped completely when he realized he could hear someone speaking. He inched closer to the door and peeked through the crack, wary of who he would run into if he walked in without checking. "They think I'm fucking feral now." It was Bakugo, free of his metal restraints and significantly calmer than he had been at the closing ceremony. He was sitting with his back towards the door and his gold medal sat on the table next to him, though the medal had been pushed away as if Bakugo wanted it out of sight. "Your reaction was justified," Shadow heard another voice respond. The sound was slightly distorted, and he realized that Bakugo must be on the phone with someone. "They put you in restraints and a muzzle and triggered a fucking panic attack." "Damn, Izuku." Bakugo gave a tired chuckle and Shadow found himself marveling at the fact that it sounded almost fun. "Your mom's going to kill me if you start swearing like I do. They tied up my boyfriend like a rabid dog because he was a little bit angry. Of course I'm going to swear." The voice, someone named Izuku, retorted. There was a beat of silence before Shadow heard the voice sigh. "You panic when you're restrained, Kaken." "I doubt they realized what they were doing," Bakugo argued, reaching up rubbed the back of his neck. "The sludge villain attack was so long ago and people just assume it didn't affect me." His voice had grown quieter and Shadow found himself straining to hear it. He subconsciously leaned forward, pushing at the door in the process, which caused the hinges to squeak. His eyes widened and he glared at the door, irrationally angry at it for making noise. When he looked back, he found himself at the receiving end of a lethal blood-red stare courtesy of Bakugo, who had turned around in his chair. "What the fuck do you want?" Bakugo growled. Shadow froze and stared at Bakugo, eyes glancing down to look at the phone clutched in his hand. He only had to explain that he needed to grab his things and then leave. Bakugo had no way of knowing that he had been standing at the door eavesdropping on his conversation. But for whatever reason, be it exhaustion or just the shock of being caught, Shadow couldn't formulate any rational response. So, he did the stupid thing and said the first thing that came to mind. Did he say boyfriend? It was immediately clear that was the wrong thing to say. "You wanna fucking die? Icy hot." Bakugo stood from his seat and advanced on his classmate, stopping only when whoever was on the phone spoke again. "Wait, is that him?" the voice asked. Bakugo held the phone up in front of him and Shadow realized it must be a video call. "Let me talk to him." "Izuku." Katsuki. Bakugo, hand over the phone. Shadow was convinced he must have some kind of head injury because he swore Bakugo looked almost scared from hearing his full name. For a moment it seemed like Bakugo was going to argue, but finally he huffed and handed Shadow the phone. Shadow hesitated before reaching out and taking it, holding it up to his own face. He was met with the sight of a green-haired boy who looked to be sitting at a desk. There were pieces of tech piled up around him and All Might posters hung on the wall behind him. "Hello, what the hell is wrong with you?" The boy cut him off. Despite the softness of his face giving the illusion of kindness, his tone was sharp and the dark circles under his eyes rivaled Mr. Aizawa's. He already seemed annoyed with the conversation despite it barely having started. What? Shadow weakly replied, glancing briefly at Bakugo, who was only glaring at him. "Why didn't you use all of your power in that last fight?" Shadow's eyes shot back down and narrowed. "I don't use my left side." "That's ridiculous," the boy scoffed, reaching out of frame to retrieve a notebook which he began to flip through. "You were slowing down from the drop in body temperature from just using ice. If you used your fire it could offset the drop and you could do so much more." "I'm not using his fire," Shadow told him, vaguely registering that his voice was growing louder with every response. The boy looked up from his notebook. "Whose fire?" "My father's," Shadow snapped, trying his best not to throw the phone across the room. "I'll be a great hero without it." He held the phone out towards Bakugo, ready to end the conversation there. The blonde simply looked at him, arms crossed and expression unimpressed. Shadow scowled and shook the phone in front of him, but he still refused to take it back. Bakugo simply raised a brow and nodded towards the phone, a silent way of saying you're not done yet. When Shadow turned the phone back towards himself, he saw the boy looked furious but was still patiently waiting to continue. "It's not your father's fucking fire." He bit back as soon as he saw Shadow's face again. "It's yours. It's your quirk, and yours alone. You don't know. I'm going to stop you right there. I'm well aware I don't know what issues you have with your father and I won't pretend to say I can relate," the boy said. "But if you don't use your full power, you don't deserve to be a great hero. One day you'll come across a situation where you need to give it your all, and if you don't then people will die." He shut his notebook and tossed it somewhere on the desk. "So give it your all and screw your father, because that quirk is yours and as long as you accept it then one day you'll be the hero you want to be." Shadow stared at the phone with wide eyes, hand shaking slightly as he looked at this green-haired stranger who just tore into his personal vows like they were tissue paper. All the fight left him at once as the boy's words draped over him like a weighted blanket, pulling him down from his anger-fueled outburst. The boy's expression had shifted from frustrated to determined during his speech, and now it had settled into a look of genuine sympathy. Shadow opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Eventually Bakugo sighed and reached out, plucking the phone out of Shadow's hand and turning it back towards himself. "I'll call you back later, Izuku," Bakugo promised, listening for words of agreement before he ended the call and returned the phone to his pocket. Shadow's hand dropped to his side and his mouth closed, eyes flitting about the room before focusing on Bakugo. His classmate's face was fairly neutral, his emotions unreadable. Shadow found that strange. Normally Bakugo never bothered to hide what he was thinking. Shadow took a breath and cleared his throat. "You probably don't care what I think, but the muzzle was definitely overkill," he said, wincing slightly as his voice cracked. Bakugo remained silent. "Are you okay?" "You heard the boyfriend part," Bakugo pointed out, reminding Shadow of his poor choice in response when he had been caught eavesdropping. Shadow swallowed and slowly nodded his head. "I did," he confirmed, noting that Bakugo's neutral expression shifted ever so slightly into one of apprehension. "I won't tell anyone, if that's what you're worried about." He felt strangely pleased when Bakugo's shoulders dropped somewhat from their tense position. "He seems nice, passionate." Bakugo continued to stare at him, observing and judging Shadow's actions and responses. Eventually he let out a sigh and looked away, the beginnings of a smile curling at the edges of his mouth. "Yeah." The two fell silent again, though the atmosphere between them wasn't laced with their normal hostile and bitter attitudes. Bakugo still seemed anxious, a novel sight for Shoto, but he seemed to be calming down by the second. That boy on the phone, Izuku. He clearly meant something to Bakugo, something more than just a silly high school relationship. Shoto was beginning to realize how much he wanted to know more about that green-haired boy. He was also beginning to realize how little he knew about Bakugo, how little the entire class knew about him, and that didn't sit quite right with him. If you want. Shoto broke their silence and moved to finally gather up the things he had left in the waiting room. Clearly I need to work on my quirk, and I'm thinking that maybe having a sparring partner would. Sure. He spun around to look at Bakugo, who still stood by the doorway, hands in his pockets as he observed Shoto with a watchful eye. Really? Shoto checked, surprised that his offer had been accepted. Bakugo narrowed his eyes and pointed a finger at him. If you don't use the fire, I will put you in a fucking coma, he warned, his threat delivered with the usual vulgar candor Shoto had come to associate with Bakugo. Deal, Shoto agreed without hesitation. Bakugo raised a brow, as if he hadn't expected Shoto to agree to that demand so quickly. He dropped his hand back down to his side and nodded his head towards the door. We should go, he suggested. Aizawa's probably waiting to yell at me for my behavior during the closing ceremony. Maybe if you explain it was a panic. Nope. Bakugo put an immediate end to the idea with a sharp shake of his head. Not today. We're not exploring that today. Shoto nodded and moved to follow his classmate out before pausing when he noticed Bakugo's gold medal still sat on the table. He picked it up and held it out, refusing to falter even when Bakugo sent him a menacing glare. Eventually, he muttered something under his breath and snatched the medal from Shoto's hand, stuffing it in his other pocket. The two classmates left the room and began to make their way down the hall. Do you want to tell me about your boy friend? Shoto offered, trying his best to look encouraging when Bakugo sent a cautious glance his way. Your friend, that's a boy. They walked in silence for a few more moments, their footsteps echoing down the empty halls. Shoto figured the silence was Bakugo's answer and stopped waiting for a response until suddenly the other boy spoke, that same strange fondness returning to his voice. So, he's got these notebooks, right? Shoto was incredibly grateful to have known Midoriya since his first year. If he hadn't stumbled upon Bakugo's phone call with him, then he would likely still be on the same isolated, restricting path he had set for himself. However, while Shoto had been the only one aside from Bakugo who knew that Midoriya existed, he wasn't the only student who had been affected from afar by the healer. Class 2 was wholly unaware that Midoriya had been an unseen, distant influence on them in many ways. He operated through Bakugo. The explosive student wasn't the best at dealing with other people, often being harsh or insensitive whenever he attempted to help with the problems of others. So instead he would reach out to his boyfriend, explain the situation, and execute the solutions he came up with. Whenever there was a problem in class, Bakugo would often offer up the best solutions in subtle ways that made it seem like someone else in the class came up with the idea. When Midoriya had seen the news that Ingenium had been attacked by the hero killer, he called Bakugo and asked how the younger brother he was classmates with had been coping. When Bakugo reported the younger Ida's strange behavior, his sudden hostility and unchecked emotions, Midoriya recommended that Bakugo keep an eye on him lest something bad happen. Bakugo wasn't exactly on friendly terms with Ida, so he passed the information along to Shoto. Thanks to the insight combined with Ida's absence from the Namo fight in Hasu, Shoto was able to put the pieces together and track down his classmate before Stain could claim another victim. Eventually Bakugo, albeit reluctantly, gave him Midoriya's contact information and the two quickly became friends. He had been the one to call and comfort a sobbing, panicked Midoriya when Bakugo was kidnapped by the League of Villains, swearing that he'd do everything he could to get him back safe. Midoriya helped him accept both sides of his quirk and pushed him to stop isolating himself from his classmates. Shoto had formed strong friendships with Uraraka, Ida, and Isui because of Midoriya's encouragement, and he felt it was long overdue that Midoriya be brought into their little group. What are your lunch plans? Shoto asked, Midoriya looking back at him with his curious green eyes. I'd like to introduce some friends to you. There's Todoroki. Izuku heard Shoto's friends before he saw them. The cafeteria was swarming with UA students, but he was still able to pick out a vaguely familiar voice amidst the cacophony of sounds. He turned towards it to see a small group of students waving them over and followed after Shoto as he began walking towards them. As they walked closer, Izuku recognized them as Tenya Ida, Ochako Uraraka, and Tsuyu Isui. He already knew about their quirks and how each of them performed in the sports festival, but when it came to their personalities, he had conflicting stories from both Shoto and Katsuki's accounts. Oh, he brought Recovery Girl's intern with him, Isui noted, giving Izuku a friendly wave which he returned. It's Izuku Midoriya, correct? Ida stood from his seat and held out a perfectly straight arm for a handshake. I'm Tenya Ida, Class 2A's representative. Izuku had been secretly quite excited to meet Ida in particular. He had been relieved when Shoto and Katsuki updated him on the stain incident and informed him that Ida was safe and receiving the support he needed. Katsuki had complained less and less about him over time, his grievances over Ida's strict professionalism gradually shifting to quiet approval of his classmates' progress. Izuku also found it interesting that Ida had been raised surrounded by the hero industry similar to Shoto, but his experience had been significantly more positive. "It's nice to officially meet you," Izuku said with a smile as he shook the student's hand. "I invited Midoriya to eat lunch with us, if that's okay with everyone," Shoto said as the two joined the table. "Of course," Ida assured. "I'm a little surprised you reached out like that, Todoroki," Uraraka admitted. "You're not normally so social." "I bet he's hoping Midoriya has embarrassing stories about Bakugo," Asui guessed as she held out her hand for Izuku to shake. "I'm Tsuyu Asui, by the way. I'm Achako Uraraka." Uraraka introduced herself and Izuku shook her hand as well. "And please tell us you have embarrassing stories about Bakugo. The guy is too perfect. There has to be something off." "No one's perfect," Izuku argued, holding back a laugh as he considered all of his boyfriend's bad habits. "He just tends to be good at everything he does." "Sounds pretty perfect to me," Uraraka grumbled, picking at her lunch. "Well, perfect at fighting and academics," Ida conceded. "However, the personality leaves something to be desired." Izuku watched his eyes suddenly widen as he realized what he had said and who he had said it in front of. "I'm sorry, that was terribly rude of me. I know you two are friends. Don't worry, I get it. He's rough around the edges," Izuku quickly agreed with a chuckle. Ida relaxed and sent him a grateful smile. Izuku glanced around at the group of classmates, a mischievous smile growing on his face as his curiosity got the best of him. "Honestly, if you want to vent about him then go for it." "Oh, good, because he's so rude and I think he hates me too," Uraraka immediately said. Izuku's eyes widened in response to both the quick response and the starkness of the confession. It wasn't strange to hear Katsuki described as rude, considering his blunt honesty and competitive attitude often made him come across as perpetually ill-mannered. The part that was a surprise to him was that Uraraka believed Katsuki hated her. Katsuki always made it very clear if he hated someone, and Uraraka had never once come up on that list of individuals. "Hates you," Izuku repeated, wondering if he had heard her right. "You said you watched the sports festivals, right?" Uraraka checked, waiting for Izuku to nod before she continued. "He nearly killed me in the fighting tournament when we were first years. He was quite ruthless with his quirk," Ida acknowledged. "It was like he didn't even care that you were a girl." "So that's what it was." Izuku couldn't hold back his laughter once he realized what had led Uraraka to believe Katsuki held such negative feelings for her. He hadn't gone easy on her during the fight, and she had misinterpreted that as him having hostile intentions. He noticed the others, sans Shoto, were now looking at him with confusion, so he quickly moved to explain his sudden laughter. "That's because he didn't care that you're a girl," Izuku explained. "Kaken doesn't discriminate when it comes to fighting, so gender is never a factor to consider. If anything, I think he respects you more than hates you. You fought harder than he had anticipated in that tournament battle." He thought back to the fight and how even he hadn't been able to think of many good strategies for Uraraka's quirk. She utilized her environment incredibly well, but Katsuki was just too strong. He had been honing his quirk since the moment it manifested, and he knew how to use it. "You're kidding." From Uraraka's tone, Izuku could tell she was still skeptical. "Think about it," he pressed. "Would a villain give you special treatment for being a girl?" "So, he fights like a villain," Ida concluded. "I don't think that's the point he's trying to make." Asui thankfully spoke up before Izuku had to. He nodded towards her, grateful for the correction and the fact that at least one of them seemed to understand. "Kaken just sees you as someone who's training to be a hero, and he thinks heroes should be able to take on an opponent's full power," Izuku clarified. For him, not using full power is an insult. With that final comment, he sent a playful glare in the direction of Shoto, who had been silently eating his soba as he listened to the conversation. He swallowed his food and responded with an expression of mock offense, nudging Izuku's knee with his own under the table. "Don't give me that look," Shoto told him. "I've been doing better." "Are you sure Bakugo doesn't hate me?" Uraraka asked, raising her hands to press them against her cheeks. "He calls me round face." "That seems like an insult." "To be fair, he doesn't really call anyone by their actual name," Asui reasoned with one of her fingers pressed to her chin in thought. "Well, except Midoriya apparently." Izuku decided not to share that her comment was far from the truth. Katsuki used nicknames for nearly everyone, even Izuku. Often his were just a fondly spoken nerd, or very rarely he'd call Izuku Bunny if they were alone because of Izuku's energetic nature. The first time he had ever even called him Izuku instead of Midoriya was when they started dating. Sometimes his nicknames could come across as insults, but for Katsuki they were mostly just a method of remembering people. A nickname other than extra meant you had been logged in his head and that he had acknowledged you as someone worth remembering. The use of someone's actual name, be it first or last, meant that he decided you'd be important in his life. Izuku couldn't stop smiling the day he heard Katsuki say Kirishima instead of shitty hair during a phone call. He doesn't actually mean to insult you with it, Izuku defended, though he made a mental note to tell Katsuki to rethink some of the nicknames he was using. And he lets you call him Kakin, Uraraka recalled with amazement in her voice. She seemed to drop the discussion of fighting in favor of Izuku's choice in nicknames. That's such a cute thing to call him. You two must be such good friends. Izuku bit the inside of his cheek and nudged Shadow back with his own knee under the table when he heard a quiet chuckle escape the other boy. Katsuki wasn't the only one with a possessive side to him. While Izuku was the more subtle one in the relationship, he still wasn't a fan of having to hide the fact that he and Katsuki were dating. Yeah, Izuku muttered as Shadow strategically switched the conversation to something new. The best of friends. Oh hey, isn't that the healer intern? Where? Katsuki's head snapped up on instinct at hearing mention of Izuku. Thankfully none of his friends commented as they all had their attention drawn towards another table in the cafeteria. Over there eating with Todoroki, Ada, Uraraka, and Asui, Shiro answered, gesturing slightly towards the students in question. Oh, that's so nice, Ashido cooed, watching as Izuku laughed at something Ada had said. He'll fit in super well with that group. They're all such sweethearts. Did you just call Icy Hot a sweetheart? Aw, are you worried that Todoroki's gonna steal your friend away? Kaminari teased. Katsuki's eye twitched and he looked back down at his lunch. He can sit with who he wants, Katsuki muttered, trying his best to bury his instincts. When's the last time you and Midoriya saw each other anyway? Kirishima asked. You said he went to live on an island when you guys were 5, right? I've seen him since then. We've visited each other a few times over the years and we'd video chat or call as often as we could, Bakugo told them. It's hard for outsiders to visit an island because of the security checks and they generally restrict their researchers and students from leaving. So, you guys really are close, huh? Kirishima observed, a soft smile on his face. It was clear he was happy learning Katsuki had had a friend like Izuku for so long. It must have been hard on you when he left. The part that sucked the most was how fast it all happened, Katsuki admitted. His quirk manifested and then like a couple weeks later his mom was getting calls with scholarship and housing offers. The only catch was that they wanted them to move immediately so they could monitor Izuku's quirk progression. How'd he discover his quirk? Healing isn't really as obvious as like electricity or acid, Shiro pointed out, gesturing towards Ashido and Kaminari as examples. And he said it was a mutation, right? So, his parents wouldn't have been looking for it? His mom has some weak telekinesis and his dad's not in the picture, but I think he has a fire breath quirk. As far as the discovery went, Katsuki paused, debating whether he was still comfortable with how much he was starting to share. I hurt myself when we were playing outside one day as kids. I scraped my arm and it was bleeding pretty bad. He frowned as he recalled the day in question. Izuku freaked out and grabbed it and then suddenly the bleeding stopped. He remembered he had asked Izuku after how it all worked. Normally to use a quirk you needed intent behind every action. Izuku had told him that all he had been thinking in the moment was that Katsuki was hurt and that he didn't want Katsuki to be hurt. That's so cool, Ashido said, clapping her hands together. I bet he was so happy that he helped you. He was, Katsuki admitted, though he wasn't smiling like his friends were. And then he was dizzy because it drained his energy, and then we saw a tiny scratch on his arm in the same place as my cut. Wait, does he steal the person's injury? Kaminari questioned, confused by the story Katsuki told. Is that how his quirk works? He doesn't steal it, dunce face, Katsuki corrected. The energy drains from the same area, so if it's severe enough then his quirk kind of injures him in return. Harsh, Shiro muttered. Not a fun drawback. The injuries he gets from using his quirk heal much faster than a normal injury, but he still has to deal with the pain and some scarring, Katsuki further explained. They discovered that Izuku could somehow still heal his own injuries despite the fact that the reflected damage occurred in the same spot as the injury. However, doing so was a long and incredibly painful process for him. It was like trying to walk by taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It created a cycle of damage that slowly crawled towards being fully healed. So, it can hurt him to heal people but he still does it. Kirishima asked with awe in his voice. That's so manly. Pisses me off, Katsuki said as he watched Izuku interact with his classmates from afar. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been better if he was just quirkless. That idiot doesn't have the best sense of self-preservation. Aw, you care about him, Kaminari teased. You're really just a softie, aren't you, Bakugo? Don't push it, Ashido warned, poking Kaminari with her chopstick. I don't think Midoriya can bring back the dead. We were supposed to be a hero duo, Katsuki murmured almost absent-mindedly as he watched Izuku laugh again at some unheard comment. That was always the plan when we were kids. The 2 best heroes fighting side by side in the field. That had been part of the reason for Katsuki's tantrum when Izuku left. First, his friend had manifested a quirk that wasn't combat-oriented, and then he had left Katsuki behind with a bunch of extras who weren't nearly as important to him as Izuku. They'd just follow him around because his quirk was impressive and say yes to whatever he said. They were boring. For a short while, he almost didn't care anymore. His hero partner was gone and everyone else at school pissed him off. It wasn't until Izuku had settled in an island and they were able to do a video call that he finally got his spark back. Izuku had told him that he would be attending an island academy when he was older, so it was Katsuki's job to get into UA. For the both of them, Izuku had made him swear that he'd be an amazing pro hero, and that promise had been key to Katsuki's determination to be the best and to surpass everyone. Katsuki would become the hero they both had dreamed of because Izuku's quirk was needed elsewhere. But Midoriya is still planning to be a pro hero, Zero reminded him, dragging Katsuki out of his reverie. Sure, his quirk isn't made for combat, but neither was Mr. Aizawa's, and he made it work. Images flashed through Katsuki's mind, memories of watching his teacher fight during the USJ attack. He thought of the skin and muscle being stripped from Aizawa's elbow as Shigaraki's quirk slowly decayed the flesh. He thought of the Namu crushing his skull into the concrete, easily forcing him down without the opposition of a strength-based quirk to push against it. He thought of the blood seeping down Aizawa's face as he desperately fought to keep his head up and eyes open to protect his students. You two will be in the field together one day, just like you planned, Kirishima assured with a sharp grin, not realizing what meaning his words held for Katsuki. Saving the world with explosions and healing. A new set of memories filtered through Katsuki's head, this time of a 13-year-old Izuku's exhausted face looking at him through a video call. He had been wrapped in bandages and bound to his bed with the reflected injuries sustained from attempting to heal something far too damaged to fix. Izuku had been apologetic that he was making Katsuki worry, but held no regret for making such a rash and destructive decision in the first place. He had had the potential to fix the symbol of peace. How could he pass that up? I had to try, he had said. It would have been worth it. He had claimed when Katsuki shouted at him with tears in his eyes that he could have died. That was his reality. To use his quirk, he needed to sacrifice himself, bit by bit and scar by scar. And there was no force on earth that could keep Izuku from making that sacrifice if he truly wanted to. He would keep giving until there was nothing left to give. Right, Katsuki murmured, mostly to himself as his friends had already shifted their attention to another topic of conversation: explosions and healing. Hitoshi walked into the infirmary cradling his wrist and covered in sweat and dirt. He was still in his hero costume, the black padded prototype with subtle purple accents that Hatsune had designed for him. The extra layers of protection were built in to give him an edge against more combat-oriented quirk users. The body armor held out fairly well against the wall he slammed into during training, but it could only do so much. Hitoshi Shinzu. Hitoshi was pulled from his thoughts by a bright, happy voice calling for his attention. How can I help you? It was Recovery Girl's green-haired intern, sitting in the swivel chair at the desk in the room. A quick glance around showed an absence of the older heroine, which Hitoshi figured was for the best. It felt like every other training session he found himself being sent to the infirmary. He had been starting to wonder when Recovery Girl would get sick of seeing him. You know my name? Hitoshi questioned. Class 2 had been introduced as a whole, not name by name, so he wondered where this boy had learned his. Well, I saw you at the sports festival, Midoriya explained and gestured over his shoulder at the computer behind him. The screen only showed the desktop, but he had likely minimized whatever he had been reading when Hitoshi walked in. I'm also reading every student file, and I already went through yours. You're reading every student file, Hitoshi repeated, skepticism clear in his voice as he considered the amount of effort and mental space such a task would require. Every single one, Midoriya confirmed with a nod. His eyes narrowed, a challenging spark in his gaze that made it seem like he was ready for a fight. Don't question me. Hitoshi held up his uninjured hand in mock surrender as he chuckled. Despite the healer's impossibly joyful attitude, it became clear in certain moments that he had a much more assertive side to him. It made sense considering Midoriya apparently grew up with someone like Bakugo in his life, and the two seemed to be very close. To be quite honest, Hitoshi would have guessed they were more than just close after witnessing their initial reunion a couple weeks back. Wait, Hitoshi said as his muddled brain finally processed what he had heard. You know about my quirk then? Of course I do, Midoriya confirmed as he held up a hand and began listing things off with his fingers. I also know your birthday and your allergies, and you knew about my quirk and you still responded to me, Hitoshi clarified. Midoriya paused and dropped his hand, leveling an analytical gaze at Hitoshi as he stood from the desk. His grin had fallen, replaced with a neutral expression that gave away nothing yet at the same time made Hitoshi feel distinctly uneasy. Should I be worried about you trying to brainwash me? He asked, voice reserved and measured. No, I would never. Great, then sit down, Midoriya ordered, gesturing towards one of the empty beds. His smile had returned in a flash as if the cold response from a moment ago had never happened. You came here to be healed, right? Hitoshi stood for a moment more before moving to sit on the bed. He decided it would be better to do as the healer said than to question anything. To be fair, he was the one who brought up using his quirk in a manipulative way first. He was just so used to other people assuming that from the start when they spoke with him. Mr. Aizawa is worried I may have a concussion, Hitoshi told him. Also, my arm got tangled in my binding cloth and my wrist was twisted. Why does he think you have a concussion? Midoriya asked as he pulled a pen light from his pocket and began to shine it in Hitoshi's eyes. I slammed into a wall, Hitoshi muttered quietly. You slammed into? Midoriya prompted, straining to pick up Hitoshi's soft voice. A wall, he repeated, voice louder than before. I was swinging around with the binding cloth and slammed into a wall. He braced for a laugh but only heard Midoriya give an understanding hum. So, you watched the sports festival? You were taken out super easily without any combat training under your belt, Midoriya replied, pocketing the pen light. Sure, the first tournament match worked out, but with so much attention on you by the time the second match rolled around, people were starting to figure out how your quirk worked. Todoroki just needed to freeze you before you had the chance to even speak. He shrugged and carefully picked up Hitoshi's injured wrist, pressing gently at it with his fingers. Your only real advantage was people not knowing about your quirk. Your bedside manner is terrible, Hitoshi griped, unprepared for the essay of analysis Midoriya had responded to him with. He drew in a sharp breath when Midoriya turned his wrist in a particular way and heard the healer murmur a soft apology under his breath. I came in here to be healed and you're just tearing apart my abilities. Lack of abilities, Midoriya corrected as he gently released the wrist and flicked at Hitoshi's forehead with his finger. And you didn't let me finish. Hitoshi opened his mouth to complain about Midoriya flicking him only to close it when he realized his mind felt slightly clearer. His nausea faded and the extra bit of drowsiness that had been clinging to him slipped away. He realized in that small moment of contact Midoriya had already partially healed his head injury. Oh good, more insults, Hitoshi said instead, continuing to fall back on the instinct to respond with something sardonic. Keep them coming. I could tell you were clever. You wouldn't have made it as far as you did with your quirk if you weren't, Midoriya continued, placing his hands more securely on Hitoshi's head. You managed to get through the obstacle race and the cavalry battle all while keeping the mechanics of it mostly hidden. It's not a flashy combat quirk, but in my opinion, there can be a much greater benefit in simply knowing more than your opponent does. Didn't matter much when it came to the entrance exam, Hitoshi told him, silently amazed by how much better his head felt after Midoriya let go. He had been skeptical that he actually had a head injury, but the difference was like night and day. Can't really outsmart a giant robot. I've always thought the entrance exam wasn't well balanced, Midoriya shared as he picked up Hitoshi's wrist again. I thought you had a lot of potential when I saw you in the sports festival. It's good to see that was recognized and you were transferred to the hero course. You even kicked someone out of their spot. I didn't kick them out. Hitoshi let out a small sigh of relief as the pain quickly left his wrist. They were fed up with the targeted villain attacks and transferred to Shiitsu. Still, you worked hard to get where you are, Midoriya acknowledged, finally taking a step back. The healer began twirling his own wrist as if trying to work out a sudden stiffness. It's people like you who truly deserve to be heroes. Hitoshi watched with his own critical gaze as Midoriya wandered back over to the desk to retrieve a bag of chips from one of the drawers. He hesitated for a moment by the door before reaching out to flick the lights off, killing the harsh fluorescent glow in the room which left behind only the sunlight that filtered in through the windows. Are you sure you're friends with Bakugo? Hitoshi questioned. Everything about you is nicer, even down to your quirk. Are you implying Kaken's quirk is bad? Midoriya challenged as he made his way back over to Hitoshi. His feet dragged a bit more as he walked now, and his eyes held the same exhausted fogginess that Hitoshi saw every day when he looked in the mirror. It's destructive. Let me rephrase. Has he ever used his quirk for bad reasons? Midoriya pressed, plopping down on the other unoccupied bed. He began to snack on his chips as he stared up at the ceiling. Quirks don't define people. People define themselves through their actions and intentions. Placing a label on inherently non-aligned aspects of life only serves to divide. Hitoshi's next witty retort died in his throat as he processed Midoriya's words. The healer had a tendency to ramble, that much was clear. However, not a single word that came from his mouth so far had been insignificant. It seemed almost impossible, and yet every word, every phrase, held a purposeful weight to it. It was clear that Midoriya considered each thought in his head and meant every sound that came from his mouth. This was why Hitoshi was so caught off guard to hear that Midoriya didn't believe quirks define the user. Hitoshi had always been surrounded by people fearful of his brainwashing abilities, hesitant to speak in front of him lest he take control. He heard whispers, speculation as to when he would finally cave and become the villain he was destined to be. He had made some friends along the way who trusted that he'd never use his quirk with ill intent, but it was so rare to hear someone speak so plainly against the labeling of quirks. Quirk aside, Hitoshi continued, wanting to hear Midoriya speak more. His personality doesn't exactly lend to the image of a hero. Midoriya glanced away from the ceiling and over towards Hitoshi, his green eyes assessing in the dim light of the room. For a moment, Hitoshi wondered if he had gone too far by picking at Bakugo's character, considering the two were childhood friends, until he saw the corners of Midoriya's mouth twitch up in a playful smile. He's prideful, competitive, and blunt with an ego the size of Mount Everest, Midoriya stated. That's what happens when you grow up getting praised for everything you do and immediately being the best at everything you attempt. He held out his bag of chips towards Hitoshi. UA is the best place for him to be because it's taken him down a few pegs. He actually loses here. You seem happy about that, Hitoshi noted, reaching over to take a chip from the offered bag. I am happy. It's helped him mature, Midoriya told him, his smile growing wider and fonder. The people he's met here have helped him grow. He never really had that in middle school, just yes men who boosted his ego. He glanced back towards the ceiling, expression growing remorseful. It didn't help that I was so far away from him. Hitoshi silently processed the behavior he saw before him and coupled it with what he had seen when Midoriya and Bakugo had first reunited on the PE grounds. There had been plenty of speculation from students and faculty alike following Midoriya's arrival at UA High School. People wondered about his quirk or about what his life growing up on an island must have been like. But within all of those rumors and bits of gossip, hardly anyone was talking about how uncharacteristically soft Bakugo acted around Midoriya or how deeply familiar Midoriya seemed to be with aspects of Bakugo's character. Hitoshi was beginning to think that people were talking about the wrong things. You seem to care a lot about him, Hitoshi murmured as he gazed at the unguarded affection that had settled in Midoriya's features while he spoke about Bakugo. Like, a lot. Midoriya seemed to pick up on the implicative tone of his voice as his eyes widened and darted back over to Hitoshi, who simply stared back with a knowing smirk. The suggestion was a bit of a shot in the dark, but if Hitoshi was right about it then. Oh, look at the time. Midoriya shot up from the bed, flustered and blushing. His voice was a touch louder than it needed to be, and he gestured wildly at the clock in the room as he began to pace. You're missing class. You've already been healed, so you should be fine now, and I can't let Mr. Aizawa think that I'm letting his students avoid schoolwork or anything. We just have free period for the rest of the day. Hitoshi informed him with a smile, prompting Midoriya to freeze and stare at him with wide and fearful eyes. But I'm sure you're busy, so I'll get out of your hair. Hitoshi stood from the bed and walked towards a still frozen Midoriya who could barely make eye contact with him, clapping the green-haired boy on the shoulder as he passed. Thanks for the healing, Midoriya. As much as Katsuki hated to admit it, it felt strange to walk around campus alone. Normally, he had the group of idiots he reluctantly called friends clinging to his every move, but they had all scattered during free period. Training that day had been rough for everyone, so Mr. Aizawa made the decision to give his class the remainder of the school day to do as they pleased so long as it was productive. Hiroshima and Shiro had wanted to spar while Ashido and Kaminari had run off to beg Yaoyorozu for extra help study. Katsuki had used the free period to get ahead and work on upcoming material, which meant he had stayed in the classroom to ask Mr. Aizawa questions. When the school day finally ended, Katsuki found himself walking back towards the dorms alone. Usually he liked the silence and the alone time. It was part of the reason why he liked mountain climbing so much, because it allowed for isolation. But recently he had grown used to the constant inane chatter and social contact that surrounded him, no matter how much he protested or pushed people away. He would almost admit that he missed it. At least, he thought he missed it until he caught a shock of purple in the corner of his eye coming straight towards him. What do you want, baggy eyes? Katsuki questioned as his classmate grew closer. Shinsu had changed out of his hero costume and looked significantly better compared to when he had left training earlier to be healed. Katsuki had nothing against the kid, quite the opposite actually. He could admire the determination it must have taken to switch into the hero department from general studies. There was just something about the way he spoke and acted that just made Katsuki's skin crawl. Shinsu knew exactly what to say to make Katsuki snap and could do it with fewer words than anyone else in the class. Katsuki could admit that it was a helpful skill considering his quirk was dependent on a response, but that didn't make him any less pissed off about it. Just walking back to the dorms. Same as you, Shinsu answered as he fell into step alongside Katsuki. Your boyfriend is interesting. Katsuki stopped walking. What? Shinsu stopped walking a few steps ahead and turned around to look back at Katsuki. One brow raised as confusion painted his features. I said your friend is interesting, Shinsu repeated, and Katsuki let out a small breath when he heard friend and not boyfriend. You know, your friend Midoriya. We had a lovely discussion about quirks when he healed me. Katsuki shook his head before he started walking again, Shinsu matching his steps. It was the end of the day and Katsuki was tired. He must have just heard wrong. His hearing wasn't always the most reliable to begin with. You mean you got him talking about quirks and he didn't keep you there for 5 hours? Oh, I wish we could have talked for that long, Shinsu said, his tone affectionate in a way that made Katsuki's eye twitch. I really enjoy spending time with him. How's your skull? Katsuki muttered, forcing down his feelings of jealousy. It made a pretty nasty sound when you slammed into that wall. I'll live, Shinsu responded with a shrug. Too bad. What was that? I said I'm so glad. Katsuki took another breath, steadily losing his patience with every word that came out of Shinsu's mouth. Did you need something, or did you just want to tell me how much you liked talking with Izuku? I was wondering if you'd be willing to train with me sometime, Shinsu said. I'm a little behind when it comes combat ability, and you seem like you know a thing or two. You want to train with me? Katsuki questioned, suspicious of the request. There are other people in our class with decent combat skills. I'm sure you'd find them to be much friendlier partners. I've realized recently that I don't know much about you. While I stated that I wasn't here to make friends, it's a bit foolish to not know anything about the people I could be working alongside in the future. So, I'd like it if we could train together. Shinsu paused and let out a light chuckle. That is, if you consider me a worthy enough opponent. Any opponent is worthy so long as they don't half-ass it, Katsuki stated. I don't have patience for extras who don't work hard or give it their all. Got it. Katsuki glanced over at his classmate as they neared the Tua dormitory. He expected an arrogant smirk or mocking grin, but Shinsu's expression was calm and serious. Katsuki sighed and quickly weighed the pros and cons in his head. Despite his lack of tact, he considered most decisions very carefully before acting. I go running every morning before class, Katsuki finally said, deciding to start with something small to see how serious his classmate was. He paused on the steps of the dorm and looked back at Shinsu, who had the beginnings of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I leave at 6 o'clock. Don't be late. Wouldn't dream of it. Ochako Uraraka was nothing if not determined. Her fierce resolve often caught people off guard when all they had witnessed before was her warm and bubbly attitude, but it was still an integral side to her personality. If she put her mind to something, she followed through regardless of any obstacles along the way. So, when she met Izuku Midoriya, her mind and subsequent actions were already set in stone. The healer was incredible. Ochako had only known him a short while, and their interactions had been limited to friendly conversations and the occasional wave if they passed each other in the hall. But she had already developed a bit of a crush on the boy. How could she not? Midoriya was a compassionate and strong-willed hero in training. She had been initially fearful that he'd have the same rough edges as Bakugo, but he had acted nothing short of warm and respectful with the UA, students and faculty. And Ochako wasn't the only student who had fallen for the green-haired intern. She had heard whispers of students contemplating confessing to Midoriya. And so she knew she needed to act quickly lest he accept someone else's feelings first. Ochako brushed away her anxiety and insecurities and decided today was the day. She had a plan of action, and passing Midoriya in the hall at the beginning of their lunch period set everything in motion. Midoriya, she called out, stopping the boy in his tracks a few feet away. She broke away from her classmates and made her way over to him. I'm glad I caught you. I was wondering if you'd like to eat lunch together. Midoriya had taken to eating lunch with Ochako, Ada, and Tsu ever since Todoroki had invited him on the second day. He'd also eat with other friend groups in the class and even in other classes so he could get to know everyone, but he could be found most often with Ochako's group. Oh, I'd love to, Midoriya replied, shuffling around a stack of folders in his arms to get a better grip on them. He flashed her an apologetic smile. But I actually wanted to catch up on some patient charts and gear designs, so I was going to eat lunch in the infirmary. I could join you, Ochako offered, undeterred. Eating alone would be better for this anyway, unless I'd be in your way. No, I'm a good multitasker, so that would be fine, Midoriya said. But are you sure you want to eat in the infirmary? Yeah, I don't mind at all, Ochako assured as the two began walking. Midoriya, true to his word, really was an impressive multitasker. He maintained conversation with Ochako, occasionally adding in his own thoughts, which proved he was truly listening, while also eating his lunch and writing in various notebooks and charts at the infirmary's desk. Ochako wasn't as good at multitasking. All she had to do was maintain conversation and eat her lunch on one of the infirmary beds, but she was also silently forming her confession in her head and mentally kicking herself every time she felt like backing out. Her mental pep talks had resulted in their conversation becoming very one-sided, and unfortunately Midoriya, shrewd and analytical as ever, grew suspicious of her unusual silence. Is something on your mind? Midoriya questioned, his expression growing concerned. Ochako's throat tightened, but she took a deep breath and powered through her nervousness. Well, I was wondering if you. It was now or never. She squeezed her eyes shut and let the words tumble out. Would you like to go on a date with me? Date. Ochako opened her eyes to see Midoriya's expression shift from worried to deeply apologetic. Oh, Uraraka, you don't want to, she quickly guessed, waving her hands in the air as if she could wave away the confession itself. That's fine, I'm fine. Just pretend I didn't say anything. She paused, took a breath, and shook her head. I should go. Ochako gathered up her belongings and began to make her way out of the infirmary, praying her face wasn't too red with embarrassment from being rejected. She heard a shuffle behind her and quick steps until Midoriya once again entered her field of view, his body partially blocking her exit from the room. Uraraka, wait. It's fine, really, Ochako assured him, cursing how her voice wavered. She managed a weak smile. I mean, so many other students here like you, so I'm sure you've already gotten plenty of other confessions, and I bet I'm not even one of your best options to choose from minutes. It's not like that, I swear, Midoriya insisted, waving his own hands in the air. He paused, eyes narrowing in confusion. Wait, what do you mean other students like me? Well, yeah, I mean look at you. Midoriya blinked, expression showing he was still wholly unconvinced and very confused. Eventually he shook his head and seemed to file away the comment in favor of addressing the current situation. His hands remained raised as if to remind Ochako that he didn't want her to leave. It's really nothing against you, Midoriya promised. You're very sweet and very pretty, and I'm sure if circumstances were different then I would have loved to go on a date with you. But Midoriya suddenly looked very conflicted, as if he was debating whether or not he actually wanted to explain himself. Finally, he sighed and dropped his arms to his sides. I'm already dating someone, he confessed. Already, Ochako felt a touch better hearing that she was being rejected for a different reason than she had thought. Wow, here I was thinking I had acted quick. Well, no, I've been dating them since they were first accepted at UA. Almost 2 years ago, Midoriya explained, rubbing a hand against his neck as he looked increasingly more uncomfortable. That long, really? Ochako asked. She frowned as she considered his words. But I thought you didn't know any other UA students aside from Bakugo. Ochako watched as Midoriya shrugged but said nothing to refute her statement. Oh. Her eyes widened and Midoriya began to blush. You and Bakugo. Me and Kaken, he confirmed, flashing her a wobbly smile. He asked me out the day he was accepted. We've been long-distance dating since then. So, I just asked Bakugo's boyfriend out on a date. Ochako pieced together, groaning as she realized what she had done. He's absolutely going to kill me. No, he won't, Midoriya told her, chuckling a bit at her worry. It's our fault for not telling anyone. Why didn't you tell anyone? Ochako questioned as she returned to the infirmary bed and dropped her things to let Midoriya know she was no longer going to run. It was Kaken's idea, Midoriya explained, settling back at the desk. I was new and wanted to make friends here, and he thought it would be difficult for people to separate their impression of him from me, apparently. He was already hearing comments from people wondering if I had a violent side since we're childhood friends. Some of us did make comments like that, Ochako admitted with a wince. I'm sorry, that wasn't right. He just wanted people to get to know me as the nerdy transfer intern and not as the boyfriend of the guy with the villain quirk. Midoriya paused and held the bridge of his nose in frustration. His words, not mine. I hate when people label quirks like that. Huh, Ochako murmured. It was strange to learn that Bakugo was dating someone so sincere and kind, and stranger still to hear how protective he had been of Midoriya this whole time. Listen, I hope what just happened doesn't make things weird between us. She gave Midoriya a hopeful smile as the healer stared back at her with a curious expression. I really like spending time with you, even if it's just as friends. No, not at all, he quickly assured, a wide grin finally appearing on his face that Ochako couldn't help but mirror. I love being friends with you too. To the unobservant, it may seem like Aizawa didn't pay attention to his students, but he actually watched their every move. He knew their habits, their typical demeanors. It had started out as strategic reconnaissance to figure out the best ways to challenge their comfortable little norms, but after nearly 2 years it had become more like a parent simply knowing their children. His husband loved to point that out to him any chance he got. The point of the matter was that he knew what was normal, and he knew when something unusual was occurring within his class. Normally, when his students returned from lunch, they'd trickle in and pair off into their groups to chat a bit more before afternoon classes started. He knew that Midoriya had taken to eating lunch with his class, but at the end he would report back to the infirmary and recovery girl. So, it was strange to see him enter the classroom following after Uraraka and make a beeline towards Bakugo. Midoriya fielded a few waves and greetings along the way from other students, but it was clear his target was Bakugo, who was seated and surrounded by his typical group of friends. The boy in question watched him approach with confusion, just as aware as Aizawa was that this was not normal behavior. Aizawa watched Midoriya lean down and whisper something into Bakugo's ear, the blonde's eyes widening ever so slightly in response. You told her, he heard Bakugo ask. The boy's red eyes sought out Uraraka, who was standing to the side with her typical group but was still clearly paying attention to Midoriya and Bakugo's interaction. Aizawa watched her jump slightly from his gaze before giving a nervous little wave. I'd like to tell everyone, if that's okay, Midoriya responded, a hesitant smile on his face. At this point, most of the other students were either subtly or obviously eavesdropping on the situation playing out. Aizawa watched as a mischievous grin slowly spread across Bakugo's face, and in the next moment he was pulling Midoriya down by the collar of his lab coat into a deep kiss. For a moment there was silence, but it didn't last long before everyone began to shout and react to the couple kissing in front of them. Bakugo finally released Midoriya, a satisfied smirk on his face as he observed the deep red blush blooming in his boyfriend's cheek. Kaken, what? Bakugo innocently asked as he gestured towards the rest of the class. Everyone knows now, don't they? Oh, Kirishima perked up, a sharp grin on his face as he nudged Bakugo with his elbow. And how long has this been going on? Hopefully longer than a few seconds, Jiru said, her tone wavering between excited and concerned. I know you're brash, Bakugo, but I'd like to think you wouldn't just kiss someone out of the blue like that. They've been dating for nearly 2 years, Todoroki informed them, appearing wholly disinterested with the reveal as he didn't even bother to glance up from his phone. And why the hell do you know that? Kaminari questioned, quickly making his way over to see what other information Todoroki had that they didn't. Aizawa watched the entire situation play out with a neutral expression despite how amusing he felt the whole thing was. The moment Bakugo had told him that he would be holding off on telling everyone that he was dating Midoriya, he had started to wonder how long that secret would last. Aizawa caught Midoriya's eye amidst the chaos, and the healer quickly sent an apologetic look his way. Sorry, I'm sure you need to start class, Midoriya guessed, trying his best to edge away from the nosy Tua students trying to ask him questions about his relationship with Bakugo. Actually, we're going to be running strategy drills this afternoon, Aizawa said, using the announcement as a way to also bring the class to order for the afternoon. Normally I have Recovery Girl on standby for injuries, but perhaps you'd like to fill in for her. I would love to, Midoriya agreed, face lighting up at the offer. Everyone, get changed into your hero costumes and report to ground beta immediately, Aizawa directed, already out the door with only a wave over his shoulder to indicate Midoriya should follow. Midoriya and I will meet you all in the monitoring room. The journey to Ground Beta's monitoring room wasn't long, and Midoriya was far from an unpleasant companion given his natural ease with carrying conversations. But Aizawa shouldered a feeling of apprehension all the way there. They had nearly reached the site when he finally addressed his disquiet, of which Midoriya, albeit unknowingly, was very much a cause. Principal Nezu told me you've requested to meet her, Aizawa said, interrupting Midoriya's stream of murmurings as the student wrote something in the journal he always kept in his lab coat pocket. I have, Midoriya confirmed, not looking up from the notebook. Aizawa took a breath. She's been through a lot, he continued. I'm familiar with her case. Sir Night shared some details, the healer told him, glancing up now from his notes with a questioning look in his eye. She's skittish around new people. Midoriya stopped walking. Aizawa stopped a few steps ahead of him when he realized the student was no longer following. He looked back to see Midoriya staring at him with a critical gaze as he pocketed the notebook. They were just outside the monitoring room now, but neither of them moved to open the door and enter. Is this your way of convincing me not to meet her? Midoriya questioned, his tone guarded. It's my way of warning you, Aizawa corrected, refusing to beat around the bush with someone who clearly wasn't as naive as the average teenager. I understand you're a quirk analyst, but I won't allow you to treat her like a test subject. He opened the door and entered the monitoring room, not bothering to look back and see if Midoriya was following. She's only a child, and the nature of her quirk is already a sensitive topic for her. She thinks it's a curse. I sometimes think that way about my quirk too. Aizawa stopped and turned around to see Midoriya enter the room and close the door behind him. The boy's expression showed he was serious, but his words made Aizawa want to laugh. He turned towards the monitoring equipment and powered on the system, drawing up camera views of the grounds and a list of his students' names organized into teams. Your quirk heals. How could that be a curse? Midoriya came up beside him and took off his lab coat, laying it over the back of a chair before taking a seat. Aizawa glanced his way, wondering if he'd get a response to his earlier question, and did a double take when he saw the now exposed skin of Midoriya's arms. Scars. There are so many of them. Small ones and big ones, decorating the surface from his hands all the way up to where his shirt sleeve covered his shoulders, though he was certain they continued past that under the fabric of his clothes. Some looked rough and uncontrolled, while others seemed to be clean and precise, like they were made with a scalpel. Some seemed almost purposefully placed, evenly spaced apart in a specific area and all measuring the same length like tally marks. Aizawa recalled Recovery Girl's explanation of Midoriya's quirk and pieced it together with what he saw before him, a feeling of dread slowly and silently building within him. The more severe the injury, the more severe the repercussions, Midoriya said, stretching out his arms in front of him in a way that clearly meant he wanted them to be seen. The only real limit to my ability is myself. If I can't heal someone, then it's my fault. You shouldn't. I shouldn't think that way. Midoriya cut him off as his mouth quirked up into a bitter smile. I know, I shouldn't. Katsuki hates it when I do. He pulled his arms back towards him and once again retrieved the notebook from his lab coat. I went to I Island when I was 5 years old. They put me through rigorous training and experiments to better understand my quirk and help me utilize it to its full potential. Eri can only use her quirk on living beings. I can only use my quirk on injured living beings. He glanced up at Aizawa, who stared back down at him, dawning realization in his eyes. What kind of experiments do you imagine they came up with in order for me to practice? Aizawa opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could he possibly say in response to something like that? He was well aware that for as much good as Island did with their research, they were not exempt from the same morally questionable tendencies that plagued every other institution in the world. He had just never considered something like this. Don't get me wrong, Midoriya continued when Aizawa remained silent. I'm grateful for the opportunities I was given, but they didn't exactly leave me with the best memories. They shouldn't have done that, Aizawa finally said, voice soft. Midoriya gave him more of a genuine smile, though it was still tinged with pain. I may be analytical, but I know what it feels like to be treated like a test subject, Midoriya told him, turning back to his notebook. I hope you believe me when I say I won't treat Eri the same way. Silence filled the room for a moment before Aizawa let out a sigh and collapsed into one of the other chairs beside Midoriya. He continued pulling up camera views on the monitors and vaguely registered the distant shouts of his students as they drew closer to the room. Thank you for the honesty, Aizawa murmured, pleased when he saw Midoriya smile out of the corner of his eye. This exercise is a bit like capture the flag, except everyone will be going after the same target placed somewhere in this building in the middle of the map. First to find the target and return it to their established base wins. You'll be going in teams of 2. Aizawa directed the class's attention once they had assembled to the list of names divided into teams on one of the monitoring screen. First fight will be teams NB, Bakugo and Shinsu versus Kaminari and Kirishima. Hey, maybe Bakugo will be distracted with his boyfriend here, Kaminari teased as the 4 boys prepared to leave and take their positions on the field. You kidding me? You're all screwed. The class watched as a sadistic grin split Bakugo's face, a familiar fire igniting in his red eyes as Midoriya began to smile. I do some of my best fighting when I'm trying to impress Izuku. The exercise was eventful. Aizawa noted plenty of areas where his students were making errors. New mistakes were fine. They were part of the process, and a new mistake could be readily addressed. Old mistakes only meant that the student hadn't learned much since the last time they had made it. However, there was net improvement, and they seemed to be adapting at a rate that even Aizawa had to commend for such young individuals. He was pleasantly surprised to see Shinsu and Bakugo working together as a team more seamlessly than he had ever seen them before. He usually tried to pair Bakugo with students he wasn't too cooperative with, Shinsu being one of the worst, but something had changed. Rather than yelling and splitting off to do their own things, they appeared to actually be devising strategies and executing them together. Aizawa wondered where this shift had come from, but had a strange feeling that it had something to do with the arrival of the green-haired healer who scribbled furiously in his notebook beside him. When the exercise ended, Bakugo and Shinsu emerging as the victors, Midoriya moved to heal any grievous injuries that had been sustained during the battle. Kirishima and Kaminari wore the expected scrapes and burns that were occupational hazards of being too close to Bakugo's explosion. Shinsu had a few scrapes as well, some sustained from accidental misuse of his capture weapon and others from Kirishima's hardened blows. Bakugo sustained very little damage, though he still adamantly waved away any attempts Midoriya made to heal his injuries. Normally this is the part where I point out the glaring mistakes you all are still making despite being second years, Aizawa said as his students were healed. However, I'm curious what Midoriya has to say about your performances. He turns to look at the boy who seemed not quite as steady on his feet after so much healing. At some point he had acquired another bag of sweets, likely from one of the pockets of his lab coat. Bakugo seemed tense where he stood with his eyes glued on the healer, like he was at the ready to swoop in and grab Midoriya should the green-haired boy actually collapse. As Aizawa thought about it, it made much more sense why Bakugo had refused to be healed. He wondered if Bakugo ever consented to being healed by Midoriya if doing so meant exhaustion and scars for the other. Really? Midoriya questioned, glancing up from his bag of chocolates, one of the candies already in his mouth. His recovery period seemed quick, especially when supplemented with food, and he already looked nearly as energetic as before. Nezu said, you're a skilled strategist and quirk analyst, and I saw you taking notes during the battle, Aizawa told him. I'd like a fresh opinion. Oh, thank God, Kaminari muttered with relief. Midoriya should be much less harsh compared to Mr. Aizawa. And that's where you're wrong, Bakugo murmured, a tired smile settling on his face as he watched his boyfriend excitedly retrieve his notebook and flip through its pages. Kirishima gave him a questioning look, wondering how Midoriya's analysis could possibly be any worse than the unforgiving reviews of their teacher. What do you mean? Kirishima, why yes. Yes, sir. Kirishima spun back to face Midoriya at the healer's forceful call. He went rigid with his back straight and arms to his side, the pose of a soldier who had been addressed by a commanding officer. Your quirk is impressive and your determination is remarkable, Midoriya told him, eyes scanning the pages of his notes. Kirishima gave a confused smile, relaxing slightly from his perfect posture. He glanced at Bakugo and chuckled slightly, as if deciding his classmate's cryptic warning about Midoriya had been only a joke. Thank you. I try. I fear your capacity to consider alternate plans of attack is borderline non-existent. Kirishima blinked, staring back wordlessly at the stern expression Midoriya was now giving him. His green eyes seemed colder than before, more critical. Aizawa recognized the face well and had seen plenty of it during his own time as a student. He had perfected the look himself over the years. It was the sharp gaze of a teacher who couldn't afford to let soft emotions weaken the advice they had for a student, and so they delivered their words with cold neutrality. Aizawa was impressed Midoriya had managed to manifest such an expression so young. Told you, Bakugo muttered, the corners of his mouth pulling into a smug grin that made it clear that the blunt scrutiny coming from his boyfriend was far from a surprise for him. Your mantra seems to be brute force, and I won't deny that your particular brand of force is quite effective based on what I heard of your involvement in the Shai Hasekai raid, Midoriya continued on. However, if all your opponent needs to do is wear you down until your energy, and subsequently your quirk, give out, then you really need to get into the habit of strategizing attacks that don't waste that energy. Oh. Shinsu, Midoriya called, shifting slightly to face the student in question. Oh good, me next, Shinsu drawled with a languid smile. I've told you before that your quirk holds a lot of potential and I can tell you've been working on utilizing it beautifully, Midoriya told him, flipping once again through the pages of his notebook. Though as I'm sure you're already well aware, your combat skills still need work and that binding cloth of yours may prove to be a hindrance rather than an advantage. I understand it takes a while to master using a capture weapon like that, and it should be said that you've displayed a remarkable degree of control for how long you've been learning. Aizawa suppressed a smile at hearing praise given to his mentee's hard work. It had taken him years to master the same weapon, and he knew Shinsu was often frustrated with what he perceived to be slow progress. I'm hearing too many compliments, Shinsu pointed out, a teasing grin on his face. I sense an insult coming up. It's not an insult, Midoriya corrected, a matching grin beginning to creep onto his own face. I was going to say that if you're going to keep hurting yourself with it, then I suggest you also learn how to fight reliably without it, or at least begin to incorporate other support gear that you can rely on more confidently. He paused for a moment, huffing out a laugh before continuing. Also, I'll probably stop healing you if you keep coming to me with injuries caused by your own support item. Got it, Doc, Shinsu promised with a lazy mock two-finger salute. Kaminari, please be gentle, Kaminari begged, bracing as if he were about to be hit. Midoriya's demeanor seemed to soften even further. I've heard that you're prone to short-circuiting, so congratulations on not doing that here, Midoriya told him with a small but encouraging smile. Don't hesitate so much. I could tell you had a strategy, and you let it get diverted just because you didn't want to tell your partner what to do. You did, Kirishima questioned, turning to his partner with a look of shock. It wasn't that great, Kaminari argued, rubbing a hand against his neck as he felt the attention of the class shift to him. Based on what I saw you trying to do in the beginning, it was good, Midoriya maintained, pointing at some of his notes where he likely had observed evidence of the strategy. You two could have tied or maybe even won the match if you had been more assertive. It takes an intelligent mind to work around the drawbacks that your quirk has. Don't discredit that ingenuity. Kaminari blinked, a soft blush beginning to overtake his cheeks. Thank you, I think. And finally, Midoriya grinned, a challenging glint in his eye as he shut his notebook and used it to lightly tap Bakugo's nose. You already know what you did wrong, Kaken. Nothing, Bakugo answered with a confident smirk. Wrong answer, Midoriya countered, his grin unwavering. Bakugo's own smirk fell as he clicked his tongue and glanced to the side. I know, he conceded. Aizawa knew that while Bakugo still made mistakes and struggled with certain aspects of training like cooperation, he was very confident when it came to understanding his own quirk. That, combined with being in a relationship with a quirk analyst who wasn't afraid to speak his mind, likely meant that he had already pinpointed what he could have done better or differently. Despite his bravado and pride, he was still able to recognize where improvements could be made due to his perfectionist tendencies. Everyone get ready to observe the next set of teams, Aizawa ordered. Teams C and D take your positions. His students wandered away, either to enter the grounds or to observe the monitoring screens. He could hear many of them whispering, either with excitement or dread, about Midoriya's battle analysis and what they hoped he'd say about their own performances when the time came. Out of the corner of his eye he noticed Midoriya and Bakugo were still standing together apart from the class, and Midoriya seemed to be fussing over something. He watched as the healer lifted a hand and snapped his fingers near one of Bakugo's ears, resulting in the blonde reaching up to snatch Midoriya's wrist, a scowl on his face. Your ears are ringing again, he heard Midoriya say, less as a question and more as an assessment. Aren't they? Stop that. I'm fine, Bakugo muttered in response as he glanced away to avoid the other boy's worried gaze. You can't lie to me. Midoriya gently tugged his hand away and used it to grip Bakugo's chin and guide his face back towards him. Nor should you. At this point, Kirishima, Kaminari, and Shinsu, who had all still been nearby, began to hang back rather than join the rest of the class. Kirishima's brow furrowed as he watched the exchange and saw the discomfort on Bakugo's face. Is something wrong? Kirishima asked, taking a step back towards them with a hand outstretched to lend an ear. Is Bakugo injured? I barely saw you take a hit, dude, Kaminari noted, also wondering what the issue was. I'm fine, now fuck off, Bakugo snarled, tearing himself away from Midoriya's hold and stomping a few feet away from everyone. Kirishima looked to Midoriya, his gaze questioning and worried, but the healer only sighed and shook his head. Kirishima seemed to get the message and moved to join the rest of the class, pulling a curious Kaminari along with him. Shinsu lingered, like he wanted to press his luck, but a look of warning from Midoriya eventually sent him away with the others. Aizawa watched the students go grouped together across the room and glanced at the monitors to see Teams C and D still preparing for the match. He made his way over to Midoriya, who was now hovering around Bakugo, the two of them conversing with hushed yet frustrated words. What's going on? Aizawa questioned, voice kept low to avoid drawing the attention of the rest of the class. It's just a stupid ringing in my ears, Bakugo argued, looking even more irritated to see that his teacher had now gotten involved. Tends to happen when my explosions get too loud. Tinnitus, Aizawa surmised, when Midoriya and Bakugo both sent him matching curious looks, silently questioning how he was familiar with the condition. He sighed and began to explain. Present Mike suffers from it. He wears protective gear, but sometimes even that's not enough to handle his quirk. Aizawa quickly glanced over Bakugo's hero costume, suddenly recognizing a glaring issue with it. Why don't you have any protection like a noise filter? If you let it go unchecked, you can sustain serious, permanent damage. Oh look, it's the same thing I've been telling you for years, Midoriya muttered, his smug words undercut by the lingering worry in his expression. Great, now there's two of you, Bakugo sarcastically bit back, leaning back on his heels as if any bit of distance he could move away from his teacher and his boyfriend would improve the situation. I'll stop nagging you about it when you start wearing the support gear that I've designed for you. Midoriya hooked his fingers into the material of Bakugo's hero costume and pulled his boyfriend back towards him. I don't want some stupid pieces of junk in my ears fucking with my perception, Bakugo shouted, causing a few of his more curious classmates to glance over until a warning glare from Aizawa made them look away again. Bakugo, watch your language. They won't fuck with it, they'll improve it, Midoriya snapped, abandoning any pretense of a clean argument. I even made the designs match your hero costume. The two of them were inches away from one another, well into each other's personal space to a degree that they could have easily whispered their arguments and the other would have heard them. When the discussion began to escalate, Aizawa was on guard but not too worried. Seeing any other student yelling in Bakugo's face was a valid cause for concern, but this was Midoriya. Aizawa wanted to believe that Bakugo wouldn't start throwing punches at his boyfriend over a simple spat and that the fiery-tempered boy would calm down much easier than he normally did. His assumptions were confirmed when he saw Bakugo fuming one moment and beginning to smile the next. His toothy snarl slowly morphed into a teasing grin as he reached up and gently covered the hand that Midoriya had twisted into the material of his tank. Midoriya became no less agitated, his irritation seeming to only grow as he watched his boyfriend's demeanor suddenly change. You're such a nerd, Bakugo murmured, voice fond and smile impish. Midoriya blushed a deep scarlet and pushed away a now laughing Bakugo. What was that? Midoriya asked, a taunting grin now on his face as well as he raised his hands to cover both of his ears. Sorry, I can't hear you. I guess you're going to need to find another way to insult me. At first, Midoriya's words left Aizawa confused as he glanced between the two students. However, the challenge soon made more sense as he watched Bakugo raise his hands to quickly sign the same insult he had just spoken along with a few other colorful comments tacked onto it. Rather than look offended, Midoriya simply looked pleased, responding to Bakugo's sign language with a soft smile. Bakugo pinched the other boy's cheek before walking away to join the rest of his classmates, who greeted him with compliments for winning the match and nosy questions over what he had been yelling about. He's learning how to sign as well, Aizawa noted as he watched his student walk off. Midoriya sat back down and adjusted some of the cameras so they focused back on the two new teams on the field waiting to start. Like you said, he's at risk for permanent damage, Midoriya replied. He's already made me promise that I won't try to heal it. Support gear will help, but you should always have a plan for when things don't work out. A plan for when things don't work out, Aizawa understood that lesson well, and for that reason he and his husband were also well versed in sign language to prepare for a day when it was truly needed. It was a tough reality to swallow, the idea that one day one of your major senses could be utterly lost. He had faced such a fear a few times himself over the years. Occasionally a villain would come along who was clever enough to realize that if his quirk was dependent on his eyes, then a simple fix would be to well, take away the eyes. Aizawa once again took a seat beside Midoriya and checked the cameras to make sure his students were in position. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Midoriya had his notebook back out, pen pressed to a fresh page as his sharp, green eyes focused on the monitoring screen. Aizawa pressed the button for the microphone. Team C and D at the ready, Aizawa commanded. Begin. It wasn't often that Shadow caught Midoriya during a time when he was free. Most of the time the two were at school and had their separate coursework and training to complete. Sometimes even when they weren't in school, Midoriya was off doing extra tasks with Recovery Girl as part of his internship. Understandably, most of the free hours Midoriya did have were spent with Bakugo, but Shadow had finally managed to drag him away from Gear Blueprints for long enough to grab lunch and catch up. The weather was pleasant and the streets of Musutafu were busy, filled with families and groups of friends out enjoying the day. Shadow was about to start suggesting potential lunch spots when suddenly he noticed the crowds of people were beginning to move all in one direction, running towards a particular part of the area. He heard excited shouts and the pleas of parents telling their children to stay close, but he couldn't really pick out the reason for the commotion. Shadow caught the arm of one of the civilians running past him and forced him to stop. Where is everyone running to? A villain with a tentacle quirk just robbed one of the shops a couple streets away. We want to see the heroes take her down, the man answered before quickly running off back into the crowds. A moment later Shadow heard the unmistakable sound of a distant explosion. He and Midoriya shared a quick glance before they both took off running towards the sound, weaving through the throngs of civilians to get a closer look. Sure enough, as they rounded the corner the scene of a villain fight unfolded before them. As the man had reported, a villain with numerous long tentacles protruding from her hands was swinging between lampposts and building ledges in a desperate bid to flee from the heroes on scene. The pro hero, which seemed to be in command of the scene, had a shockwave-based quirk which sent out concentrated pulses of energy every time he clapped his hands. There were other heroes on scene, mostly redirecting the crowds and assisting the hero with the shockwave quirk, so Shadow guessed they were only sidekicks or interns. If Shadow didn't know any better, he'd think the hero with the shockwave quirk was filming a commercial rather than fighting a villain. Every clap of his hands was done in a staged manner rather than a strategic one, like he was more concerned with appearing cool in front of the children on scene who cheered him on. Every other blast he was winking and flashing a toothy grin at pretty women in the crowd or shouting overdone cliches about strength and duty. This fight could have easily been finished in no time at all if the hero hadn't been treating it like a publicity stunt. Are you going to get involved with this? Midoriya questioned, his keen eyes rapidly darting back and forth between every aspect of the scene to assess the situation. If I see an opening where I'd be helpful, Shadow told him. This hero seems obnoxious, but it looks like he's got the situation handled. They watched as the villain swung back and forth through the city streets, tactically utilizing the higher structures around her to remain out of reach. The hero sent wave after wave of energy after her, each one more off the mark than the last, as he worried more about impressing the arriving camera crews than the fight. Look out! Shadow whipped his head in the direction of a sudden shout just in time to see the side of large multilevel building crumbling to the ground after being hit by one of the hero's inaccurate shots. He moved quickly, identifying a path with no civilians to send a wave of ice up through it. The wave froze the bulk of the rubble and caught most of the stray debris before it plummeted towards the people down below. Civilians cheered as they quickly cleared away from the danger, some thanking Shadow as they passed if they recognized him as the quirk user. Shadow looked around and noted that the villain fight had finally finished a few blocks away. He could see police lights in the distance while the sounds of exaggerated laughter rang out from the hero, who was no doubt being interviewed for his work. Is everyone okay? Shadow turned back to see Midoriya helping to direct civilians to safety, his worried gaze scanning the crowd for anyone who may have been hurt in the chaos. Help! Shadow and Midoriya turned towards the new shout and ran towards it, coming across a man sitting in the street cradling a young girl in his arms. A woman knelt beside them, sobbing inconsolably and on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Somebody, help us please, the man begged. Our daughter is hurt. The girl was limp in his arms and stray pieces of rubble surrounded them, dust coating their clothes and mixing with the sweat on their brow. The mother looked up and saw Shadow and Midoriya approach, her eyes widening with frantic hope at spotting people willing to lend their aid. Please help, she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. She isn't waking up. Midoriya moved forward without hesitation, kneeling on the other side of the young girl. Shadow heard him instruct the father to avoid moving her neck as much as possible as he held fingers to her throat with one hand and gently opened the girl's eyelids with the other. Shadow recalled Midoriya explaining once that the more he knew about the specific details of an injury, the easier it would be to heal it. As a result, he had picked up as much medical and trauma assessment training as he could over the years. Her pulse is slow and her pupils aren't dilating equally, Midoriya murmured, looking up at the father. Did you see her hit her head? I think a stray piece of falling rubble hit her, the father answered. Everything happened so fast. We thought we were out of the way from the fight, but it went everywhere. I don't see much blood, Shadow noted, wondering how serious the blow had to have been for the girl to be knocked out. Not externally. Midoriya trailed off and gently settled his hands on the girl's head. A few moments passed, the chaotic sounds of the scene around them fading away as all focus was placed on the small family before them. Everyone seemed to let out a collective sigh when the girl slowly blinked her eyes open, a small groan escaping her mouth as Midoriya released her head and slumped back on his heels. Mom, the girl croaked out, watery eyes searching the faces before her. Dad, sweetheart. The mother quickly moved forward and replaced Midoriya's spot so she and the father cradled the girl together. Oh, it's okay, baby. Mommy's right here. You should still have her checked out by a doctor, Midoriya told them, groaning a bit himself as he struggled to his feet while Shadow supported his movement. And keep an eye out for any headaches or sensory issues. Thank you, the father said, genuine gratitude in his eyes as the mother now cried tears of joy and hugged her daughter. Thank you so much. The family carefully stood and began to follow the evacuation pathways being set up by recovery crews. Midoriya managed a smile and a wave, but as soon as they were out of sight he collapsed, knees buckling as Shadow became the only thing keeping him from falling back to the ground. Are you all right? Shadow asked, maneuvering his friend's weight so they leaned more comfortably against one another. Traumatic brain injuries are always a doozy to heal, Midoriya muttered in response as he squeezed his eyes shut and focused on trying to stand on his own 2 feet. Shadow spotted him, hands held out and ready to grab him if the healer suddenly collapsed again. With his attention so focused on Midoriya, he hardly noticed the civilians and recovery crews milling about around them and certainly didn't notice the gaudy shockwave hero from before approaching them. Good work, Todoroki, the hero commended as he gestured towards the ice wall, his booming voice only serving to make Midoriya groan from the sudden noise assaulting his senses. The hero looked at Midoriya, his expression significantly less thankful and less impressed. You too, kid. But unless you've got a provisional license, you really shouldn't be getting involved like that. Leave this sort of stuff to the heroes. I was healing her, Midoriya argued, sending the hero a look of disbelief. I don't really need the direction of a hero to do that. Yeah, that's a helpful quirk you've got there, the hero complimented, clearly not recognizing that Midoriya wasn't exactly in the mood for conversation. You should consider joining my hero agency. We could use a personal nurse at headquarters. Something about the patronizing tone of his voice told Shadow that the hero considered nurses to be more like helpful assistants than trained professionals. A quick glance at Midoriya showed he likely picked up on the same implication, his eye already twitching in anger. Like hell I'd ever join your agency. Hey now, watch your tone. One of the sidekicks came up beside the hero, defending his superior with blind dedication. You're speaking to a pro hero. Show some respect. I don't give a damn what you are, Midoriya snapped, pointing an accusatory finger at the hero. Technically it's your fault that little girl was hurt. I was watching the fight. You could have avoided hitting the building if your technique wasn't so sloppy. You little... Okay, we're going now. Shadow quickly looped his arm around Midoriya and began to lead him away, warning signals firing in his head as he saw the fuming expression forming on the hero's face. Midoriya dragged his feet and kept his glare trained on the man as they walked away. Good choice, the hero called out, chuckling like he had just won another fight. You should stick with your friend, kid. Maybe you could learn a thing or two about respecting pros from the son of Endeavor. Shadow felt his own eye twitch but refused to turn around and entertain the asshole any further. When they had finally moved about a block away and Shadow glanced over his shoulder to confirm the hero or his sidekicks hadn't followed, he plopped Midoriya down on a bench to rest. You shouldn't have pulled me away, Midoriya grumbled, mouth set in a childish pout. Listen, you probably gave yourself a concussion healing that girl's head, Shadow reminded him. I doubt you're in the right state to be picking fights with pro heroes. Believe me, I wanted to freeze that asshole as soon as he mentioned my father, but sometimes you need to just walk away. He heard Midoriya mutter something else under his breath, but the healer didn't argue any further. Shadow let out a sigh, glanced around to get his bearings, wondering how far they had wandered from the lunch spots he had been contemplating, when he spotted 2 young girls standing nearby. They seemed to be bickering with one another, sending occasional glances in his and Midoriya's direction, and one of them held their phone up in the air like they were taking a picture. One of the girls finally saw that Shadow had noticed them and nudged her friend before the two began walking over. Hey, sorry to bother you, but did your friend just heal that little girl with his quirk? One of the girls asked as they approached. Oh, yes, Shadow answered, glancing back at Midoriya to see him watching the girls with wary eyes. That's so cool. The other girl held her phone up more confidently and pointed it at Midoriya. Sorry, I started live streaming as soon as the villain fight started, but then I saw you saving that girl and that was just so much cooler. How does your healing quirk work? It's nothing special. Really, Midoriya replied with an embarrassed chuckle, clearly a bit flustered from the sudden attention. But it does take a lot of energy for me to use it, so if you wouldn't mind. Oh, of course. We'll leave you be. We just wanted to say thank you. The girl with the phone turned around and held it up in the air. Shadow could see the camera view had been flipped, so she and Midoriya were now on screen. A live chat was running in the bottom corner, comments flooding in from her viewers. Hey everybody, say thank you to the cute healer boy. The girl held up a peace sign and smiled while Midoriya gave a hesitant wave and a tired grin of his own in the background. The vlogger's friend seemed more sympathetic to Midoriya's exhausted state and began to tug her away by her elbow. Can't wait to see you working with the pros one day, she called out over her shoulder as she and the vlogger wandered away in search of more things to film. Well, aren't you a celebrity? Shadow teased, reaching out a hand to pull his friend to his feet. Shut up, Midoriya muttered, lacking any true malice in his voice. There was still a bit of an embarrassed flush to his cheeks. I have a headache. I wonder why, Shadow drawled, worry settling over him as he watched Midoriya sway slightly on his feet and shield his eyes from the bright sun. Come on, let's get you some food. I think there's a good katsudon place nearby. After eating, Izuku felt infinitely better. He wasn't lying when he said brain injuries were a mess to heal, and in his younger years there had been worry over potential long-term damage on his own brain. But Island's careful monitoring never picked up any lasting damage on his end. He was perfectly well enough to continue walking around Musutafu, but his assurances weren't enough to stop Shadow from ushering him back to the Tua dorm so he could at least rest for a bit. He expected to encounter a handful of Tua students lounging about in the common area when they entered. It was their day off, so some were usually there for small group study sessions or socializing, while the vast majority either kept to their rooms or were doing some personal training out on campus. What he didn't expect was to see a good chunk of Tua occupying the common area, their voices loud and lively while they crowded around each other to look at something. Izuku couldn't tell, but when he and Shadow moved to join them and question what all of the excitement was about, they were interrupted by Katsuki, who intercepted them at the door. The explosive boy gripped Izuku's face with a rare gentleness, his red eyes quickly scanning every visible part of the healer. Are you okay? Katsuki asked, concern evident in his expression and tone. How's your head? I'm fine, Kaken, Izuku assured him, though he allowed his boyfriend to fuss and check him over. How did you even know about my head? You, Midoriya. Kirishima had finally spotted him in Shadow and broke away from his classmates to run over with a wide grin on his face. That rant was so manly, dude. Like, I thought you dug into us during training, but now I'm thinking you held back. I know, Uraraka exclaimed from her seat on one of the couches. That hero looked ready to fight you even with all those witnesses standing around. I would have paid to see that, Shiro said, Kaminari high-fiving him in agreement. Izuku looked between Shadow, who appeared to be just as confused as he was, and Katsuki, who seemed more and more worried by the second. He finally looked back at Kirishima with a furrowed brow and wondered if maybe he wasn't entirely recovered from healing the earlier head injury. What are you all ... How do you know about that? Have you not seen the video yet? Kirishima asked, tilting his head slightly in confusion. He began tugging Izuku towards the rest of the students, who he now realized had been staring down at their phones. Mina, pull up the video. What vi ... Oh no. Izuku stared down at the phone Ashido shoved in front of his face with increasing horror as he watched the video in question play on its screen. It was footage of the villain fight from earlier, but halfway through the fight whoever was filming focused the camera elsewhere and managed to capture Izuku healing the young girl, as well as the heated criticism he had later thrown at the pro hero for his careless work. Eventually the camera view flipped and showed the vlogger girl who had approached them, helping Izuku to piece together that this was what they had been filming. It was a live stream, but someone saved the recording and put it up as a video, Shinsu told him, coming up beside Izuku to show his own phone screen displaying one of the major hero discussion forums. It seemed every other post was about the video, many of them tagging #CutieHealerBoy in their comments. Everyone's talking about it right now. You've gone viral. I'm going to be in so much trouble for this, Izuku muttered. What? No way, Kirishima argued. Look, everyone's taking your side. They're all agreeing that the hero's work was sloppy and he should have been more careful. Apparently he didn't have the best record to begin with, Ida shared, scrolling through articles on his own phone. His fights against villains always tend to result in unnecessary collateral damage. The only difference here was that someone finally called him out. You're like a tiny celebrity, Midoriya, Asui commended. Yeah, I'd really rather not be, Izuku maintained. What if UA doesn't like that I yelled at a pro hero? What if my mom finds out ... What if my Island instructors find out? They wouldn't pull you from your internship, would they? Katsuki asked, even more anxious than before. Everything will work out just fine, Shoto quickly assured them. Honestly, even if there is an issue, that hero has a record of less than stellar work. I'm sure I could ask my dad to speak in your defense if it came down to it. You hate asking your old man for favors, Katsuki pointed out. Yeah, well, Shoto gave a small shrug. I'd hate it more if Midoriya had to leave. Izuku watched Katsuki's eyes widen by just a fraction before he turned towards the kitchen, muttering something over his shoulder about how he'd make Izuku more food. Shoto sent Izuku a hopeful smile that the healer tried his best to return. Let's just hope this all blows over, Izuku murmured. The last thing I need is more unwanted attention. Is he nice? Iri's question had Mirio pausing, a rare hesitance settling over him. He, Iri, and Eraserhead were on their way to the UA infirmary to formally introduce the young girl to Midoriya. She had accepted the request to meet the healer, but she still struggled with the anxiety of meeting new people. Though she had calmed significantly when Mirio had told her he'd take the day off and accompany her, she still couldn't help but revert to her instincts of caution and wariness. He's honest, Mirio weakly replied and winced a bit, realizing how his answer lacked any of the comfort or assurance Iri had been seeking with her question. Eraser likes him. Honestly, he didn't know what to say about Midoriya. He had heard bits and pieces about the healer over the years from Sir Night-Eye and All Might, mostly praise for his intelligence and quirk competency, which he certainly couldn't deny were accurate assessments. He knew that they intended for Midoriya to be a resource for him, but after their first meeting, after he had listened to this young boy discuss near-death experiences like they were nothing and been on the other end of his cold, calculative gaze and blunt examination, Mirio didn't quite know how he felt about him. Eraserhead had informed him that Midoriya was fitting in well with the UA community, quickly becoming a favorite of both students and faculty. Present Mike enjoyed signing to the boy when they passed each other in the halls. Midnight had given her immediate approval when she heard Midoriya defending her original costume design for its practicality and condemning the regulations relating to skin exposure for being absurd and restrictive. Apparently, Class 2A and Class 2B constantly fought over who could have Midoriya on standby for healing and observations if their training sessions ever overlapped. But even with the flattering reports, Mirio had still been surprised to hear that Eraserhead was willingly allowing a meeting between Midoriya and Iri given how protective the older hero was of her. He cares deeply for the people around him, Aizawa shared with Iri, cutting through Mirio's spiraling thoughts. I think you'll like him, but you're also allowed to leave at any time, so if you feel uncomfortable, just let us know. Iri gave him a small nod to let him know she understood, but said nothing more as they made their way to the infirmary. Recovery Girl had told them she was needed for her quirk at a local hospital with an overloaded emergency room and couldn't be present for the meeting, but that she trusted Midoriya to act alone and unsupervised in the infirmary. When they entered, they expected him to be alone, so they were surprised to see another student with him, seemingly uninjured and not there for healing. And you're sure he's going to wear them? The other student had her back to them, but Mirio recognized her as Mei Hatsum from her pink hair and preference for workshop gear over a proper uniform. She appeared to be accepting blueprint sheets from Midoriya. I've been trying to get that ticking time bomb to use one of my babies ever since I met him. Katsuki promised he'd at least try the noise filters out for a while, Midoriya told her. The healer glanced away to make eye contact with Mirio and Eraserhead, nodding to acknowledge their arrival before holding up a finger to request a moment of patience. Thanks again for agreeing to build them from my designs, Hatsum. I know you're very particular about your babies. Not a problem. Your concept work is just too beautiful to pass up, and this is for your boyfriend, so I understand the desire for a personal contribution. She turned around, eyes scanning the blueprints with excitement until she noticed the arrival of other people in the room. She smiled and began making her way out of the infirmary, calling out over her shoulder to Midoriya as she did so. I'll let you know when I'm finished. Midoriya waved as she left, and Mirio took a moment to notice that he wasn't wearing his lab coat, so the multitude of scars that littered his arms were on full display. Mirio hadn't seen the boy's arms yet, but he wasn't particularly surprised by the sight of more scars after Midoriya had shown the web of damage to his torso. However, it was strange because normally the healer had his lab coat on. Midoriya had never seemed ashamed of his scars, but the lab coat held things that were useful to him like his notebook or snacks, so he was rarely seen not wearing it. You must be Iri, Midoriya greeted, directing a kind smile towards the young girl. He immediately kneeled, placing himself at her level so she was no longer forced to look up at him. It's very nice to meet you. My name is Izuku Midoriya. Hello, Iri politely replied, though she made no move to approach Midoriya. She remained by Eraserhead's side, her hand clutched in his and her body pressed against his leg. Midoriya didn't seem offended by the distance, and Mirio noted that he hadn't even offered out a hand towards the girl. Instead, he sat fully on the ground, crossing his legs as he wholly committed to carrying on conversation at her height. Iri observed him for a moment, her vigilant eyes scanning the stranger before her as she attempted to process whether she viewed him as a danger. Mirio could see that her eyes kept returning and settling on Midoriya's arms, curiously tracing the scars that decorated them, and it seemed Midoriya had noticed this pattern as well. "Are you looking at my scars?" he questioned softly, though his smile never left his face. And no, Eri gripped Eraser's hand tighter, almost moving behind him as her eyes widened with fear from being caught. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. It's fine, you can look at them," Midoriya quickly assured her as he extended his arms out in front of him, almost like he was inviting her to take a closer look. "I quite like my scars. Do you know why?" "Why?" Eri asked, her fear swiftly replaced by curiosity. "They're signs of life," Midoriya told her. He raised a hand and let his fingertips graze some of the marks, tracing their forms. "They're evidence that my body healed itself and that it wants me to keep moving forward." Eri was quiet for a moment as her face twisted slightly and her nose scrunched, like she was silently debating something in her head. Eventually, she let go of Eraserhead's hand and stepped away from the man, hesitantly moving closer to Midoriya, who continued to sit patiently on the ground before her. She stopped a few paces away from him and pulled up one of her sleeves, tilting her arm so Midoriya could have a better view of it. "I have some too," Eri shared, a hesitant smile spreading on her face. "That must mean that you're a very strong little girl," the healer told her. "Stronger than most heroes, I'd imagine." "Heroes have nice quirks," Eri argued, expression twisting into something sadder. "I don't have a nice quirk." "I don't think quirks can be things like nice or mean or good or bad," Midoriya said. "I think that if you want your quirk to be nice and help people, then it will." He seemed to register the skepticism in Eri's expression and leaned forward like he was sharing a secret with only her. "My boyfriend has an explosion quirk that can be pretty loud and scary, and sometimes he can be loud and scary too, so some people think he might grow up to be a villain. But he's going to be a hero who helps people because that's what he wants to be." He smiled as Eri's eyes seemed to light up with a sudden determined hope. "What do you want to be, Eri?" "I want to be someone who helps people," she told him after a short moment of deliberation. "Then that's what you'll be." Eri grinned, wide and bright, and a quick glance to the side showed Mirio that Eraserhead had a smile of his own on his face as he watched the interaction before them. Perhaps Mirio had been too quick to judge the healer and he felt slightly guilty for not defending his character more. "Do you help people?" Eri asked as she gradually inched closer to Midoriya, her words becoming more confident as she became more comfortable with the stranger in front of her. "I try my best to," Midoriya admitted. He stood but only to retrieve a bag of what Mirio assumed were snacks or sweets from the infirmary desk before returning to his seat on the floor in front of it. "It's taken a bit of practice with my quirk, but I'm pretty good at using it now." "I want to practice too, but it's scary," Eri admitted, curiously eyeing the bag Midoriya had brought with him. "I don't want to hurt anyone or lose anyone. But I want to help people like Sir Night-Eye." It suddenly dawned on Mirio how much it would benefit Midoriya if Eri were to gain better control of her quirk. If the only limitation of his healing was the damage it inflicted on his own body, and Eri could rewind that damage as it occurred, then he would theoretically be able to heal without restraint. The idea of combining their quirks seemed like a fantastic plan in theory, but the thought suddenly had Mirio on edge. Sure, they were helping Eri train so she could gain better control of her quirk so as to avoid it negatively affecting anyone by accident, but they weren't pushing her. She was only a child, one who was still recovering from the traumas she had experienced. If Midoriya saw potential in Eri's quirk for his own, which he likely already had given his strategic tendencies, then he may try to convince all the right people to place Eri on a path that was more rigorous than she deserved. "One day you will," Midoriya told her, and Mirio tensed, ready to interject if the healer suggested anything extreme. "But that day doesn't need to be today. It doesn't need to be tomorrow or next week or anytime soon, because practice takes time and that's okay." Midoriya reached into the bag and pulled out a wrapped piece of candy which he offered to Eri. "And while you practice, you also need to take breaks and enjoy things like eating sweets and going on adventures." Eri looked at the candy with delight and nearly reached for it, but stopped and looked back at Eraserhead to seek permission before she did so. The older hero smiled and nodded his head but held up a finger to indicate she could only have one given how close it was to dinner time. Eri eagerly accepted the offered sweet, shyly thanking Midoriya as she did so. "In the meantime, heroes like me and Eraserhead will take care of things," Mirio assured her as she unwrapped her candy, prompting Eri to look back at him and smile. "Did you take breaks?" she asked, turning back to look at Midoriya as he unwrapped his own piece of candy. "Not many," the healer admitted, tossing the sweet into his mouth with a thoughtful look on his face. "But I really wish I had. So maybe you could do that for me." He looked at Eri with a seriousness in his eyes, as if he were handing out a mission assignment to a professional hero. "Could you go on adventures and eat sweets and have fun for me? Would that help you?" Eri asked. "It would help me out a whole lot," Midoriya replied. "Then I promise. Are you free tomorrow night?" Izuku nearly jumped out of his skin as Shinsu suddenly appeared by his side. He was finishing up lingering paperwork in the infirmary, and had been entirely in his own world, so disconnected that it had been simple for Shinsu to sneak up behind him at the desk. He looked at the boy, who seemed far too pleased with himself over surprising Izuku as he took a seat on one of the empty beds. "Free for what?" Izuku asked as he turned back to the computer to continue with his work. "Yes or no, please." "I am theoretically free tomorrow night," Izuku answered, rolling his eyes at Shinsu's stubbornness. "Why do you ask?" "So, there's this band that I've been following for years now, and they're finally doing a show in this club in Musutafu tomorrow around midnight. They're letting you leave campus by yourself to see a concert that late," Izuku asked, looking away from his work only to see Shinsu impishly grin in response to the question. Izuku sighed, a frown settling on his own face. "You're sneaking out, aren't you? Listen, this band hardly ever does performances in Japan, let alone this close to the school," Shinsu reasoned, hands waving in the air as if the gestures helped to prove his point. "It'd be an insult to not sneak out and see them. And you're asking me to be your accomplice because I normally hit up concerts with Jiru, but this band's not her style," Shinsu explained. "I'd ask Kaminari, but I already see him all the time, and honestly I just wanted to spend more time with you." Izuku's mind snagged on those last few words, and he turned to Shinsu with a questioning look. "Are you?" "I'm not flirting with you," Shinsu quickly promised, hands raised in a pacifying gesture. "As much as I like to piss off Bakugo, I respect that much. Doesn't Yue have a curfew?" Izuku asked, now completely distracted from his work. "You have a curfew?" Shinsu asked in lieu of an answer. "I respect that Toshinori likes me to be home by a certain hour," Izuku replied carefully. "But no, I don't exactly have a set curfew. You moved away when you were 5, right?" Shinsu checked as he jumped up from the bed move, so he stood in front of Izuku. He put his hands on Izuku's shoulders, lightly shaking the boy. "I bet you've been dying to explore more than just this campus since you've gotten back, and I really think you'd enjoy this band's music. I swear you'll enjoy yourself." "I don't know, Shinsu," Izuku said, glancing over at the work he still had to do. It reminded him of all the assignments he wanted to work on back at home. His island instructors practically expected him to finish his work far ahead of schedule, and there were a few designs for support gear that he had wanted to fine-tune before he sent them to Melissa and Hatsum for second opinion. The concert would be late at night, which wasn't exactly the normal time to do coursework, but Izuku had always been a night owl and a workaholic. Not to mention, if they were caught, then there would most definitely be hell to pay. He was surprised Shinsu was willing to take such a risk, considering his placement in the hero course was recent and likely still a bit probationary. Izuku could have his internship terminated and be sent back to Island, a punishment he barely even wanted to consider. "No one will even know we were gone," Shinsu promised in an attempt to dissuade any worries. "We'll leave and get back while everyone's asleep." "I feel like I'm already on thin ice because of that viral video thing," Izuku murmured. "That was like a week ago, and you didn't even get in trouble for that," he argued, sighing after a moment as Izuku continued to be unconvinced. "Listen, if we do get caught, then you're allowed to say I used my quirk on you and tricked you into going out. You know I'd never lie about you using your quirk on me," Izuku told him, firm yet caring in his response in a way that brought a small smile to Shinsu's face. Izuku let out a sigh and watched as Shinsu's expression now brightened, the other boy realizing he had won. But fine, I'll go. Izuku was a surprisingly prideful person, likely a result of growing up with Katsuki as a major influence in his life, but he knew when to admit he was wrong. So, as he and Shinsu walked through the cool and silent streets of Musutafu after attending an undeniably great concert, he felt pressed to voice his thoughts on the matter. "We should do this again," Izuku admitted, though he quickly tacked on an addendum when he caught sight of something mischievous in Shinsu's eyes. "But I could do without the sneaking around next time. Thank you. I told you this would be fun," Shinsu replied, a lazy grin on his face as they walked. Shinsu had already declared that he'd escort Izuku home before returning to campus, but neither boy was really in a rush to return home. "Have you and Bakugo been able to go out anywhere?" "We go out sometimes for food or just to spend time together," Izuku told him, the same response he gave most people when they asked what he did with Katsuki. "We're both pretty busy, so it's difficult. But it's definitely an improvement from being long distance. Maybe once you graduate you can move back to Japan and work here," Shinsu suggested. "I bet Yue would love to have another healing quirk user. Then you'd be close to Bakugo and whatever the hell he decides he's gonna do." Izuku had to hold back a bitter laugh so he wouldn't ruin the peaceful mood that had settled between him and Shinsu on their walk back. What Shinsu didn't know was that his suggestion was something of an ongoing dispute for Izuku. Of course he'd like to come back to Japan. Of course he would. Japan was where he was born. It was where Katsuki lived. It was where all of the new friends he had made at UA lived. Sure, he had friends on Island and he cared deeply for Melissa and her father, but Island was just one place with a limited population made of mostly researchers. He absolutely would jump at the chance to return to Japan. The problem was that a few of those researchers and a few very wealthy investors who funded their work and had funded Izuku's work in education and quirk training for the last decade didn't want him to leave, and they had some pretty serious contracts that could legally keep him where they wanted him. It was a legal leash that could easily keep him bound to that island for the rest of his life, and that fact weighed on Izuku every day. But he didn't say any of this to Shinsu, not even allowing his tone to allude to the disheartening realities floating in his head. "It's a nice thought," Izuku murmured instead, voice light and unaffected as he had trained it to be for conversations like this. He opened his mouth again to suggest a different conversation topic when he suddenly registered a strange noise that interrupted the quiet stillness of the very early morning. He stopped, Shinsu stopping with him after a few steps. "Did you hear that?" Hear what? Shinsu cut himself off as he heard the noise as well. As the two fell silent, the noise became clearer, and it registered with both of them at once that it was the sound of someone groaning. It was the sound of someone groaning in pain. Shinsu and Izuku shared a quick glance before moving swiftly and quietly down the empty street, ears straining to pick up the noise and identify its source. They eventually found it down a narrow alleyway that branched off the main street. The alleyway was dark, the light from the main road barely reaching it. The first thing Izuku registered was the familiar metallic scent of blood in the air until his eyes finally adjusted and he saw a young woman kneeling on the ground covered in red. "Please," the woman pleaded, clutching her abdomen as she slumped against the wall of the alleyway. "Somebody, please help me. That's a lot of blood." Shinsu noted uselessly, though Izuku couldn't blame the observation as he had seen his fair share of accidents and could admit this was a lot of blood. Izuku quickly made his way towards the woman, vaguely registering Shinsu's warnings to be careful. He kneeled beside her, eyes scanning to identify where exactly the blood was coming from. "Please help me," she pleaded again. "Some asshole jumped me with a knife. It hurts. It's going to be okay," Izuku assured her, voice calm and firm to keep her from panicking further. "Can you move your hands so I can see the injuries?" The woman shakily moved her hands from her abdomen, and Izuku moved his own hands closer, gently pulling at the blood-soaked fabric of her shirt to look for the incisions. He wondered for a moment if the dim light was playing tricks on him or if maybe he was far more tired than he had thought, because he swore as he pulled at the fabric. He saw no wounds and only more blood. "Where are the Midoriya?" Wow, that girl was right. Izuku's eyes shot up. The woman's voice had changed, and Izuku found himself staring into a different set of eyes than he had seen before. These were gold with pupils like a cat, and Izuku watched as the rest of the woman's face seemed to melt away like it was made of wax to reveal another person. A girl with messy blonde buns and a blush on her blood-splattered cheeks now sat before Izuku, and she smiled wide to reveal sharp canine. Izuku felt the blood in his own veins freeze as he felt the sharp edge of a knife press against his throat, and the girl giggled, a lighthearted and entirely inappropriate noise for such a moment. "You are a cute healer boy, huh?" There were too many voices. Normally Hitoshi liked voices. They were the trigger of his quirk, and nothing was more inconvenient than a silent opponent. But there were too many voices, too many people crowding around him and hovering like buzzing insects, and he couldn't process it all. He couldn't process much beyond the distant ache he knew existed in his body that he only barely registered through the dissociative haze that had wrapped around him during his journey back to the dorms. "Someone grab a first aid kit." "Holy shit, Shinsu. Should we call recovery girl?" He was bleeding, he knew that. He could smell copper in the air. Or maybe that was just the lingering scent of the blood that had painted the alleyway. The blood. There was so much of it, so much covering that woman that of course they had assumed she was actually injured. He couldn't blame Midoriya for immediately running to her side. He was a healer first and foremost, and those instincts were ingrained in him. Hitoshi had called out a warning, a reminder to stay vigilant because the attacker could have still been nearby, but he should have done more than that. He should have gone first and assessed the scene before allowing Midoriya anywhere near it. It might not have done much to change what had happened, but maybe he could have seen something. Noticed something that could have told him the situation wasn't right. "Shinsu, I know you're a bit shaken right now, but I need you to run the details by me again." There was Aizawa's voice. Earlier Hitoshi had stumbled into the dorm and collapsed to his knees by the front door, his eyes focusing on the ground in front of him. He never looked up, even when he heard a scream come from one of his classmates who had come down for a glass of water. Shortly after, anyone who wasn't dead asleep came scrambling down in response to it, swarming him with hesitant touches and so many voices. Hitoshi never looked up from the ground, only recognizing the people present if they spoke or if they twisted their necks in a futile effort to make eye contact. He's fairly certain that Jiru and Kaminari had joined him on the floor, each flanking him and hugging an arm in some attempt at comfort. He remembered he was able to answer some of their questions, mostly bits and pieces about what had happened, the important stuff. By the time Aizawa had arrived, they more or less had a full picture, but Aizawa wanted something more coherent, something he could confidently report. "He needs medical attention," one of his classmates argued. "He needs to give me a complete story," Aizawa replied, voice firm but with the faintest edge of panic to it. "I know he's hurt, but if he faints or the memories become foggy then What the hell happened to you? Hitoshi looked up, finally hearing the voice he had been dreading to hear. The other voices weren't important. They were grating and unhelpful and hard to follow through the haze that had settled around him. But this voice was the one he latched onto. It was the one he needed to respond to, needed to give an explanation to. Bakugo, I'm sorry, Hitoshi finally spoke, voice cracking as he stared into confused crimson eyes. I'm so sorry. It was the first sentence he had spoken that hadn't been disjointed murmurings, and it was the first time he had made eye contact with someone as he did. The rest of the class took note of this and fell silent. Or maybe they fell silent because now Bakugo was here and they knew that someone needed to tell him what had happened. Why are you sorry? Bakugo asked, growing more guarded now as he glanced around at his classmates. I lost him. Bakugo's gaze snapped back to focus on Hitoshi. What do you mean you lost him? Bakugo growled, voice beginning to strain as the gears turned in his head and filled it with 1,000 different possibilities. Lost who? Bakugo, answer me, he snapped, silencing Aizawa's attempt to de-escalate the situation. Bakugo's eyes never left Hitoshi and Hitoshi refused to look away. He wasn't a coward and he owed the other boy the respect of meeting his gaze. But that was about all he could do. When he opened his mouth to answer, the words refused to come out and it became harder with every passing moment to respond as Bakugo's eyes filled with more and more desperate fear. Hitoshi didn't know if he felt grateful or guilty that Todoroki eventually answered for him. The League of Villains kidnapped Izuku. What? Bakugo's gaze flicked over to look at Todoroki. I snuck out and met up with him to see this band perform downtown. Hitoshi finally spoke. The words came easier now and he would bet it was because the reveal alone had just been the hardest part to get past. On the way back, we heard this. Someone was crying for help. We followed it down an alleyway and found a woman covered in blood. It was Toga, Uraraka shared, picking up the explanation as she no doubt noticed Hitoshi still struggling to carry on. She disguised herself as a hurt civilian and claimed she had just been attacked. Midoriya got closer to heal her and, why didn't you protect him? Bakugo asked, his voice now unnervingly quiet and laced with slighted disbelief as he once again stared at Hitoshi. Why? We were ambushed. She wasn't alone, Hitoshi reasoned, though the defense felt like ash in his mouth. They trapped Midoriya in a marble and pinned me before I even realized what was happening. He looked at Bakugo, praying that the other boy would understand. You have to believe me when I say I tried. Bakugo's eyes began to move, darting around and scanning Hitoshi's form. He was no doubt taking stock of the damage Hitoshi was slowly beginning to feel in full force. He hadn't seen what he looked like yet, but he doubted it was a very pretty picture. Bakugo suddenly seemed fairly sobered by the sight of it all, like he had decided Hitoshi must have sufficiently fought back. The simmering rage seemed to leave him and all at once Bakugo seemed very disconnected. His gaze grew distant and he blinked a few times before staggering away towards another area of the common room. Hitoshi watched Todoroki follow after him without hesitation, leaving the rest of the present class and Aizawa behind to discuss the situation more. Midoriya was the clear target here, Aizawa decided. He had pulled out his phone at some point and was typing on it, likely contacting additional faculty to inform them of the situation. They lured you in with an injured civilian, likely knowing that he'd try to heal them and it would leave him vulnerable. Healing quirks are rare, Ida reminded them as Aizawa stepped away from the group to take a call. Recovery Girl said it's a huge advantage to have a hero who can heal, so they probably wanted to take that advantage away from us. But why the hell would they go through the trouble of taking him? Zero questioned. Why not just kill him? Maybe to steal his quirk, Ashido suggested. I know All for One is in jail, but maybe they're planning to keep him around until they have a use for him. When they kidnapped Bakugo, it was because they were trying to recruit him, Asui recalled. No offense to Bakugo, but if you don't know him well, then he does seem like the type who'd be willing to switch sides, Kaminari argued. Midoriya's never really given off any villain vibes like that before. Why would they think they could recruit him? The video, Kirishima said with sudden realization, the rest of the group freezing as they processed the same thought. The one that went viral that showed him healing that little girl and yelling at the pro hero for being reckless. That showcased both his quirk and a capacity for disliking heroes, Uraraka acknowledged. He was just scolding the guy, Ashido reasoned. That doesn't mean Midoriya is gonna jump ship to the villains. Yes, but as I said, a healing quirk is a major advantage, Ida reiterated. If they believed that there was a chance, however small, that he'd hear them out, then they probably figured it'd be worth it to take him. Hey, Bakugo, Kirishima called out, turning to see where the other boy had wandered off to. Would Midoriya ever ... What's going on? Hitoshi had gone back to looking at the floor as his classmates discussed in a whirlwind around him. But Kirishima's voice pushed him to look up again. There was a shift in his tone, the worry that had laced his words seeming to deepen. When Hitoshi looked up and scanned the room to find Bakugo, he quickly understood why. It was a difficult scene to read at first. Bakugo was on the ground and leaning against a far wall of the common room with Todoroki kneeling in front of him, obscuring everyone's view of what exactly was happening. But as everyone fell quiet, New sounds that had been previously covered up by their raucous conversation now filled the room. It was the sound of breathing, shallow and quick and not quite right. "Todoroki, what's wrong with him?" Uraraka asked, taking a few steps towards the pair. "Nothing, everyone just back off," Todoroki snapped with more defensive venom in his voice than Hitoshi had ever heard come from him. His voice grew much softer as he turned back to Bakugo, but it carried an edge of fear with it. "You need to breathe with me, please. There's clearly something wrong." "Ada, wait," Hitoshi ordered, silencing his friend as he carefully watched the pair from afar. The irregular breaths were clearly coming from Bakugo, and as Hitoshi listened more, he could hear aborted attempts to speak coming from him as well. Each word edged with a desperation to say what he wanted to and bracketed by frustrated gasping when it failed to be produced. Todoroki was communicating with gentle yet firm orders, somewhat pleading with Bakugo to take deeper breaths or close his eyes or put his head between his knees. "He's having a panic attack," Hitoshi realized. He could feel all eyes on him when he said this and didn't have to look to know that many carried intense skepticism in their gazes. They were likely thinking the same things that he was right now. Katsuki Bakugo didn't panic. He wasn't anxious. He was an explosive force of confidence and pride capable of bringing others to their knees in fear. But he was having a panic attack. Hitoshi didn't even realize he had struggled to his feet until he was walking towards the pair, movements as careful and calm as he could manage with his injuries. Todoroki sensed him coming and whipped his head around, a warning glare on his face that fell once he saw the earnest expression on Hitoshi's. He silently moved out of the way, staying close by Bakugo's side as he created an opening for Hitoshi to kneel in front. Now closer, Hitoshi could see that Bakugo was coated in a fine layer of sweat, and a small warning bell in the back of his head told him that if the other boy suddenly tried to use his quirk, then it wouldn't end well for those nearby. He was shaking, and the breathing only seemed to be getting worse. He had bent his legs, tucking his knees close to his chest with his head bowed as he gripped his hair in tight fistful. As Hitoshi knelt in front of him, he looked up, crimson eyes rimmed in a similar shade of red from the threat of tears. "Get away from me," Bakugo snarled, pushing back against the wall in an attempt to retreat as much as possible from everything around him. He raised his hands, palms facing out, and Hitoshi was once again reminded that the threat of his quirk was still at play. "Don't touch me, don't touch. Bakugo, if you respond to me then I can help you come back down," Hitoshi told him, cutting straight to the point to lay his offer on the table. "Do you want me to help you?" Hitoshi watched the violent fear in Bakugo's eyes shift away ever so slightly in favor of hesitant contemplation. Bakugo didn't respond immediately, knowing even in the throes of this episode what a verbal response to Hitoshi's question would mean for him. Katsuki Bakugo was confident and prideful. That much was an uncontested truth, but he also knew when to push that arrogance to the side. Yes, but that one word, delivered with a sort of exhausted surrender, Hitoshi felt his quirk take hold. Bakugo's eyes filled with that familiar, indicative cloudiness, and while his body somewhat slackened, the tremors and shallow breaths remained. "Match my breathing," Hitoshi ordered as he began to take deep and measured breaths, exaggerated so Bakugo's hazy mind could follow them. "Relax your arms, just like that, good job." Once Bakugo's breathing started to even out and the shaking began to subside, Hitoshi noted Todoroki finally standing and moving away. Hitoshi kept his primary focus on Bakugo but continued to listen for the conversations of his classmates behind him. "Since when does he have panic attacks?" Kirishima asked. "That's not important right now," he heard Todoroki say in response. "Don't crowd them. Let Shinsu do his thing." From his tone and actions, Hitoshi could tell that Todoroki wasn't surprised by the episode. He had even been trying to help Bakugo through it, so he had either been told about them or Bakugo had experienced an attack in front of him before. "What do we do now?" Uraraka asked. "When he's done, Shinsu will come with me to give a report to Principal Nezu," Aizawa answered. "In the meantime, the rest of you will do nothing. There will not be a repeat of the stunt you pulled last time, am I understood, Mr. Aizawa?" "We're more than just first years now," Kirishima argued, likely one of the best candidates in the room to make such an argument considering his contributions to the Shai Hasekai raid. "We can at least do something to help. You will take no action. Am I understood?" Aizawa's tone left no room for debate and the room fell silent in response. Hitoshi returned his full attention to Bakugo and dropped the hold of his quirk. Bakugo slumped against the wall and blinked away the remnants of Hitoshi's quirk. He said nothing and curled back in on himself like had been doing before, but now it was with regular breaths and steadier movements. Hitoshi backed away, and his vacant spot was quickly filled by a vigilant Todoroki. "He should be okay now," Hitoshi reported once he had made his way to Aizawa's side. "Not great, but you know." He shrugged and looked at his teacher for his next order, but the man was looking away, staring across the room at where Todoroki and Bakugo sat with a look of guilt on his face. "Mr. Aizawa." His mentor blinked, gaze shifting back to focus on the boy in front of him. Aizawa said nothing, ignoring the questioning look Hitoshi sent him. Instead, he silently reached out and took hold of Hitoshi's chin. using the grip to gently turn his face to the right and left to get a better look at the injuries he had sustained there. Hitoshi winced only slightly as he felt cuts and scrapes pull from the movement. "I'll call recovery girl on our way over." Aizawa dropped Hitoshi's chin and walked towards the door. "Let's go." Shadow remained on the floor in front of Bakugo, sitting patiently as he heard the front door to the dorm open and close to signal Aizawa and Hitoshi's departure. Bakugo had started to unfurl himself, cautiously extending his legs out and raising his head to rest it against the wall behind him. His gaze was distant again, but he seemed aware of his surroundings and the situation, so Shadow pressed forward with his checklist of questions. "Do you want to stay here for a little while?" he asked. Bakugo squeezed his eyes shut and dragged a hand over his face before shaking his head. "Do you want to go to your room?" Bakugo nodded and Todoroki stood, holding out a hand for Bakugo to grasp so he could pull the other boy to his feet. Bakugo swayed initially but weakly batted away Shadow's hands when he reached out to offer support. They stood there for a moment as Shadow gave him time to get his bearings. Eventually Bakugo turned and began to slowly head towards the elevators, Shadow following from a few paces away like a shadow. "Does he need anything?" Kirishima caught Shadow's arm as he passed, clearly distressed and out of his element but trying his best to stay level-headed. "Can we help in any way?" "Just ... give us some space," Shadow answered, glancing around at the other worried expressions of his classmates. "And try to keep the dorm quiet. I'll text if there's anything else." Kirishima nodded and Shadow followed after Bakugo to the other boy's room. Bakugo went in first and immediately moved towards the bed, crawling into it to lay on his side and face away from the door. Shadow took a step into the room and glanced around, running through the checklist in his head again. "Do you want the lights on or off?" he asked, carefully keeping his questions simple and easy to answer. "Off." "Are you hungry? I can get you something to eat or drink." "Not hungry." "Would you like me to get anyone? Like Kirishima or?" "No." "Would you like to be left alone?" That question didn't earn an immediate answer like the others, and after a few moments of silence Shadow began to wonder if Bakugo had fallen asleep. He waited for another few seconds before he began to make his way out of the room and into the hall. He had reached for the handle of the door and was about to pull it closed behind him when he finally heard an answer. "No." Bakugo's voice was strained again, like it pained him to speak. Shadow moved back into the room, closing the door behind him. He walked over and sat on the other side of the bed, making sure he wasn't touching Bakugo and only existing as another presence in the room for him to focus on. When Shadow first learned about Izuku, it revealed a whole other side to Bakugo. Izuku brought out that other side, whether Bakugo liked it or not. You could see it emerge if he was talking about Izuku or if the two were together and interacting. The smiles came easier, with less of an edge, and it was like a tension you hadn't even realized was there suddenly left him. Bakugo was fiercely protective of the things he loved, of the things he believed in. Most people expect nothing but explosions from him. They expect rage and violence and blind determination that could get a man through any trial. They expect that, in a situation like this, he would already be out the door and on his way to destroy the people who took Izuku from him. The thing is that he lets people expect that. There was a proven benefit to letting people expect that, to letting people assume. But they were only assumptions and Bakugo was only one person. "We'll get him back," Shadow swore, voice breaking through the quiet. "Midoriya is a fighter. You know that better than anyone." His words were once again met with silence and Shadow was almost certain that Bakugo had finally fallen asleep this time. Again, he was proven wrong as a raw and tired voice filled the dark room, the words measured and heavy in their delivery. "Sometimes fighting back gets you killed." Izuku heard the click of restraints locking his hands behind his back as he was forced into a seat, a firm hand on his shoulder to ensure he wouldn't try to stand. The man who had locked the restraints, a tall fellow wearing a dark yellow overcoat and a white mask, took a step back as if to admire his work. His head tilted as he took in the look of unimpressed loathing on Izuku's face. "Apologies," the man said, as if he had just bumped into Izuku on the street and not locked away his hands. "I know the restraints are a bit uncomfortable, but we can't exactly talk to you while you're in the marble." Izuku actually knew that the man in the mask was the villain known as Mr. Compress. He knew, now that the initial shock and adrenaline had faded, that the woman he had tried to heal in the alleyway was the villain known as Toga Himiko. He knew that the villain's Spinner and Twice were flanking him, observing his movements and ensuring the restraints he had been placed in were secure. He knew the people before him, silently observing, were the villains Dabai and Shigaraki. He knew every single person in the room because he had studied every bit of information he could possibly find on each of them. The League of Villains, the group that had launched attack after attack on the students of UA High School and the citizens of Japan. The group whose leader brought about the end of All Might as the symbol of peace and left society to spiral into uncertainty in the aftermath. The group that kidnapped Katsuki and left Izuku an inconsolable mess, miles away on that stupid floating island as he was left to wonder if he'd ever get to see the person he loved again. He had scoured the internet for every piece of news footage, any clip from any angle, from the Camino incident. He had asked Shoto, never Katsuki, for anything he could recall from the training camp, always making sure his questions had context and were spaced apart to avoid having it seem like a developing obsession. He researched and he analyzed and he did all that he could from a distance to assemble a mental dossier on the group that had continuously wrecked the lives of the people he cared about. But even with all that preparation, he never would have expected to come face to face with the villains themselves. Get to the point, Izuku spat, trying his best to force more anger than fear into his voice. If you're going to torture me for information or film a hostage video, then just do it. Izuku was clever, but he was also very, very stupid. The murmurings that came from his never-ending stream of consciousness may sound impressive to some, but it was only the result of him never being able to just shut up. There was just too much in his head, and his natural instinct was to let it out. It didn't get him in trouble as much as it should have back on Island, because his instructors tended to encourage discussion and verbal collaboration. Even when he said something a little too rude or too over the line, he generally knew what to say afterwards to dig himself out of whatever hole he had created. He was blunt and analytical, which generally weren't bad characteristics in a healer or scientist, but it easily became a problem when silence was the preferable course of action. Like right now. Well, aren't you an impatient little shit? Dabai drawled, though his eyes seemed to shine with excitement like he hoped Izuku would spark a fight. We aren't going to hurt you, Shigaraki claimed from the seat across from him as he scratched at his scarred and bloody neck in a way that made Izuku's instincts flare up. Awa, we aren't. A voice came from behind Izuku, and he knew Toga was somewhere close to him. She hadn't really left his side apart from his time spent in one of Compress's marbles. Izuku would have guessed it was because she was the one with the knife and the quick reflexes, but a look in her eyes, one of twisted affection, told him that she was sticking close for more than just guard duty. As soon as he had been released from the marble, dropped unceremoniously onto the floor of some nondescript hideout, she had been by his side and cooing into his ear about how pretty he looked with blood on his hands. Shut up, Toga, Shigaraki snapped. He continued scratching at his throat with one hand as he gestured about the room with the other. We are the League. I know who you are, Izuku interrupted him, lacking the patience for what would have no doubt been an egotistical elevator pitch. If you're not going to hurt me, then what do you want? Izuku had his theories, but he was having trouble narrowing them down. The most obvious assumption had been that they wanted to use him for information or maybe to bargain. It wasn't exactly a secret that he was involved with UA in some capacity, and if anyone paid enough attention, they would have seen him socializing with the school's students out in public. If the rumors about them having a traitor in the school were true, then they'd be aware of just how much information Izuku would have access to with his position. Couple that with the easily attained knowledge that he didn't have a combat quirk to fight back with, and that made him an easy pick. But they claimed they weren't going to hurt him, so unless we want you to join us. Izuku's thoughts screeched to a halt as he attempted to process the inane statement that had just left Shigaraki's mouth. Join them. Join them. You're kidding me. Izuku couldn't help the bark of incredulous laughter that escaped him. Do you realize who I am? What I am? Izuku Midoriya, Dabai answered, his arms crossed over his chest as he nonchalantly leaned against one of the walls in the room. Newest addition to the ranks of UA, who came out of seemingly nowhere with impressive control over a yet-to-be-specified healing quirk. Then you know that I'm a healer, Izuku reasoned, picking out the important part of the summary. So, what the hell makes you think I'd team up with villains? Are villains unworthy of being healed? Shigaraki questioned, his tone laced with something akin to offense, but it was warped and sardonic, like he knew what he was saying was bullshit. Do you think we deserve to suffer with our pain because of how society has labeled us? It is not my job to cast judgment, Izuku stated, but quickly moved to say more when he saw a spark of satisfaction in Shigaraki's face, obscured as it was by some grotesque embalmed hand that was hanging over it. I'd heal you, I would. I'd gladly heal all of you if doing so wouldn't put even more people in danger. I can't help you if I know that I'd just be hurting others in the long run. He meant what he said. Of course, there was moral conflict in healing someone who had done something terrible, but it was not his place to judge or form opinion. It was his job to heal people and to avoid harm whenever possible. The problem came in considering the net harm that would undoubtedly be done in healing someone who would be free to walk away and go on to hurt others, putting more people in danger. Shigaraki repeated, like what your so-called heroes do. Collateral damage and minor civilian causalities don't matter all that much as long as you take down the villain and smile pretty for the camera. They don't set out with the aim to do harm, Izuku argued. No, they just don't care if they do, Shigaraki bit back. That child you healed in that viral video, they were injured by falling rubble created by the hero's quirk. He reached up and removed the dismembered hand from his face, allowing Izuku to see the smug grin splitting his expression and cracking his already dry lips. And you certainly didn't seem too happy with the hero about that. The argument you're trying to make is baseless and you know it, Izuku maintained, silently cursing the fact that he didn't do more to take down that video. He knew there'd be repercussions for it somehow. He just hadn't considered anything like this. There'd be countless more injured or dead if the heroes weren't around. Very few of them are even worthy of that title. Hero. Dabai had picked up the debate now, his voice dripping with vitriol as he said the word hero. He detached himself from the wall, wandering closer to his teammates and Izuku. Their commission is laced with just as much corruption as any villain organization out there. He waved his hand in the air, his fingers catching with a steady blue flame as his stitched grin widened. Wiping the slate clean and getting a fresh start wouldn't be such a bad thing. If anything, it would be lots of fun. Toga supplied as if the extra comment would help seal the deal. I agree that there are some out there undeserving of praise, Izuku settled, taking note of the way Dabai's flames seemed to sputter in response to his agreement. The man faltered, his grin slipping, appearing as if he hadn't considered that Izuku would agree on any level with his ideals. There are some truly horrible people who never even receive the title of villain because they're protected by society's greed and pride. But I am telling you that a total restart is not the answer. Dabai's eyes narrowed, but he fell silent from Izuku's response. It was likely none of them had anticipated Izuku agreeing with any of their points while still holding on to his own conviction. Izuku was a strategist, and he knew how debates needed to flow for any sort of progress to occur. Throwing opposing ideas at one another with no give did nothing but strengthen each extreme and aggravate each side. We're getting nowhere and I'm getting bored. Shigaraki whined like a child who wasn't getting his way. He stood from his seat and wandered closer to Izuku, settling by Dabai's side. The villain began clawing at his throat again. Slow and methodical like the action helped him think as he stared at Izuku. I bet you can't stand seeing people in pain. His voice had grown soft, but it was far from comforting as his eyes widened slightly with a sudden idea. I wonder if that applies even when they're a mass murderer. Without looking away from Izuku, Shigaraki suddenly snapped out a hand and gripped one of Dabai's arms. The scarred tissue quickly flaked away like ash kicked up from a fire as the stench of decay and death filled the room and burned Izuku's senses. Surprised gasps and shouts erupted throughout the room, indicating that this had not at all been a part of their plan. What the hell are you doing? Twice shouted, stepping forward as Toga vaulted the couch that Izuku was seated on to get closer. Dabai, you crazy fuck. Dabai snapped, though as he moved to pull away, Shigaraki quickly raised his other hand to place 4 fingers around the man's throat. Dabai froze, though his face contorted into a grimace as the flesh of his forearm continued to slowly decay. The fingers around his throat, one raised in silent warning, served to keep everyone else in the room from moving as well in fear that Dabai would lose more than just the flesh of his arm. Izuku watched with wide eyes as more and more of the villain's scarred skin was stripped away, layer by layer. The grimace was shifting to more of an expression of agony as the corrosion dug past the surface that had been comprised of damaged nerves and began to eat away at healthier tissue. Despite the expressions, Dabai made barely a sound, and normally Izuku would commend or even question a patient for that level of pain tolerance, but right now all he could think about was how he wanted it all to stop. Stop, he begged, his voice quiet and broken before he shouted more forcefully. Stop, please stop. Shigaraki let Dabai go, both hands releasing to allow the villain to sink to his knees and breathe through the intense pain he was no doubt experiencing. The hand of his good arm hovered and twitched over the injury like he wanted to apply pressure in hopes of relief, but knew that touching something that exposed would only do more harm. Spinner, let him go, Shigaraki ordered as he calmly returned to his seat. What? Spinner asked, distracted by the scene before him. Let him go, Shigaraki repeated, waving a hand to gesture towards Izuku. Let him act. Spinner shook his head to refocus and reached behind Izuku, unlocking the restraints that kept his hands bound. Izuku didn't think, he only moved. He fell forward to the floor and lunged for Dabai, careful to wrap his hands around the parts of his arm that hadn't been stripped away. He felt Dabai's gaze on him but didn't return it as he focused on stitching the flesh of his arm back together inch by tortuous inch. Just as I thought, Izuku heard Shigaraki muse, dark delight in his voice. He'll heal anyone with a little motivation. Shigaraki, look, he heard twice exclaim. Oh gross, look at his arm. Did you touch him? He's decaying. It's in the same place as Dabai's wound. Izuku didn't need to look to know what the whole room was seeing and reacting to because he could damn well feel it. The reflected damage from his healing was disintegrating his own arm, a slow spread of decay occurring with no obvious cause to anyone but him. He took solace in the knowledge that the damage would be contained, predestined to cover only a fraction of the area that Dabai's injury took up. He hung on to the fact that this insufferable pain, caught somewhere between a burn and an excruciatingly slow avulsion, would eventually stop. He had developed a decent tolerance for pain over the years due to his training, but this was on a whole other level. Everyone around him seemed to still be trying to figure out why his arm was reacting as if Shigaraki had used his quirk from a distance. Izuku had almost healed the wound completely when he heard a small noise come from Dabai, prompting him to finally look up. The villain was staring at the reflected decay stripping away Izuku's forearm, and he could tell from the look in his eyes that Dabai was beginning to piece together what was happening. Stop doing that. Dabai shoved Izuku away before he could finish healing the injury completely and stumbled to his feet to put even more distance between them. Restrain him, Shigaraki ordered with a pleased expression on his face as a weak and injured Izuku was maneuvered back into his restraints by Spinner and Twice. Well, that was interesting. Interesting, Dabai repeated, his eyes darting back and forth between his mostly healed arm and the newly exposed flesh of Izuku's own limb. You call this fucking interesting? He healed you, Shigaraki pointed out. If he hadn't done it immediately, like he did, then we'd have made him do it eventually. Doesn't change the fact that it hurt like a bitch, Dabai growled. You've already got nerve damage, Shigaraki reasoned with a wave of his hand. I'm sure you barely felt it. You didn't even cry. I can't cry in the first place, motherfucker. I'd still say that was a success. Unfortunately, there's been a new development, Compress reminded the room, drawing everyone's attention back to the original plan. His quirk is far more limited than we had previously thought. We hadn't seen any visible damage to him in that video, but evidently, it doesn't just take his energy, Spinner observed, wincing as he studied Izuku's arm. It starts to hurt him. If he healed enough, it'd probably kill him, Toga guessed, though she sounded more intrigued than worried by the idea. He'll still be a useful asset, Shigaraki decided. He stood, placing the disembodied hand back over his face as he made his way out of the room. I need to go speak with the doctor. While I'm gone, try and force some food into him. Well, I ain't feeding him, Spinner quickly declared, backing away towards the door Shigaraki had left through with his hands raised. He already tried to bite me back in the alleyway. Are you okay, Dabai? Twice asked, the concern in his voice quickly shifting to irritation. Stop being so weak. I'll live, Dabai muttered as he watched Izuku with a curious expression on his face. Izuku, Toga cooed as she jabbed a stick of Pocky at his closed mouth. Come on, you need to eat something. Can he heal his own arm, or? Compress questioned, trailing off as Dabai sent him a look of doubt. I'll go get a first aid kit. Hey, crazy, Dabai said once Compress had left, Toga's head perking up in response. Why don't you run out and get snacks? Something high-calorie that'll be easy to get him to eat. Take Twice with you. Toga giggled and pinched Izuku's cheek, promising to bring him back something sweet before she skipped out of the room with Twice trailing after her. A moment later, Mr. Compress returned to the room with what looked to be a standard first aid kit in his hands. He glanced around the room as he handed the kit off to Dabai and noticed it had mostly empty. You can leave, I've got this, Dabai told him as he took a seat next to Izuku on the couch and began to pull out rolls of gauze. Are you sure you're fine being alone with him? Does he look like he's in any state to fight me right now? Dabai reasoned, nodding his head in Izuku's direction. Izuku couldn't exactly see himself, but he had no doubt he probably looked to be on the verge of passing out if how he felt was any indication. Besides, I've got plenty of experience patching up injuries. If you're sure, Compress replied with a non-committal shrug as he made his way out of the room again, finally leaving the healer and the villain alone together. In truth, Dabai just wanted everyone out of the room. He hadn't lied when he claimed he had experience with patching up injuries, so Compress would leave, and sending Toga and Twice on that errand was actually needed. But Dabai really just wanted the room to clear out so he could be alone with the kid. They were clearly getting nowhere with their patched-together arguments for why the kid should join them. Combine that with Shigaraki's bitch move to disintegrate his arm and the fact that a room full of villains was probably the definition of intimidation and ... yeah, they were getting nowhere. Dabai was the one to suggest recruiting Midoriya in the first place after seeing that video. And he figured their best chance of actual success was him talking one-on-one with the healer. He took one look at the kid's arm and immediately moved to undo the restraints keeping his hands together. The metal was uncomfortably close to the exposed flesh, and trying to treat the injury at such an awkward angle would only be a pain. He wasn't being cocky when he told Compress he felt confident enough to be alone with the healer. He was exhausted with no combat quirk, and sure enough, even with the restraints off, he stayed on the couch and made no move to escape Dabai's grasp. The person I was with when you took me ... did you? Dabai looked up from where he was inspecting Midoriya's arm, surprised to hear the kid speak. He had been silent since his initial pleas for everything to stop, and Dabai had intended to at least give him a few moments of quiet before sparking a conversation. He looked back down at the healer's arm, taking note of how it looked slightly better than it had a few minutes ago, and distantly wondered if he really could heal his own arm like Compress had suggested. Did we kill him? Dabai replied, finishing Midoriya's question, which caused the kid to flinch in response. Dabai contemplated lying for a moment before deciding against it. Nah, the brat tried to fight and get you back, but we knew not to respond to his questions. He realized he had no decent chance without his quirk and ran like a bitch. Losing a witness who would no doubt run back to the heroes with a report wasn't ideal, but it wasn't worth it to chase him down when they already had their target. He ran because he was smart, Midoriya snapped in a quiet voice, his glare challenging. There it is. There's that confident venom that Dabai had seen in the video. He worried it had been lost or pushed deep down inside him after the stunt Shigaraki had pulled, but it seemed like it could be coaxed out with the right words. Dabai had to be smart about this. Push too much and the kid would end up hating them even more than he already did. Push just enough and he could redirect that anger towards something beneficial. So, this is a fun little secondary effect of your quirk, Dabai quipped, changing topics as he lightly dabbed his wound with antibiotic ointment. Dabai knew from experience that this ointment stung like a bitch, but for his credit the healer hardly flinched. Did you know this would happen? Yes. Dabai paused and looked up at Midoriya, who was staring sullenly off into the distance. And you still fucking healed me. Midoriya's gaze slid over to meet Dabai's, and the healer gave a small shrug. His movements only slightly stifled Dabai's light grip on his arm. You were in pain, he replied simply, as if the answer were an obvious one. Dabai returned to treating his wound and silence fell between them for a few moments. There are a lot of people in pain because of heroes, Dabai murmured. Enough, Midoriya groaned, clearly fed up with having this debate. Come on, what's the hold up? Dabai continued, deciding to press his luck a bit more. You already agreed with me that there are heroes out there who probably deserve a little punishment, or at least don't deserve the positions they're in. He put away the antibiotic ointment and retrieved some bandages from the kit. Hear us out, stick around for a bit, see what it's like on the other side. You kidnapped my boyfriend, Midoriya interrupted. Dabai's brow furrowed as he looked up at the kid's face. He looked tired, either from his patience wearing thin from the constant sales pitches or from expending so much energy to heal. He wasn't sure. Whatever it was, clearly the exhaustion was making the healer start to lose coherency in his arguments. I'm sorry, we did what? Dabai questioned with a skeptical shake of his head. I don't know what kind of business you think we run here, but we don't really go around kidnapping boys. Dabai paused, the pieces coming together in his head as he thought about how the list of people they had kidnapped wasn't exactly long. No way. No fucking way. Dabai looked back up at Midoriya, who seemed to be starting to regret that he had said anything at all. The explosion quirk with the anger management issues. You're one to talk, Midoriya replied, looking a bit offended. You realize it was a mistake telling me that, right? Dabai pointed out as he began to wrap gauze around the bandaged wound. That's just another piece of information we can exploit. Information to exploit, Midoriya murmured, and Dabai could feel the kid's eyes on him as he finished wrapping the gauze and tied a knot in the end. What, like the fact that you're a Todoroki? It was a good fucking thing that Dabai had finished wrapping the brat's arm and let go, because his hand suddenly caught with a burst of blue flames that sputtered out as quickly as they appeared. It was a reflex, a knee-jerk reaction that Dabai couldn't control, and he cursed the fact that he couldn't, because when he looked up, the healer's eyes were wide and curious and staring right at him. Oh my god. Ew, that was honestly just a guess, but for a hardened criminal, you don't hide your body language all that well, Midoriya murmured as he now stared at Dabai like he was some novel scientific discovery. Holy shit, that was a guess. Dabai shot up from the couch and moved to the opposite side of the room as if physical distance would help prevent Midoriya from noticing any more than he already had. Why the fuck would you guess something like that? What do I have to lose? Midoriya shrugged, his eyes tracking Dabai's movements and never blinking. Might as well spout nonsense and see if something sticks. Dabai shot him a glare that said an answer like that wouldn't cut it. He hated the way the kid was watching him now. The exhaustion was still there, but it was like a switch had been flipped in the healer's mind, and now curiosity was overriding everything as the prevalent emotion. Dabai could tell his movements were being watched even more closely now, as if every little twitch was a line in a book and the brat was piecing together the full story bit by bit. Midoriya's eyes were too inquisitive, too perceptive, and Dabai didn't know what to do. Bullshit. You don't just pull something like that out of thin air, Dabai argued. My livelihood outside of healing is strategy and quirk analysis, so I know a thing or two about inheritance patterns, Midoriya explained, and suddenly Dabai understood why the kid was staring at him like he was an experiment. That and those eyes are pretty damn familiar. Almost like I see the same shade whenever I look at one of my best friends. You don't. And the Todoroki family is missing a son, aren't they? Shut up. Dabai snapped, his hands once again igniting with blue flames as his temper and anxiety flared. You have no idea what you're talking about. Maybe not, Midoriya conceded. He slumped back into the couch, his fingers lightly skimming over his newly bandaged arm. He didn't seem satisfied or smug with the information he was potentially unearthing. He just looked tired. But I know about Endeavor. Shadows told me plenty about that mess. Don't say that name, Dabai growled. Which one? Midoriya countered. Dabai opened his mouth to reply before snapping it closed. Apparently just existing in front of this kid meant secrets would be spilled, so clearly speaking wouldn't help the situation in the slightest. He could kill him. But he can't kill him, as risky and annoying as he was to keep around. This brat needed to stay alive. Shigaraki only saw a benefit in his quirk, but that wasn't why Dabai wanted to recruit him. Midoriya could have been quirkless and Dabai still would have wanted him. This one was different. That had been obvious from the video. He thought differently from the other idiots his age who blindly idolized their heroes. More importantly, it seemed like he had the guts to actually act. It was a good baseline to build off of. Shigaraki fucked up the plan more than he knew when he derailed it to manipulate the kid into using his quirk. Shigaraki only saw a tool, and tools didn't need to like you. Betraying trust and manipulating emotions would only cause Midoriya to hate them more. They didn't need to be pushing him away. They needed him to agree with their ideals. The two stared at one another for a few moments before Dabai made his way back over. Regardless of whether or not he wanted to be near the brat, he was still a potential threat and clearly a bit smarter than the average teenager. He sat down to put the restraints back on but was quickly forced to reel back, narrowly missing the hand that Midoriya had raised towards him. "Don't fucking touch me," Dabai warned. He decided to abandon the restraints for now in favor of sitting on the opposite end of the couch. Midoriya let his outstretched hand fall to rest on his lap. His gaze was flitting between Dabai's chin and his arms, and Dabai recognized that pattern well enough to know what the kid was purposefully staring at. "Do those hurt?" Midoriya asked. "The burns." Dabai checked and Midoriya gave a small nod. "They're old, it's just scarring at this point." Dabai's eyes narrowed. "Don't even fucking think about it." "Think about what?" Midoriya questioned, and he almost seemed genuinely confused as to what Dabai meant. "Don't play dumb," Dabai pressed. "You want to try to heal them." Midoriya's brow furrowed. It was as if the outstretched hand and curious assessment had been instinct, and he was just now realizing there had been a subconscious plan behind it. Dabai watched as the healer shook his head and clutched one of his hands with the other, like he was trying to keep them in place. "Scars are more complicated than recent injuries," Midoriya told him. "It's why I couldn't ... It's why your arm is still scarred where I healed it. I've tried targeting scars before, but it never really works out well for me or the patient. It's like the body doesn't want to let go of them, so they always return." He shrugged again and looked down at the scars that littered his own arms, and Dabai suddenly noticed how many there were. "The body wants to keep its evidence." "Then why would you keep trying?" "Because I can," Midoriya replied, simple and firm and almost rehearsed. "Healing quirks are rare, and if I don't try then I'm just wasting it." "Where the fuck did you come from, anyway?" Dabai questioned. They hadn't actually gotten much background information on the kid before deciding to grab him, but from what they had seen, he never wore a uniform like the rest of the heroes in training. "You weren't a UA student." "My island," Midoriya answered. Conversation was flowing surprisingly easy between them now, like they were two old friends catching up over lunch. "Lived there since I was 5. "That floating city full of scientists?" Dabai asked, generally familiar with the name. "And they sent you here to train as a hero?" "Not really. It was my idea to leave," the healer clarified. "I fought tooth and nail for it, pulled out every argument in favor I could think of to make the case. They would have preferred I stay there and just use my quirk for research and gear development, but I didn't want that. You could have lived a cushy life in one of the most secure places on Earth, and you left. All I could do there was use my quirk in experiments," Midoriya explained. He was idly picking at the dried blood that had crusted underneath his nails from touching Toga's disguise. He didn't seem particularly bothered by the fact that it covered his hands. "I wanted to make a more direct impact. So, you came here to use your quirk, which hurts you to use, in a field where not having a combat quirk leaves you highly exposed and at risk for more injuries. And so far, you've been kidnapped by villains." Dabai huffed out a laugh and nodded his head. "But you're starting to regret leaving." "Not at all. What the fuck are you, a masochist? Are we sharing things now?" Midoriya had perked up slightly, even turning in his seat so he faced more towards Dabai. "Because I'll talk if you do." "I'm not talking about my past, kid," Dabai said, tensing as he saw that curious shine return to the healer's eyes. "Isn't ever the reason why you want a clean slate?" Midoriya pressed, completely ignoring Dabai's words. "Are you selectively deaf or just a bitch?" Dabai drawled. He could feel the threat of a spark in his hands, and he once again cursed how much his control seemed to have been tossed out the window because of one kid. "I said I'm not talking about it. You never technically agreed with me that you're a Todoroki, so I'm not technically asking about your past." Midoriya reasoned. "I'm starting to understand why you're dating that explosion quirk brat," Dabai said. "You're both obnoxious as fuck. I'm actually worse than him. He just has less of a filter." Dabai stared at Midoriya, and the kid stared back. Where had the fear gone? It had been there before, mixed in with all the bravado and derision that Midoriya had tried to push forward when faced with a room full of villains. It seemed to be gone now, or at least it was too far muffled by the exhaustion and curiosity that fought to take center stage. Dabai could easily drag that fear back to the forefront, but instead he found himself taking a deep breath. "There are more just like Endeavor. He's not the only one," Dabai told him. As much as he didn't want to talk about what the kid wanted to talk about, he could still see ways he could spin the conversation in favor of the original plan to persuade him to their side. False heroes who care more about image and payment than the fucking people they claim they protect. There needs to be a change. Why couldn't change come in the form of the newer generations? Midoriya argued. Heroes retire, they get replaced. Replaced by little brats who were raised and trained to think the exact same way. Shadow doesn't think that way. Dabai's eye twitched and a small glint in the kid's eyes said that he had figured out that yes, that was the name that Dabai didn't want him to fucking say. Will you just fucking drop it already? Dabai, we're back. Dabai shot off the couch again at the sound of Toga's voice. The girl in question skipped into the room as cheerily as she had skipped out, a plastic bag hanging from her wrist. We found these protein pouches and some. Toga trailed off when she caught sight of Dabai, who no doubt looked as tense and uncomfortable as he felt. Are you okay? I'm fine, Dabai told her, trying his best to keep his voice even and to fall back into the more leisurely posture he was known for. Are you sure? Twice asked as he looked pointedly at the undone restraint sitting next to Midoriya on the couch. Dabai hesitated and glanced at the kid who was looking back at him with an unreadable expression. It was true, Dabai had never confessed to anything. But what was keeping this brat from sharing his little theory on Dabai's history? The healer's eyes slowly slid from Dabai over to Twice and Toga before the corners of his mouth curled into a wry smile. I was telling him gross medical stories, Midoriya shared. He slowly and gently picked up the restraints and slipped his hands into them, ready to have someone resecure them as a sign of good faith. Thought he'd have the stomach for it, but I guess not. Oh, tell me some stories, Toga excitedly requested as she hopped onto the couch and pressed herself against Midoriya. Twice moved around to the other side of the couch to lock Midoriya's restraints. Is there a lot of blood involved? She began to remove snacks from the bag around her wrist but stopped when she noticed Dabai walking towards the door. Dabai, where are you going? We got you some snacks too. Out, Dabai answered, not bothering to turn around as he made his way out of the room. I'll be back later. If Shigaraki complains, tell him it's payback for the arm and that he can fuck off. The plan was fucked. What Dabai hated most was that Shigaraki wasn't even the main reason that the plan was fucked. Sure, the idiot went off script and probably made the kid even less cooperative than he already was, but in reality, the plan was fucked from the beginning. He was only just now realizing that they had never had a chance to begin with. Dabai had been the one to suggest recruitment. He had seen potential, a spark of something useful that could be cultivated and encouraged in Izuku Midori. His conversation with the healer had only cemented that impression of him. Stain would have liked the kid. His ideals and principles would have been enough, but on top of all that, Midoriya's quirk was inherently selfless in its use. Stain would have respected him without question. Dabai sort of hoped that one day, somehow, they'd have the chance to meet one another, whether he liked it or not. Midoriya held the same base ideals as Dabai. They both believed that there needed to be an end to society's false heroes. Of course, they had very different ideas about how that end should be achieved, but that was a whole other conversation. However, where Midoriya wanted a society with better heroes, Dabai just wanted it all to end. He knew the cycle would just repeat itself, over and over. Each new generation could hold true and noble heroes, but it was just as likely that they'd be standing beside the same batch of corrupt and twisted individuals who managed to crawl their way up the ranks. So sure, they held the same base ideals, and at a certain point, their opinions began to diverge, and maybe they diverged in very critical ways, but that was fine. Initially, Dabai figured that if they swayed him to their side, then the ideals would come with him. Now he wasn't so sure. Midoriya's ideals wouldn't flourish with the League of Villains. He'd suppress them. He'd push them down and bury them underneath the hatred that would begin to burn brighter in its place. As crazy as it was to consider, the kid would have been more helpful to Dabai's own plans when he was with the heroes. He was loath to admit it, but the brat hadn't been completely off base with the suggestion that change could come from within. Dabai had a feeling that someday down the line, Izuku Midoriya would be a much better asset to him as a hero. So, he needed to get the healer back to his heroes. Dabai had made his way to an abandoned apartment building marked for demolition blocks away from the hideout. He stood in its lobby, leaned against an old reception desk coated in a layer of dust and scattered broken glass. After a quick look around told him he wouldn't be interrupted by a random squatter hiding in the shadows. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through the admittedly short list of contacts it held, his finger finally hovering over a number he never imagined he'd have to call. It had been a bit of a headache tracking down this particular number along with a few others that Dabai had only ever bothered to keep for scenarios that really only played out in his dreams or nightmares, depending on how you looked at them. He hesitated, his hand beginning to twitch from the strain of holding it so perfectly still while he stared at the contact and wondered how the fuck he had arrived at this point. He selected the contact, held the phone to his ear, and listened to its steady ring. Hello. The voice cracked a bit and was laced with the drowsiness of someone who must have just woken up. Dabai's gaze flicked to one of the lobby's broken windows to see the soft light of dawn filtering through the broken panes and realized how early it was. Dabai prayed the hitch in his breath wasn't picked up by the phone's mic and forced the tone of his voice to revert to the calm and collected nature he was known for. Little Shadow Todoroki, Dabai finally spoke. How's it going, kid? Who is this? The voice sounded more awake now, alert with the cautious instincts that had been drilled into its owner. I'll give you a hint, Dabai drawled, snapping his fingers to produce a small blue flame. He watched it flicker and snap at the dust particles floating through the air. If you put our flames together, you might get a nice shade of purple. There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, Dabai wondered if it was just too early in the morning for clever little puzzles that could be solved by a toddler. Dabai. Boom, he gets it, Dabai commended, mouth involuntarily twisting in response to the venom he heard in the other boy's voice. Glad to know I'm not speaking with an idiot. What have you done with Midoriya? I'll cut to the chase before you run off to find a hero and trace this call, Dabai carried on. Making this call in the first place may have been a stupidly foolish decision, but he wasn't a complete idiot. He was still a villain speaking with a hero in training. This conversation needed to wrap up quickly. I'm willing to help you get your little green-haired friend back in exchange for a few simple things. What makes you think we'd be willing to negotiate with the League of Villains? Well, first of all, you're not negotiating with the League. You're only negotiating with me, Dabai corrected. Second of all, I think you're absolutely willing to negotiate. Why only you? Shadow questioned, clearly and justly still skeptical. Does the rest of the League not know what you're doing? Nope, Dabai answered. Let's just say I've been feeling a bit selfish lately. Make no mistake, this whole deal has my own best interests at heart. You just happen to have the chance to benefit from it as well. He may have people in the League who he considered comrades, and he'd protect them to a point, but at the end of the day, they were a means to an end, and he was a man for himself. I'll help you get him back, and in exchange I'm only asking for ... let's call it indirect protection. That means no going after me once you have him back, and no involving the pro heroes. I'll tolerate involving another student if you need it, but that's about it. And why should we trust you? I'm not saying you should. This is just the deal I'm offering, and you can take it or leave it, Dabai stated plainly. If Shadow wouldn't take his offer, he'd find another way to get the healer away from the League. This was just the easiest to start with ... and maybe a certain brat had made Dabai feel disgustingly nostalgic. And don't even think about trying to have any pro heroes secretly on standby or running to them right after this call. If I get the feeling that things are even slightly off, then I'll turn the kid into a pile of ashes faster than you can fucking blink. There was another bout of silence on the other end, and Dabai let it carry on. He didn't think Shadow was stupid or brash enough to try anything that had put his friend at risk, and to be fair, this wasn't an easy decision to make on the spot. And if we accept, Shadow finally spoke again, and Dabai grinned. Text me back at this number in the next 5 minutes, he ordered. I've got a few ideas for how this could work. Without waiting for a response, Dabai ended the call and checked the time. If 5 minutes passed and he had no response, he'd ditch the phone and get very far away from this location. If he got a response, then ... well, things were about to get interesting. Who was that? Fuck. Dabai spun and faced the lobby's entrance to see Toga perched on one of the cracked leather chairs that had been pushed up against the wall. Dabai let out a breath and glared at the girl, who only smiled back at him. What are you doing here, Toga? She didn't answer him, and Dabai could tell from her confident silence that she knew she didn't need to answer him. She wasn't the one who was just caught doing something she probably shouldn't be doing. How much did you? All of it, she replied. Dabai took another breath and felt the warmth of his flames simmering just beneath his skin, threatening to spark and defend. He held them back and tried to get a better read on Toga, who was still just smiling in an uncharacteristically soft way. Are you going to tell them? Dabai asked, and Toga's expression shifted into something more pensive. I should, shouldn't I? Toga replied as she hopped out of the chair and began to stroll towards Dabai. I should report to Shigaraki because he's the boss. Right, Dabai agreed, voice strained. Toga stopped a couple feet away from him, hands held behind her back as she tilted her head and stared. Dabai didn't know what to think. He and Toga were certainly closer than certain other members of the League, given their shared admiration for Stain. Then again, he was never the kindest to her, and Toga was the type to spill blood whether she liked you or not, especially if she liked you. When Shiggy used his quirk on you, it made me want to stab him, Toga admitted, her voice more neutral than it usually was. But I knew I shouldn't do that. Do you know why? Because he's the boss, Dabai guessed with weary resignation, going along with the narrative she was trying to establish. Yep, Toga confirmed, the familiar sadistic delight returning to her tone as she flashed her sharpened canines in a grin. But you know, I've never been the biggest fan of having a boss, and sometimes there are worse things you can do to someone than stabbing, even if they aren't as fun and bloody. Dabai paused at that and shot Toga a hesitant look of interest. Oh yeah, Toga echoed, like pretending I didn't just hear your phone call. And why would you do that? Dabai questioned. Toga hummed and flicked some of the broken glass off of the reception desk. She took a seat on the space she had cleared and began swinging her legs out. I don't think Izuku will do what we want him to do, and Shiggy tends to get rid of things that won't do what he wants them to do, Toga told him. She grinned at Dabai, a rosy blush blooming on her cheeks. I like Izuku. I want to be able to see him all beat up and bleeding again and again and play with him some more. He needs to be alive for that to happen. God, you're such a whack job, Dabai muttered, and Toga giggled in response. And he can't. Toga trailed off, her expression and tone becoming more serious. We get injured, sure, and he could help us out with those moments, but not the moments that really mattered. You know. She looked at Dabai, a strange sort of melancholy in her eyes. He can't bring Big Sis Magni back, and I don't think he could heal Compress's arm, so not having him wouldn't be the biggest loss. Yeah, I considered that too, Dabai said with a nod of his head. I'm curious though. Toga nudged his arm with her elbow. I don't think you'd go soft on someone just because they healed you, so what's with the change of heart? Dabai swallowed and thought for a moment. Obviously, he wasn't going to tell her about everything he had talked about with the kid. What the brat had pieced together wasn't even a major reason for why Dabai wanted him away from the league. If anything, it was possible that the reasons he did have for wanting to let him go would be something Toga could agree with. I think Stain would have liked him, he said after a moment, and watched Toga brighten with the mention of the hero killer's name. He's different from the other assholes masquerading as heroes. I think it would do more harm than good if we tried to manipulate him into helping us. He could serve a better purpose to us if we let him go. Change things from the other side, Toga guessed. Yeah, Dabai agreed, silently impressed that she understood his way of thinking. He glanced down at his arm at the patch of scarred skin that was just slightly different from the rest. Also fuck Shigaraki, because even with the nerve damage, that shit hurt. If he escapes and Shiggy finds out you were involved, I've got places where I can lay low, Dabai assured. I was on my own before. It won't be too hard to do it again. Can Twice and I come visit you? What part of on my own are you not getting? But we'll miss you, Toga whined. Dabai huffed out a laugh just as the phone clutched in his hand vibrated. He looked on the screen to see a single message from a familiar number, simply reading, "We accept." Dabai felt the staples in his face pull as he grinned, and a glance up at Toga showed the girl bore a similar excited smile. Ready to see shit get fucked. Shadow looked down at his phone, feeling almost disconnected from his body as it vibrated in his hands with the incoming text messages detailing a plan. A plan developed by a known and wanted a rank villain. He should have gone straight to a faculty member as soon as he realized it was Dabai on the other end of that call. He had just gotten back to sleep in his own room once he was sure Bakugo was settled in his own, but he could hardly blame exhaustion for the ludicrous decisions he was currently making. But honestly, Shadow didn't have time to question his life choices. He jumped out of bed and immediately made his way back to Bakugo's room, thanking every force in the universe that it was the weekend and no one else was awake and roaming the halls in the early hours of the morning to see his panicked state. He didn't bother knocking and knew that unless Bakugo had gotten up since Shadow had left, the door would still be unlocked. Sure enough, it swung open with ease and he barged inside, flicking on the lights as he did so. Bakugo was still curled up on the bed where he left him, but he twisted around and blinked his red-rimmed eyes against the sudden harsh brightness of the room. At first, he seemed confused and almost irritated by Shadow's return, but as he took in the boy's flustered appearance, he slowly sat up in bed and stared with an expression that looked almost like concern. "I think I found a way to get Midoriya back," Shadow said, not bothering with any preamble or greeting. Bakugo's eyes widened ever so slightly and Shadow's gut twisted at the spark of hope he saw in them. There was a plan, sure, but he needed to express how unhinged of a plan it was. It's stupidly suicidal if it turns out to be a trap and we can't involve any pro-heroes, but it's a chance. Shadow searched Bakugo's face for any sort of reaction beyond the initial glimmer of hope, but the other boy's gaze had turned distant. For a moment, Shadow worried that his mediocre sales pitch had sent him into another episode until he realized Bakugo's gaze wasn't just distant. It was like he was looking through Shadow, almost like he was looking. He was looking right past him through the open door. Shadow turned and came face to face with Shinsu, still slightly bruised but bandaged and mostly healed, standing in the hall behind him. Shinsu glanced between Shadow and Bakugo, brow raised. "Should I pretend that I didn't just hear all of that?" Shinsu asked, half-heartedly waving a finger in Shadow's direction. Shadow sucked in a breath and grabbed Shinsu by the collar, dragging him into Bakugo's room. He quickly glanced up and down the hall to check the rest of it was empty before shutting the door and sealing the three of them inside. "Well now, I won't say anything," Shinsu quickly promised, hands held in the air in a pacifying gesture. "No threats necessary. My lips are sealed." "I appreciate it," Shadow acknowledged and truly meant it. He should have been more aware of his surroundings before saying what he had out loud. If someone like Yaoyorozu or Ida had been around to hear it, then it likely would have gone straight to a teacher. He looked Shinsu up and down, noting how the other boy looked improved in some ways but even more destroyed in others compared to how he was before leaving with Aizawa. How'd the report to the principal go? For starters, it wasn't just the principal, Shinsu corrected with a grimace. "Didn't realize I'd need to tell the retired symbol of peace that I watched someone he considers family get kidnapped by villain." Todoroki. Shadow's head whipped back to stare at Bakugo, questioning if he really just heard the other boy use his real name. Bakugo never used real names. He had nicknames for almost everything and everyone. It never mattered whether he liked you or hated you. It was a simple fact, and Shadow had never really figured out what it took to get him to use their real name. There were only a few exceptions like Midoriya or occasionally Kirishima, but never Shadow. Bakugo was looking down at his hands as he methodically clenched them and unclenched them. Shadow recognized it as one of his grounding techniques, an action he did whenever he was focused and trying to think despite any chaos around or within him. Do you really have a way to get him back? Bakugo asked, gaze rising to meet Shadow's. It's risky, Shadow confessed, unwilling to sugarcoat their chances. Has that ever really stopped you guys in the past? Shinsu pointed out. Now that I think about it, you could help us, Shadow mused as he looked back down at his phone and scrolled through the messages Dabai had sent him. I realize you're already facing consequences for sneaking out. If we're caught, things will just get worse for you. I'm in, Shinsu declared without hesitation. Just tell me what to do. You don't. Shadow and Shinsu both looked up at the sound of Bakugo's voice and saw the other boy staring at Shinsu with a strangely sympathetic look on his face. Bakugo's expression twisted and he looked back down at his hands. It's not your fault he was taken. You don't need to help and put yourself more at risk as some sort of apology. I'm helping because I want to get Midoriya back, Shinsu told him, voice firm as Bakugo looked back up and met his gaze. And I think that's a motivator we can all agree on. They stared at one another for a few moments before Bakugo sighed, tilted his head side to side to crack the joints in his neck, and looked back at Shadow. That familiar fire had returned to his eyes and Shadow nearly grinned at the sight of it, only now realizing how wrong it had been to see it absent in the first place. What's the plan? How about this? Hitoshi asked, turning another dial on his artificial vocal cords as he looked to Todoroki for approval or rejection of the voice. They were still gathered in Bakugo's room, speaking in fairly hushed voices with the door firmly closed and locked. Hitoshi had left only briefly to retrieve his support equipment. Bakugo was currently pacing the small space, though the movement was far from the tentative steps of someone on the brink of another panic attack. They were purposeful steps, the sound of crackling and the smell of burnt sugar and smoke filling the room as more and more of Bakugo's fury returned to him and caused his hands to spark. Todoroki was sitting on the bed and Hitoshi watched as he winced and shuddered like a chill was going up his spine. That one, Todoroki answered with a grimace and a nod. You sound just like him. Are you sure? Hitoshi pressed. They needed to get this right. Literally, the entire plan was dependent on Hitoshi being able to match the voice of Enji Todoroki to a T, and if they failed on that front, there was really no solid backup plan. The villain Dabai had made some suggestions for if things went sideways, but they involved a bit more fire and potential damage than the young heroes in training were willing to accept. Yes, I'm sure, Todoroki confirmed. When you spoke, I had the sudden urge to leave the room immediately. Hitoshi's brow furrowed and his lips pressed into a thin line in response to Todoroki's reply, but he kept quiet. Focus on the plan for now and address the potential psychological damage and disordered family of the classmate later. All right, Hitoshi accepted, temporarily switching off the equipment so his own voice filtered through. Do we know if Dabai's brought them the burner phone yet? He texted me a couple minutes ago saying he brought it to Shigaraki and that everyone was called back to their base. Todoroki answered as he flipped through the messages in his phone one final time before handing it over to Hitoshi. A number with an unassigned contact pulled up on the screen for him to dial. They weren't quite sure what their villainous ally had told the rest of the league to get them to accept a random burner phone suddenly appearing, but he prayed the plan would still work. We should call it soon before they think it's a bomb or something. Hitoshi looked between Todoroki, who seemed to be a bundle of uncomfortable nerves, and Bakugo, who had stopped pacing and was now staring intently at the phone in Hitoshi's hands. You ready? Todoroki asked as he readied a notepad in anticipation of having to write out silent communications. Bakugo simply cracked his neck again and sat down on the bed next to Todoroki, quietly waiting for the plan to start. Here goes nothing, Hitoshi murmured. He switched on his artificial vocal cords, dialed the number, and put the phone on speaker before listening to it ring. On the third ring, someone on the other end picked up but remained silent, so Hitoshi figured they would need to be the ones to start the conversation. Shigaraki. Hitoshi forced as much bravado and confidence into his tone as he could, a fairly easy feat considering he was speaking with the copied voice of the number one hero. The voice, though it came from another speaker, seemed to carry its own power just by association. The person on the other end of the call remained silent for a while, and the three boys began to panic, wondering if their cover had already been blown. Who is this? Shigaraki's response finally filtered through the mic of the phone, and Hitoshi let out a quiet breath of relief, Todoroki and Bakugo following suit, before continuing. I believe you know me by the name Endeavor, Hitoshi replied. Hitoshi may have sounded like Todoroki's father, but he wasn't quite sure how the man actually spoke. He went for the portrayal of formality and authority, assuming Todoroki would suggest any quick adjustments along the way using the notepad if anything was too off the mark. He also hoped the League of Villains hadn't spent much time familiarizing themselves with the speech patterns of well-known heroes. And why exactly should I believe that the #1 hero has graced us with a phone call? Shigaraki questioned. Didn't think heroes were in the business of sending sketchy burner phones to villains. We felt this conversation required a certain level of discretion. Not every matter needs to be settled in the public eye, Hitoshi reasoned. We know you've kidnapped a civilian with a healing quirk. More than a civilian, I'd say, Shigaraki mused. Isn't he one of your little heroes in training? His title or position isn't what matters here, Hitoshi pushed forward. What matters is that he belongs with us. Right, Shigaraki trailed off, a lilt of amusement entering his voice. And just out of curiosity, how are you so confident in assuming we haven't already killed the brat? Hitoshi watched as Todoroki quickly slapped a hand over Bakugo's mouth. The blonde's eyes had widened with a mixture of fear and rage, and Hitoshi was sure that if Todoroki hadn't acted, then Bakugo would have been screaming by now. You may be a villain, but you aren't so brash as to do something like that, Hitoshi quickly answered, both as a response for the villain and as a way to calm down Bakugo from a distance. He wouldn't be a valuable asset to you if he were dead. No, not directly, Shigaraki conceded. But a dead kid who the heroes weren't able to save still sparks a conversation, now doesn't it? Todoroki dropped the notepad, abandoning it in favor of using his other hand to grip Bakugo's wrists to quiet the small series of sparks threatening to emerge from his palms as full-blown explosions. Hitoshi's finger hovered over the speaker button in case the sound couldn't be controlled. Well, your suggestions certainly changed things, Hitoshi acknowledged, fighting to keep his own voice even. He watched Todoroki lean over and whisper something in Bakugo's ear, the other boy squeezing his eyes shut and taking deep breaths in response. Before this conversation continues, we'd like confirmation that the healer is still alive. He's breathing. Slightly more legitimate confirmation would be appreciated. I bet it would be, Shigaraki drawled. Tell me why the fuck we're talking right now. If it's to stall for time and track our location, then go right ahead. It would take no time or effort at all to disintegrate the kid and call Namu in to take care of whoever you send. There was a frantic gesture from Todoroki, an indication that Hitoshi should move along and get to the point of the call. Bakugo seemed to have calmed himself down, but the constant threats and suggested loss of Midoriya's life certainly weren't doing anything to help his state. Now that the initial haze and exhaustion of the panic attack had faded, all of his protective fire was returning to take center stage. Our intention isn't to trick you. The incident in Camino Ward showed us, and I'm sure you'll agree with this conclusion, that brute force is not always the best course of action when a more diplomatic approach could be done. Hitoshi knew that there had been casualties on both sides, villains and heroes, from that incident. Surely with their numbers down this time around, the villains would strategically want to avoid a similar loss. Our only goal is the return of Izuku Midoriya to our custody, and our wish is to conduct such an exchange in a quiet, mutually beneficial manner. Mutually beneficial, Shigaraki echoed. Explain that. Some of your members have been arrested and imprisoned, Hitoshi told him. We are willing to negotiate an exchange of some of those members for the student you've taken. Only some. To start, we'll give you one prisoner in exchange for the student. Hitoshi looked down at bulleted notes the three of them had written before the call had started, reading out the offer they had come up with. Provided the student is delivered unharmed and everything is done amicably, we'll raise that number to 3. That's quite generous of you. There was an edge of cynicism lining Shigaraki's tone, and the three boys silently panicked in the silence that followed, wondering if their fake offer had been too much. Hitoshi began debating if he should risk changing the bid, throwing in some random thing that would benefit the heroes and make the exchange seem more realistically balanced, but was interrupted by Shigaraki finally speaking again. Let's say we're interested. Izuku watched as Shigaraki reduced the burner phone to dust as soon as he ended the call. The time and location for an exchange had already been planned in the final parts of his conversation with Endeavor. It was just a matter of whether or not the League chose to accept and show up. When Dabai had returned earlier with a burner phone and a peculiar report, Izuku hadn't known what to think about the ordeal. Dabai said that when he had left to blow off some steam with what he had described as minor arson far from the hideout, a hero had approached him. The villain said he could tell it was a psychic, and while the kid looked scared shitless, he could tell he hadn't approached for a fight. He had immediately gotten an earful from Shigaraki about keeping a low profile, especially given the fact that their last hideout had been discovered after someone recognized Dabai. Dabai had bit right back, swearing that he had been 2 seconds away from leaving with no witnesses, but that he hadn't needed to. The psychic had just handed over this burner phone before leaving without a word, and Dabai was certain he hadn't been followed back by anyone. The psychic had apparently just been a delivery boy ... an expendable one if whoever sent him knew he'd be interacting with Dabai. Izuku had watched Dabai give this report to Shigaraki while vaguely registering the return of the other villains, including Toga, who had also disappeared earlier for no clear reason. even after begrudgingly eating some of the snacks he was brought. His mind was still hazy from using his quirk and the lingering pain of its reflected damage. He wasn't quite sure if this was the reason why Dabai's report seemed strange to him, or if it was just the fact that the whole situation was just strange in general. This is a trap, right? Mr. Compress broke the silence first once the call had ended. This is a trap. But what if it's real? Twice questioned hopefully before quickly shutting down his own optimism. We'd be fucking stupid to believe it. The whole deal left an acrid taste in Izuku's mouth. The heroes were handing over prisoners, powerful prisoners, in exchange for his return. He wasn't worth that. They were making a huge fucking mistake. Surely there was a better way to do this. But no, they chose the shady path of diplomacy that was so deeply studded with immoral choices that Izuku almost had a hard time believing it to be a plan devised by heroes. He almost had a hard time believing it. But it was Endeavor on the other end of that phone call, and Izuku had no problem at all accepting that a man like that would come up with a plan like this. To be fair, the commission was probably putting pressure on him to act and to also avoid another incident like Kamino. Still, it only served to remind Izuku that Dabai had made some very decent points during their earlier conversation. Do you know any reason why the heroes would be this stupidly desperate to get you back? Shigaraki asked, directing his crimson gaze at Izuku. Well, you fucks bothered to kidnap me, so clearly I have some value, Izuku muttered. He thought for a moment before sighing, realizing he may have some idea of why the heroes were conducting such a brash trade. I was trained on an island. I had a good handful of wealthy investors who sponsored both my quirk development and my gear designs. So if they found out I was taken, you think they're paying the heroes to get you back? Spinner surmised, or threatening to sue them. Izuku speculated with a shrug. Either is possible. I'm a project they invested a lot of time and resources into. Endeavor's also desperate to keep the public happy and calm ever since All Might retired, Compress acknowledged. If they found out we took another student, then there'd be chaos. Wouldn't that be a benefit to us? Shigaraki questioned. Why not expose the heroes as inept and tarnish a few reputations? But we could be getting back prisoners like Kurogiri or Muscular, Dabai reasoned. We could be getting 3 for the price of 1. Seems like a better advantage considering the kid isn't even listening to us. Provided this isn't all a fucking trap, Spinner muttered. Twice could make a clone of him so we don't bring the real deal, Toga suggested from her place pressed up against Izuku on the couch. That could work, Twice supported, though in the next moment he was shaking his head. No, he wouldn't listen. Twice's clones have their own autonomy, Compress reminded them. The clone might tip off the heroes. Bring Toga then, Dabai suggested, nodding his head towards the girl who perked up at the mention of her name. Let her drink the kid's blood and keep him at a different location so you don't risk losing him if shit goes sideways. Everyone paused and looked between Izuku and Toga. The girl was grinning with delight, hand already creeping towards one of the knives she kept strapped to her thigh. Izuku's jaw clenched as he contemplated how badly some additional blood loss would affect his already weakened state. That's ... not a bad plan, Twice approved. Yeah, let me drink Izuku's blood. Toga chimed in supportively. We shouldn't leave him unguarded, Shigaraki said, slowly and pensively scratching at his throat as he looked between Toga and Izuku. I'll take him, Dabai offered. I've got plenty of places we can hide out until you figure out if this is legit or not. By yourself. Shigaraki's gaze flicked over to Dabai, a hint of doubt in his eyes as he likely wondered how committed Dabai would be to the task considering recent events. If we're actually doing a trade-off with the #1 hero, then we need manpower, Spinner argued as Twice softly encouraged Toga to fetch a syringe rather than use the knife. She pouted but skipped off in search of one. We can't afford to split our numbers too much. Dabai was alone with him earlier and he was just fine, Compress defended, and Shigaraki hummed thoughtfully in response. Honestly, you're acting like he's got a combat quirk, Dabai said as he huffed out a laugh. What's he gonna do, heal me? Fine, Shigaraki finally conceded with a roll of his eyes before turning to look at Izuku. Well, aren't you a lucky thing? Yeah, traded like a sack of potatoes from one group that just wants to use me to the other group that just wants to use me, Izuku drawled, trying his best not to flinch as Toga settled beside him with a syringe and pressed the needle into one of the veins in his arm. I'm feeling really lucky. Izuku felt numb. He should be happy. Maybe not happy, but at the very least relieved. If the League accepted, then he'd go back to the heroes. He'd get to be with Katsuki again. He could see Shadow and Shinsu and the other friends he had made at UA. And his mom wouldn't need to panic over the safety of her son, and he'd be ... free ... He wouldn't be fucking free. His future was still owned by the powerful men and women who held contracts signed when he was a child by his well-intentioned mother who only wanted what was best for him. We gave you a chance to join, kid, Shigaraki reminded him, his tone mostly taunting. Maybe if you ask nicely, then we'll reconsider and keep you instead. Pawn for the heroes. Pawn for the scientists. pawn for the villains. They were shitty options, both in quantity and quality, but at least Izuku could say that he still had the ability to choose. "Fuck you," Izuku growled, a warm glow sparking in his chest as he realized how much he had channeled Katsuki in those 2 words. Shigaraki didn't seem nearly as amused by the response, and one of his hands twitched forward towards Izuku before his wrist was grabbed by an even less amused-looking Dabai. Shigaraki shot the other man a glare, but Dabai held firm and pulled the thread away from the healer. "Don't," Dabai warned. "Undamaged gets us 3. Shigaraki looked like he wanted to argue but decided against it, pulling his hand back to claw at his irritated throat as he settled for simply glaring at Izuku. Dabai sighed and turned towards Izuku, reaching for his restraints once Toga had collected the blood she needed. "Time to go on a little trip, healer."